Dialectical logic. Introduction. The task, bequeathed to us by Lenin, of creating a logic, i.e. of a systematically developed exposition of dialectics understood as the logic and theory of knowledge of modern materialism, has become particularly acute today. The clearly marked dialectical character of the problems arising in every sphere of social life and scientific knowledge is making it more and more clear that only Marxist-Leninist dialectics has the capacity to be the method of scientific understanding and practical activity, and of actively helping scientists in their theoretical comprehension of experimental and of actively helping scientists in their theoretical comprehension of experimental and factual data and in solving the problems they meet in the course of research. In the past 10 or 15 years, quite a few works have been written devoted to separate branches that are part of the whole of which we still only dream. They can justly be regarded as paragraphs, even chapters, of the future logic, as more or less finished blocks of the building being erected. One cannot, of course, cement these blocks mechanically into a whole, but since the task of a systematic exposition of dialectical logic can only be solved by collective efforts, we must at least determine the most general principles of joint work. In the essays presented here we attempt to concretize some of the points of departure of such collective work. In philosophy, more than in any other science, as Hegel remarked with some regret in his Phenomenology of Mind, the end or final result seems to have absolutely expressed the complete fact itself in its very nature. Contrasted with that, the mere process of bringing it to light would seem, properly speaking, to have no essential significance. That is very aptly put. So long as dialectics is looked upon as a simple tool for proving a previously accepted thesis, it will remain something of no essential significance. When dialectics is converted into a simple tool for proving a previously accepted thesis, it becomes a sophistry only outwardly resembling dialectics, but empty of content. And if it is true that real dialectical logic takes on life not in naked results, and not in the tendency of the movement of thought, but only in the form of the result along with the process of arriving at it, then during the exposition of dialectics as logic, we must reckon with this truth, for it is impossible to go to the other extreme, taking the view that we had allegedly not set ourselves any aim determining the means and character of our activity from the very outset in the course of our analysis of the problem, but had set out swimming at random. And we are therefore obliged, in any case, to say clearly, at the very beginning, what the object is in which we want to discover the intrinsically necessary division into parts. Our object or subject matter in general, and on the whole, is thought, thinking, and dialectical logic has as its aim the development of a scientific representation of thought in those necessary moments, and moreover in the necessary sequence, that do not in the least depend either on our will or on our consciousness. In other words, logic must show how thought develops if it is scientific, if it reflects, i.e. reproduces in concepts, an object existing outside our consciousness and will and independent. Written in 1974, first published in Dialectical Logic, Essays on its History and Theory, by Progress Publishers, 1977, translated, English translation 1977 by H. Campbell Creighton 1 Hegel, The Phenomenology of Mind, T.R.J.B. Bailey, 1931. Preface Section 2, 2 Ibid, Preface Section 3. Dialectical Logic. 2. Ently of them, in other words, creates a mental reproduction of it, reconstructs its self-development, recreates it in the logic of the movement of concepts so as to recreate it later in fact. Logic then is the theoretical representation of such thinking. From what we have said it will be clear that we understand thought as the ideal component of the real activity of social people transforming both external nature and themselves by their labor. Dialectical logic is therefore not only a universal scheme of subjective activity creatively transforming nature, but is also at the same time a universal scheme of the changing of any natural or socio-historical material in which this activity is fulfilled and with the objective requirements of which it is always connected. That, in our opinion, is what the real gist of Lenin's thesis on the identity of dialectics, logic and the theory of knowledge of the modern, scientific, i.e. materialist, world outlook consists in. This approach preserves as one of the definitions of dialectics that given by Friedrich Engels. We think that one can unite dialectics and materialism in precisely that way, and show that logic, being dialectical, is not only the science of thinking but also the science of development of all things, both material and spiritual. Understood in that way, logic can also be the genuine science of the reflection of the movement of the world in the movement of concepts. Otherwise it is inevitably transformed, as has happened to it in the hands of neopositivists, into a purely technical discipline, a description of systems of manipulations with the terms of language. The concretization of the general definition of logic presented above must obviously consist in disclosing the concepts composing it, above all the concept of thought. Here again a purely dialectical difficulty arises, namely, that to define this concept fully, i.e. concretely, also means to write logic, because a full description cannot by any means be given by a definition but only by developing the essence of the matter. The concept itself is also very closely allied with the concept of thought. To give a definition of it here would be easy, but would it be of any use? If we, adhering to a certain tradition in logic, tend to understand by concept neither sign nor term defined through other terms, and not simply a reflection of the essential or intrinsic attributes of things, but the gist of the matter, then it would be more correct, it seems to us, to limit ourselves in relation to definition rather to what has been said, and to start to consider the gist of the matter, to begin with abstract, simple definitions accepted as far as possible by everyone, in order to arrive at the concrete, or in this case at a Marxist-Leninist understanding of the essence of logic and its concretely developed concept. Everything we have said determines the design and plan of our book. At first glance it may seem that it is, if not wholly, then to a considerable degree, a study in the history of philosophy. But the historical collisions of realizing the matter of logic is not an end in itself for us, but only the factual material through which the clear outlines of the logic of matter gradually show through, those very general outlines of dialectics as logic which, critically corrected and materialistically rethought by Marx, Engels and Lenin, also characterize our understanding of this science. 3 Engels, Dialectics of Nature, MECW Vol 25 page 356, 4 Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, Marx, MECW Vol 3 page 18. From the History of Dialectics. 1. Descartes and Leibniz, the problem of the subject matter and sources of logic. The most promising means of resolving any scientific problem is the historical approach to it. In our case this approach proves a very essential one. The fact is that what are now called logic are doctrines that differ considerably in their understanding of the boundaries of this science. Each of them, of course, lays claim not so much simply to the title as to the right to be considered the sole modern stage in the development of world logical thought. That, therefore, is why we must go into the history of the matter. The term logic was first introduced for the science of thinking by the Stoics, who distinguished by it only that part of Aristotle's actual teaching that corresponded to their own views on the nature of thinking. The term itself was derived by them from the Greek word logos, and the science so named was very closely related to the subject matter of grammar and rhetoric. The medieval scholastics, who finally shaped and canonized the tradition, simply converted logic into a mere instrument for conducting verbal disputes, a tool for interpreting the texts of the Holy Writ, and a purely formal apparatus. As a result, not only did the official interpretation of logic become discredited, but also its very name. The emasculated Aristotelian logic therefore also became discredited in the eyes of all leading scientists and philosophers of the new times. Which is the reason why most of the philosophers of the 16th to 18th centuries generally avoided using the term logic as the name for the science of thought, intellect, and reason. Recognition of the uselessness of the official, formal, scholastic version of logic as the organon of real thought and of the development of scientific knowledge was the leitmotif of all the advanced, progressive philosophers of the time. The logic now in use serves rather to fix and give stability to the errors which have their foundation in commonly received notions than to help the search after truth. So it does more harm than good, Francis Bacon said. I observed in respect to logic, said Descartes, that the syllogisms and the greater part of the other teachings serve better in explaining to others those things that one knows than in learning what is new. John Locke suggested that syllogism, at best, is but the art of fencing with the little knowledge we have, without making any addition to it. On this basis Descartes and Locke considered it necessary to classify all the problems of the old logic in the sphere of rhetoric. And in so far as logic was preserved as a special science, it was unanimously treated not as the science of thinking but as the science of the correct use of words, names, and signs. Hobbes, for example, developed the conception of logic as the calculation of word signs. In concluding his essay concerning human understanding, Locke defined the subject matter and task of logic as follows: the business is to consider the nature of signs the mind makes use of for the understanding of things, or conveying its knowledge to others. He treated logic as the doctrine of signs, i.e. as semiotics, but philosophy, fortunately, did not gel at that level. The best brains of the period understood very well that it might be all right for logic to be interpreted in that spirit, but not for the science of thinking. True, in general, the representatives of purely mechanistic views of the world and of thinking held such a view of logic, since they interpreted objective reality in an abstract, geometrical way, i.e. only purely. 1 Francis Bacon, Novum Organum, in the Works of Francis Bacon, Vol. IV, New York 1968, pages 48-49. 2 René Descartes, Discourse on Method, in Great Books of the Western World, Volume 31, Chicago 1952, page 46. 3 John Locke, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Vol. 2 London 1710, page 299. 4 C. Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan or the Matter, Form and Power of a Commonwealth, London 1894, page 27. 5 John Locke, Opposite, page 339. History of Dialectics. 4. Quantitative characteristics were considered objective and scientific. The principles of thinking in mathematical science merged in their eyes with the logical principles of thinking in general, a tendency that took final form in Hobbes. The approach of Descartes and Leibniz was much more careful. They too took to the idea of creating a universal mathematics in place of the old, ridiculed, and discredited logic, and they dreamed of instituting a universal language, a system of terms strictly and unambiguously defined, and therefore admitting of purely formal operations in it. Both Descartes and Leibniz, unlike Hobbes, were well aware of the difficulties of principle standing in the way of realizing such an idea. Descartes understood that the definition of terms in the universal language could not be arrived at by amicable agreement, but must only be the result of careful analysis of the simple ideas, the bricks, from which the whole intellectual edifice of man was built. And that the exact language of universal mathematics could only be something derived from true philosophy. Only then would one succeed in replacing thinking about the things given in reflection or imagination and in general in people's real sense experience by a kind of calculus of terms and statements, and in drawing conclusions and inferences as infallible as the solutions of equations. In supporting this point of Descartes, Leibniz categorically limited the field of application of the universal mathematics solely to those things that belong to the sphere of the powers of imagination. The universal mathematics should also, in his view, be only a logic of the powers of imagination. But that was precisely why all metaphysics was excluded from its province, and also such things as thought, and action, and the field of ordinary mathematics, commensurate only in reason. A very essential reservation. Thought, in any case, thus remained outside the competence of the universal mathematics. It is not surprising that Leibniz, with unconcealed irony, classified Locke's treatment of logic, by which it was understood as a special doctrine of signs, as purely nominalist. Leibniz revealed the difficulties associated with such an understanding of logic. Above all, he said, the science of reasoning, of judgments and inventions, seems very different from recognition of the etymologies and usage of words, which is something indeterminable and arbitrary. One must, moreover, when one wants to explain words, make an excursion into the sciences themselves as was seen in dictionaries, and one must not, on the other hand, engage in a science without at the same time giving a definition of the terms. Instead of the threefold division of philosophy into different sciences that Locke had taken over from the Stoics, Leibniz therefore suggested speaking of three different aspects, under which the same knowledge, the same truth, would function. Namely theoretical, practical, and terminological. The old logic thus corresponded simply to the terminological aspect of knowledge, or, as Leibniz put it, arrangement by terms, as in a handbook. Such a systematization, of course, even the best, was not a science of thought, because Leibniz had a more profound appreciation of thinking. And he classed the true doctrine of thought as metaphysics, in this sense following Aristotle's terminology and the essence of his logic, and not the Stoics. But why should thought be investigated within the framework of metaphysics? It was not a matter, of course, of indicating to which department the theoretical understanding of thought belonged, but of a definite way of approaching the solution of an essential philosophical problem. And the difficulty constantly facing every theoretician lies in understanding what it is that links knowledge and its subject matter together, and whether the one agrees with the other. And whether the concepts on which a person relies correspond to something real, lying outside his consciousness, and can that, in general, be tested, and if so, how? 6 G. W. Leibniz, Neue Abhandlung über den menschlichen Verstand, Leipzig 1915, page 640, 7 Ibid, pages 644-45. History of Dialectics. 5. The problems are really very complicated. An affirmative answer, for all its seeming obviousness, is not quite so simple to prove, and as for a negative answer, it proves possible to back it up with very weighty arguments, such as that. Since an object is refracted in the course of its apprehension through the prism of the specific nature of the organs of perception, since an object is refracted in the course of its apprehension through the prism of the specific nature of the organs of perception and reason, we know any object only in the form it acquires as a result of this refraction. The existence of things outside consciousness is thus by no means necessarily rejected. One thing only is rejected, the possibility of verifying whether or not such things are in reality as we know and understand them. It is impossible to compare the thing as it is given in consciousness with the thing outside consciousness, because it is impossible to compare what I know with what I don't know, what I do not see, what I do not perceive, what I am not aware of. Before I can compare my idea of a thing with the thing, I must also be aware of the thing, i.e. must also transform it into an idea. As a result, I am always comparing and contrasting only ideas with ideas, although I may think that I am comparing the idea with the thing. Only similar objects, naturally, can be compared and contrasted. It is senseless to compare bushels and rods, poles, or perches, or the taste of steak and the diagonal of a square. And if, all the same, we want to compare steaks and squares, then we will no longer be comparing steak and square but two objects both possessing a geometrical, spatial form. The specific property of the one and of the other cannot in general be involved in the comparison. What is the distance between the syllable a and a table? The question would be nonsensical. In speaking of the distance of two things, we speak of their difference in space. Thus we equalize them as being both existences of space, and only after having them equal a said subspecies spatii we distinguish them as different points of space. To belong to space is their unity. In other words, when we wish to establish a relation of some sort between two objects, we always compare not the specific qualities that make one object syllable a and the other a table, steak, or a square, but only those properties that express a third something different from their existence as the things enumerated. The things compared are regarded as different modifications of this third property common to them all, inherent in them as it were. So if there is no third in the nature of the two things common to them both, the very differences between them become quite senseless. In what are such objects as concept and thing related? In what special space can they be contrasted, compared, and differentiated? Is there, in general, a third thing in which they are one and the same, in spite of all their directly visible differences? If there is no such common substance, expressed by different means in an idea and in a thing, it is impossible to establish any intrinsically necessary relationship between them. At best we can see only an external relation in the nature of that which was once established between the position of luminaries in the heavens and events in personal lives, i.e. relations between two orders of quite heterogeneous events, each of which proceeds according to its own particular, specific laws. And then Wittgenstein would be right in proclaiming logical forms to be mystical and inexpressible. But in the case of the relationship between an idea and reality there is yet another difficulty. We know where the search for some sort of special essence can and does lead, an essence that would at once not be an idea and not material reality, but would constitute their common substance, the third that appears one time as an idea and another time as being. For an idea and being are mutually exclusive concepts. That which is an idea is not being, and vice versa. How, then, in general, can they be compared? In what, in general, can the basis of their interaction be? What is that in which they are one and the same? This difficulty was sharply expressed in its naked logical form by Descartes. In its general form it is the central problem of any philosophy whatsoever, the problem of the relationship of thought to the reality existing outside it and independently of it, to the world of things in space and time, the problem of the coincidence of the forms of thought and reality, i.e. the problem of truth or, to put it in traditional philosophical language, the problem of the identity of thought and being. 8 Marx, Theories of Surplus Value, Part 3 inches MECW Vol 32 page 330. History of Dialectics. 6. It is clear to everyone that thought and things outside thought are far from being one and the same. It is not necessary to be a philosopher to understand that. Everyone knows that it is one thing to have 100 rubles in one's pocket, and another to have them only in one's dreams, only in one's thoughts. The concept obviously is only a state of the special substance that fills the brain box. We could go on, furthermore, explaining this substance as brain tissue or even as the very thin ether of the soul keeping house there, as the structure of the brain tissue. Or even as the formal structure of inner speech, in the form of which thinking takes place inside the head, but the subject is outside the head, in the space beyond the head, and is something quite other than the internal state of thought, ideas, the brain, speech, etc. In order to understand such self-evident things clearly, and to take them into consideration, it is not generally necessary to have Descartes' mind. But it is necessary to have its analytical rigor in order to define the fact that thought and the world of things in space are not only and not simply different phenomena, but are also directly opposite. Descartes' clear, consistent intellect is especially needed in order to grasp the problem arising from this difficulty, namely, in what way do these two worlds, i.e. the world of concepts, of the inner states of thought, on the one hand, and the world of things in external space, on the other hand nevertheless agree with one another? Descartes expressed the difficulty as follows. If the existence of things is determined through their extension and if the spatial, geometric forms of things are the sole objective forms of their existence outside the subject, then thinking is not disclosed simply through its description in forms of space. The spatial characteristic of thinking in general has no relation to its specific nature. The nature of thinking is disclosed through concepts that have nothing in common with the expression of any kind of spatial, geometric image. He also expressed this view in the following way. Thought and extension are really two different substances, and a substance is that which exists and is defined only through itself and not through something else. There is nothing common between thought and extension that could be expressed in a special definition. In other words, in a series of definitions of thought there is not a single attribute that could be part of the definition of extension, and vice versa. But if there is no such common attribute it is also impossible to deduce being rationally from thought, and vice versa, because deduction requires a mean term, i.e. a term such as might be included in the series of definitions of the idea and of the existence of things outside consciousness, outside thought. Thought and being cannot in general come into contact with one another, since their boundary would then also be exactly that which simultaneously both divides them and unites them. In view of the absence of such a boundary, thought cannot limit the extended thing, nor the thing the mental expression. They are free, as it were, to penetrate and permeate each other, nowhere encountering a boundary. Thought as such cannot interact with the extended thing, nor the thing with thought, each revolves within itself. Immediately a problem arises. How then are thought and bodily functions united in the human individual? That they are linked is an obvious fact. Man can consciously control his spatially determined body among other such bodies. His mental impulses are transformed into spatial movements, and the movements of bodies, causing alterations in the human organism, are transformed into mental images. That means that thought and the extended body interact in some way after all. But how? What is the nature of the interaction? How do they determine, i.e. delimit, each other? How does it come about that a trajectory, drawn by thought in the plane of the imagination, for example a curve described in its equation, proves to be congruent with the geometrical contours of the same curve in real space? It means that the form of the curve in thought, i.e. in the form of the magnitude of the algebraic signs of the equation is identical with the corresponding curve in real space, i.e. a curve drawn on paper in a space outside the head. It is surely one and the same curve, only the one is in thought and the other in real space, therefore, acting in accordance with thought. I simultaneously act in the strictest accord with the shape of a thing outside thought. History of dialectics. 7. How can that be, if the thing in thought and the thing outside thought are not only different but are also absolutely opposite? For absolutely opposite means exactly this, not having anything in common between them, nothing identical, not one attribute that could at once be a criterion of the concept thing outside thought and of the concept thing in thought, or imagined thing. How then can the two worlds conform with one another? And, moreover, not accidentally, but systematically and regularly, these two worlds that have absolutely nothing in common, nothing identical, that is the problem around which all Cartesians spin, Descartes himself, and Ilyenkov, and Malebranche, and the mass of their followers. Malebranche expressed the principal difficulty arising here in his own witty way, as follows: during the siege of Vienna, the defenders of the city undoubtedly saw the Turkish army as transcendental Turks, but those killed were very real Turks. The difficulty here is clear, and from the Cartesian point of view on thought it is absolutely insoluble, because the defenders of Vienna acted, i.e. aimed and fired their cannonballs in accordance with the image of Turks that they had in their brains, in accordance with imagined transcendental Turks, and with trajectories calculated in their brains, and the shots fell among real Turks in a space that was not only outside their skulls, but also outside the walls of the fortress. How does it come about that two worlds having absolutely nothing in common between them are in agreement, namely the world thought of, the world in thought, and the real world, the world in space? And why? God knows, answered Descartes, and Malebranche, and Ilyenkov. From our point of view it is inexplicable. Only God can explain this fact. He makes the two opposing worlds agree. The concept God comes in here as a theoretical construction by which to express the obvious but quite inconceivable fact of the unity, congruence, and identity perhaps, of phenomena that are absolutely contrary by definition. God is the third which, as the connecting link, unites and brings into agreement thought and being, soul and body, concept and object, action in the plane of signs and words and action in the plane of real, geometrically defined bodies outside the head. Having come directly up against the naked dialectical fact that thought and being outside thought are in absolute opposition, yet are nevertheless in agreement with one another, in unity. In inseparable and necessary interconnection and interaction, the Cartesian school capitulated before theology and put the inexplicable fact down to God. And explained it by a miracle, i.e. by the direct intervention of supernatural powers in the causal chain of natural events. Descartes, the founder of analytical geometry, could therefore not explain in any rational way whatever the reason for the algebraic expression of a curve by means of an equation corresponding to the spatial image of this curve in a drawing. They could not, indeed, manage without God, because according to Descartes, actions with signs and on the basis of signs, in accordance only with signs, i.e. actions in the ether of pure thought, had nothing in common with real bodily actions in the sphere of spatially determined things, in accordance with their real contours. The first were pure actions of the soul, the second, actions of the body repeating the contours of external bodies, and therefore wholly governed by the laws of the external, spatially material world. This problem is posed no less sharply today by the philosophy of mathematics. If mathematical constructions are treated as constructions of the creative intellect of mathematicians, free of any external determination and worked out exclusively by logical rules, and the mathematicians themselves, following Descartes, are quite often apt to interpret them precisely so, it becomes quite enigmatic and inexplicable why on earth the empirical facts, the facts of external experience, keep on agreeing and coinciding in their mathematical, numerical expressions with the results obtained by purely logical calculations and by the pure actions of the intellect. It is absolutely unclear. Only God can help. In other words, the identity of these absolute opposites was also recognized by Descartes as a factual principle, without it even his idea of an analytical geom. History of dialectics. 8. Try would have been impossible, but it was explained by an act of God, by his intervention in the interrelations of thought and being, soul and body. God, moreover, in Cartesian philosophy, and especially for Malebranche and Ilyenkov, could be understood as the purely traditional Catholic, orthodox God, ruling both the bodies and the souls of men from outside, from the heights of his heavenly throne, and coordinating the actions of the soul with those of the body. Such is the essence of the famous psychophysical problem, in which it is not difficult to see the specifically concrete and therefore historically limited formulation of the central problem of philosophy. The problem of the theoretical understanding of thought, consequently, and hence not of the rules of operating with words or other signs, comes down to solving the cardinal problems of philosophy, or of metaphysics, to put it in a rather old-fashioned way. And that assumes mastering the culture of the genuinely theoretical thinking represented by the classical philosophers, who not only knew how to pose problems with maximum clarity, but also knew how to solve them. 2. Spinoza, thought as an attribute of substance. An immense role in the development of logic, and in preparing the ground for modern views on its subject matter, a role far from fully appreciated, was played by Spinoza. Like Leibniz, Spinoza rose high above the mechanistic limitations of the natural science of his time. Any tendency directly to universalize partial forms and methods of thinking only useful within the bounds of mechanistic, mathematical natural science was also foreign to him. Insofar as logic was preserved alongside the doctrine of substance, Spinoza treated it as an applied discipline by analogy with medicine. Since its concern proved not to be the invention of artificial rules but the coordination of human intellect with the laws of thought understood as an attribute of the natural whole, only as modes of expression of the universal order and connection of things. He also tried to work out logical problems on the basis of this conception. Spinoza understood thought much more profoundly and, in essence, dialectically, which is why his figure presents special interest in the history of dialectics. He was probably the only one of the great thinkers of the pre-Marxian era who knew how to unite brilliant models of acutely dialectical thought with the consistently held materialist principle of understanding thought and its relations to the external world lying in the space outside the human head. The influence of Spinoza's ideas on the subsequent development of dialectical thought can hardly be exaggerated. It is therefore worthy of note that thought must begin by placing itself at the standpoint of Spinozism. To be a follower of Spinoza is the essential commencement of all philosophy. But orthodox religious scholasticism, in alliance with subjective idealist philosophy, has not ceased to flog Spinoza as a dead dog, treating him as a living and dangerous opponent. Elementary analysis reveals that the main principles of Spinoza's thought directly contradict the conception of thought developed by modern positivism all along the line. The most modern systems of the 20th century still clash in sharp antagonism in Spinoza, and that obliges us to analyze the theoretical foundation of his conception very carefully, and to bring out the principles in it that, in rather different forms of expression perhaps, remain the most precious principles of any scientific thinking to this day, and as such are very heatedly disputed by our contemporary opponents of dialectical thought. Hegel once noted that Spinoza's philosophy was very simple and easy to understand. And in fact the principles of his thinking, which constitute the essential commencement of all philosophy, i.e. the real foundation on which alone it is possible to erect the edifice of philosophy as a science, are brilliant precisely in their crystal clarity, free of all reservations and ambiguities. It is not so easy, however, to bring these brilliant principles out because they are decked out in the solid armor of the constructions of formal logic and deductive mathematics that constitute the shell of Spinoza's system, its defensive coat of mail. In other words, the real logic of Spinoza's 9 Hegel, Lectures on the History of Philosophy, Volume 3, page 257. History of Dialectics. 9. Thinking by no means coincides with the formal logic of the movement of his axioms, theorems, scholia, and their proofs. Even with philosophers who gave their work a systematic form, e.g., Spinoza, the real inner structure of their system is quite distinct from the form in which they consciously presented it. Karl Marx wrote to Ferdinand Lassalle. Our job then cannot be once more to paraphrase the theoretical foundations on which Spinoza built his main work, the Ethics, and the conclusions that he drew from them by means of his famous geometric modus. In that case it would be more proper simply to copy out the text of the Ethics itself once again. Our job is to help the reader to understand the real inner structure of his system, which far from coincides with its formal exposition, i.e. to see the real cornerstone of his reflections and to show what real conclusions were drawn from them, or could be drawn from them, that still preserve their full topicality. That can only be done in one way, and one way only, which is to show the real problem that Spinoza's thought came up against quite independently of how he himself realized it and in what terms he expressed it for himself and for others, i.e. to set the problem out in the language of our century, and then to trace what were the real principles on which he based the solution of the problem. Then it will become clear that Spinoza succeeded in finding the only formulation exact for his time of a real problem that remains the great problem of our day, only formulated in another form. We formulated this problem in the preceding essay. Spinoza found a very simple solution to it, brilliant in its simplicity for our day as well as his. The problem is insoluble only because it has been wrongly posed. There is no need to rack one's brains over how the Lord God unites soul and body in one complex, represented initially as different and even contrary principles allegedly existing separately from each other before the act of this uniting, and thus also being able to exist after their separation, which is only another formulation of the thesis of the immortality of the soul, one of the cornerstones of Christian theology and ethics. In fact, there simply is no such situation, and therefore there is also no problem of uniting or coordination. There are not two different and originally contrary objects of investigation, body and thought, but only one single object, which is the thinking body of living, real man. Only considered from two different and even opposing aspects or points of view. Living, real thinking man, the sole thinking body with which we are acquainted, does not consist of two Cartesian halves, thought lacking a body and a body lacking thought. In relation to real man, both the one and the other are equally fallacious abstractions, and one cannot in the end model a real thinking man from two equally fallacious abstractions. That is what constitutes the real keystone of the whole system, a very simple truth that is easy, on the whole, to understand. It is not a special soul, installed by God in the human body as in a temporary residence, that thinks, but the body of man itself. Thought is a property, a mode of existence, of the body, the same as its extension, i.e. as its spatial configuration and position among other bodies. This simple and profoundly true idea was expressed this way by Spinoza in the language of his time. Thought and extension are not two special substances as Descartes taught, but only two attributes of one and the same organ, not two special objects, capable of existing separately and quite independent. 10 Marx to Ferdinand Lassalle, May 31, 1858, MECW Vol 40, page 316. Marx repeated this idea 11 years later in a letter to M. Kovalevsky. It is necessary to distinguish between that which the author in fact offers and that which he gives only in his representation. This is justifiable even for philosophical systems. Thus what Spinoza considered the keystone of his system, and what in fact constitutes this keystone, are two quite different things. This letter was known only from an oral translation by Kovalevsky. History of Dialectics. 10. Ently of each other, but only two different and even opposite aspects under which one and the same thing appears, two different modes of existence, two forms of the manifestation of some third thing. What is this third thing? Real infinite nature, Spinoza answered. It is nature that extends in space and thinks. The whole difficulty of the Cartesian metaphysics arose because the specific difference of the real world from the world as only imagined or thought of was considered to be extension, a spatial, geometric determinateness. But extension as such just existed in imagination, only in thought, for as such it can generally only be thought of in the form of emptiness, i.e. purely negatively, as the complete absence of any definite geometric shape. Ascribing only spatial, geometric properties to nature is, as Spinoza said, to think of it in an imperfect way, i.e. to deny it in advance one of its perfections. And then it is asked how the perfection removed from nature can be restored to her again. The same argumentation applies to thought. Thought as such is the same kind of fallacious abstraction as emptiness. In fact it is only a property, a predicate, an attribute of that very body which has spatial attributes. In other words, one can say very little about thought as such. It is not a reality existing separately from, and independently of, bodies but only a mode of existence of nature's bodies. Thought and space do not really exist by themselves, but only as nature's bodies linked by chains of interaction into a measureless and limitless whole embracing both the one and the other. By a simple turn of thought Spinoza cut the Gordian knot of the psychophysical problem, the mystic insolubility of which still torments the mass of theoreticians and schools of philosophy, psychology, physiology of the higher nervous system, and other related sciences that are forced one way or another to deal with the delicate theme of the relation of thought to body, of spiritual to material, of ideal to real, and such like topics. Spinoza showed that it is only impossible to solve the problem because it is absolutely wrongly posed, and that such posing of it is nothing but the fruit of imagination. It is in man that nature really performs, in a self-evident way, that very activity that we are accustomed to call thinking. In man, in the form of man, in his person, nature itself thinks, and not at all some special substance, source, or principle instilled into it from outside. In man, therefore, nature thinks of itself, becomes aware of itself, senses itself, acts on itself. And the reasoning, consciousness, idea, sensation, will, and all the other special actions that Descartes described as modi of thought, are simply different modes of revealing a property inalienable from nature as a whole, one of its own attributes. But if thinking is always an action performed by a natural and so by a spatially determined body, it itself, too, is an action that is also expressed spatially. Which is why there is not and cannot be the cause and effect relation between thinking and bodily action for which the Cartesians were looking. They did not find it for the simple reason that no such relation exists in nature, and cannot, simply because thinking and the body are not two different things at all, existing separately and therefore capable of interacting, but one and the same thing. only expressed by two different modes or considered in two different aspects. Between body and thought there is no relation of cause and effect, but the relation of an organ to the mode of its own action. The thinking body cannot cause changes in thought, cannot act on thought, because its existence as thinking is thought. If a thinking body does nothing, it is no longer a thinking body but simply a body. But when it does act, it does not do so on thought, because its very activity is thought. Thought is a spatially expressed activity, therefore cannot also be secreted from the body, performing it as a special substance distinct from the body, in the way that bile is secreted from the liver or sweat from sweat glands. Thinking is not the product of an action but the action itself, considered at the moment of its performance, just as walking, for example, is the mode of action of the legs, the product of which, it transpires, is the space walked. And that is that. The product or result of thinking may be an exclusively spatially expressed, or exclusively geometrically stated, change in some body or another, or else in its position relative to other bodies. It is absurd then to say that the one gives rise to the other. Thinking does not evoke a spatially expressed change in a body but exists through it. History of dialectics. 11. And vice versa, any change, however fine, within that body, induced by the effect on it of other bodies, is directly expressed for it as a certain change in its mode of activity, i.e. in thinking. The position set out here is extremely important also because it immediately excludes any possibility of treating it in a vulgar materialist, mechanistic key, i.e. of identifying thought with the material processes that take place within the thinking body, while nevertheless understanding that thought takes place precisely through these processes. Spinoza was well aware that what is expressed and performed in the form of structural, spatial changes within the thinking body is not at all some kind of thinking taking place outside of and independently of them. And vice versa. It is therefore impossible either to understand thought through examination, however exact and thorough, of the spatially geometric changes in the form of which it is expressed within the body of the brain, or, on the contrary, to understand the spatial geometric changes in the brain tissue from the most detailed consideration of the composition of the ideas existing in the brain. It is impossible, Spinoza constantly repeated, because they are one and the same, only expressed by two different means. To try to explain the one by the other simply means to double the description of one and the same fact, not yet understood and incomprehensible. And although we have two full, quite adequate descriptions of one and the same event, equivalent to one another, the event itself falls outside both descriptions, as the third thing, the very one and the same that was not yet understood or explained. Because the event twice described can be explained and correspondingly understood only after bringing out the cause evoking the event described but not understood. Bishop Berkeley ascribed the cause to God, and so did Descartes, Malebranche, and Joulinx. The shallow, vulgar materialist tries to explain everything by the purely mechanical actions of external things on the sense organs and brain tissue, and takes for the cause the concrete thing, the sole object that is affecting our bodily organization at a given moment and causing corresponding changes in our body, which we feel within ourselves and experience as our thinking. While rejecting the first explanation as the capitulation of philosophy before religious theological twaddle, Spinoza took a very critical attitude as well toward the superficially materialist mechanistic explanation of the cause of thought. He very well understood that it was only a bit of an explanation, leaving in the dark the very difficulty that Descartes was forced to bring in God to explain. For to explain the event we call thinking, to disclose its effective cause, it is necessary to include it in the chain of events within which it arises of necessity and not fortuitously. The beginnings and the ends of this chain are clearly not located within the thinking body at all, but far outside it. To explain a separate, single, sensuously perceived fact passing momentarily before our eye, and even the whole mass of such facts, as the cause of thought means to explain precisely nothing. For this very fact exerts its effect on stone as well, but no action of any kind that we describe as thinking is evoked in the stone. The explanation must consequently also include those relations of cause and effect that of necessity generate our own physical organization capable of thinking, i.e. of so refracting the external influences and so transforming them within itself that they are experienced by the thinking body not at all only as changes arising within itself, but as external things, as the shapes of things outside the thinking body. For the action produced on the retina of our eye by a ray of light reflected from the moon is perceived by the thinking being not simply as a mechanical irritation within the eye but as the shape of the thing itself, as the lunar disk hanging in space outside the eye. Which means that the ego, the thinking substance or creature, directly feels not the effect produced on it by the external thing but something quite different, viz. the shape or form and position of this external body, which has been evoked within us as a result of the mechanical or light effect. In that lies both the enigma and the whole essence of thinking as the mode of activity of a thinking body in distinction to one that does not think. It will readily be understood that one body evokes a change by its history of dialectics. 12. Action in another body, that is fully explained by the concepts of physics. It is difficult, and from the angle of purely physical concepts even impossible, to explain just why and how the thinking body feels and perceives the effect caused by an external body within itself as an external body. As its, and not as its own shape, configuration, and position in space. Such was the enigma, in general, that Leibniz and Fichte came up against later, but Spinoza had already found a fully rational, though only general, theoretical solution. He clearly understood that the problem could only be fully and finally solved by quite concrete investigation of the material mechanism by which the thinking body managed to do the trick. Truly mystically incomprehensible. But that it did the trick, that it saw the thing and not the changes in the particles of the retina and brain that this body caused by its light effect within the brain was an undoubted fact. And a fact calling for fundamental explanation and in a general way outlining paths for more concrete study in the future. What can the philosopher say here categorically, who remains a philosopher and does not become a physiologist, or an anatomist, or a physicist? Or rather, what can he say, without plunging into a game of the imagination, without trying to construct hypothetical mechanisms in the fancy by which the trick mentioned might, in general, be performed? What can he say while remaining on the ground of firmly established facts known before and independently of any concrete, physiological investigation of the inner mechanisms of the thinking body? And not capable either of being refuted or made doubtful by any further probing within the eye and the skull? In the given, partial, though very characteristic case, there is another, more general problem, namely that of the relation of philosophy as a special science to the concrete research of the natural sciences. Spinoza's position on this point cannot in principle be explained if we start from the positivist idea that philosophy has made all its outstanding achievements only by purely empirical generalization of the progress of its contemporary natural sciences. Because natural science did not find the answers to the problem before us either in the 17th century, in Spinoza's time, or even in our day, 300 years later. Furthermore, the natural science of his day did not even suspect the existence of such a problem, and when it did, knew it only in a theological formulation. As for the soul or spirit, and in general everything connected one way or another with spiritual, psychic life, the natural scientists of the time found themselves prisoners of the prevailing illusions. Spiritual life they gladly left to the church, and humbly acknowledged its authority, interesting themselves exclusively in the mechanical characteristics of the surrounding world. And everything that was inexplicable on purely mechanical grounds was not subjected to scientific study at all but was left to the competence of religion. If Spinoza had in fact tried to construct his philosophical system by the method that our contemporary positivism would have recommended to him, it is not difficult to imagine what he would have produced as a system. He would only have brought together the purely mechanical and religious, mystical general ideas that were guiding all naturalists in his day. Spinoza understood very clearly that religious, theological mysticism was the inevitable complement of a purely mechanistic world outlook, i.e. the point of view that considers the sole objective properties of the real world to be only the spatial, geometrical forms and relations of bodies. His greatness was that he did not plod along behind contemporaneous natural science, i.e. behind the one-sided, mechanistic thinking of the coryphée of the science of the day, but subjected this way of thinking to well-substantiated criticism from the angle of the specific concepts of philosophy as a special science. This feature of Spinoza's thinking was brought out clearly and explicitly by Friedrich Engels. It is to the highest credit of the philosophy of the time that it did not let itself be led astray by the restricted state of contemporary natural knowledge. And that from Spinoza right to the great French materialist it. History of dialectics. 13. Insisted on explaining the world from the world itself and left the justification in detail to the natural science of the future. That is why Spinoza has come down in the history of science as an equal contributor to its progress with Galileo and Newton, and not as their epigone, repeating after them the general ideas that could be drawn from their work. He investigated reality himself from the special, philosophical angle, and did not generalize the results and ready-made findings of other people's investigation, did not bring together the general ideas of the science of his day and the methods of investigation characteristic of it, or the methodology and logic of his contemporary science. He understood that way led philosophy up a blind alley, and condemned it to the role of the wagon train bringing up in the rear of the attacking army the latter's own general ideas and methods, including all the illusions and prejudices incorporated in them. That is why he also developed general ideas and methods of thought to which the natural science of the day had not yet risen, and armed future science with them, which recognized his greatness 3 centuries later through the pen of Albert Einstein, who wrote that he would have liked old Spinoza as the umpire in his dispute with Niels Bohr on the fundamental problems of quantum mechanics rather than Carnap or Bertrand Russell, who were contending for the role of the philosopher of modern science and spoke disdainfully of Spinoza's philosophy as an outmoded point of view which neither science nor philosophy can nowadays accept. Spinoza's understanding of thinking as the activity of that same nature to which extension also belonged is an axiom of the true modern philosophy of our century, to which true science is turning more and more confidently and consciously in our day as the point of view of true materialism. The brilliance of the solution of the problem of the relation of thinking to the world of bodies and space outside thought, which Spinoza formulated in the form of the thesis that thought and extension are not two substances, but only two attributes of one and the same substance, can hardly be exaggerated. This solution immediately rejected every possible kind of interpretation and investigation of thought by the logic of spiritualist and dualist constructions, so making it possible to find a real way out both from the blind alley of the dualism of mind and body and from the specific blind alley of Hegelianism. It is not fortuitous that Spinoza's profound idea only first found true appreciation by the dialectical materialists Marx and Engels. Even Hegel found it a hard nut to crack. In fact, on the decisive point, he returned again to the position of Descartes, to the thesis that pure thought is the active cause of all the changes occurring in the thinking body of man, i.e. in the matter of the brain and sense organs, in language, in actions and their results, including in that the instruments of labor and historical events. From Spinoza's standpoint, thought before and outside of its spatial expression in the matter proper to it simply does not exist. All talk about an idea that first arises and then tries to find material suitable for its incarnation, selecting the body of man and his brain as the most suitable and malleable material. All talk of thought first arising and then being embodied in words, in terms and statements, and later in actions, in deeds and their results. All such talk, therefore, from Spinoza's point of view, is simply senseless or, what is the same thing, simply the atavism of religious theological ideas about the incorporeal soul as the active cause of the human body's actions. In other words, the sole alternative to Spinoza's understanding proves to be the conception that an idea can ostensibly exist first somewhere and somehow outside the body of the thought and independently of it, and can then express itself in that body's actions. What is thought then? How are we to find the true answer to this question, i.e. to give a scientific definition of this concept, and not simply to list all the actions that we habitually subsume under this term, as Descartes did? One quite clear recommendation follows from Spinoza's position, namely, if thought is the mode of action of the thinking body, then, in order to define it, 11 Engels, Dialectics of Nature, MECW Vol 25 page 323, 12 Bertrand Russell, History of Western Philosophy, London 1946, page 601. History of Dialectics. 14. We are bound to investigate the mode of action of the thinking body very thoroughly, in contrast to the mode of action of the non-thinking body, and in no case whatsoever to investigate the structure or spatial composition of this body in an inactive state, because the thinking body, when it is inactive, is no longer a thinking body but simply a body. Investigation of all the material mechanisms by which thought is effected within the human body, i.e. anatomical, physiological study of the brain, of course, is a most interesting scientific question. But even the fullest answers to it have no direct bearing on the answer to the question what is thought, because that is another question. One does not ask how legs capable of walking are constructed, but in what walking consists. What is thinking as the action of, albeit inseparable from, the material mechanisms by which it is effected, yet not in any way identical with mechanisms themselves. In the one case the question is about the structure of an organ, in the other about the function the organ performs. The structures, of course, must be such that it can carry out the appropriate function. Legs are built so that they can walk and not so that they can think. The fullest description of the structure of an organ, i.e. a description of it in an inactive state, however, has no right to present itself as a description, however approximate, of the function that the organ performs, as a description of the real thing that it does. In order to understand the mode of action of the thinking body it is necessary to consider the mode of its active, causal interaction with other bodies both thinking and non-thinking, and not its inner structure. Not the spatial geometric relations that exist between the cells of its body and between the organs located within its body. The cardinal distinction between the mode of action of a thinking body and that of any other body, quite clearly noted by Descartes and the Cartesians, but not understood by them, is that the former actively builds the shape of its own movement in space in conformity with the shape of the other body, coordinating the shape of its own movement with the shape of the other body, whatever it is. The proper, specific form of the activity of a thinking body consists consequently in universality, in that very property that Descartes actually noted as the chief distinction between human activity and the activity of an automaton copying its appearance, i.e. of a device structurally adapted to some one limited range of action even better than a human, but for that very reason unable to do everything else. Thus the human hand can perform movements in the form of a circle, or a square, or any other intricate geometrical figure you fancy, so revealing that it was not designed structurally and anatomically in advance for any one of these actions. And for that very reason is capable of performing any action. In this it differs, say, from a pair of compasses, which describe circles much more accurately than the hand but cannot draw the outlines of triangles or squares. In other words, the action of a body that does not think is determined by its own inner construction by its nature, and is quite uncoordinated with the shape of the other bodies among which it moves. It therefore either disturbs the shapes of the other bodies or is itself broken and colliding with insuperable obstacles. Man, however, the thinking body, builds his movement on the shape of any other body. He does not wait until the insurmountable resistance of other bodies forces him to turn off from his path. The thinking body goes freely round any obstacle of the most complicated form. The capacity of a thinking body to mold its own action actively to the shape of any other body, to coordinate the shape of its movement in space with the shape and distribution of all other bodies. Spinoza considered to be its distinguishing sign and the specific feature of that activity that we call thinking or reason. This capacity, as such, has its own gradations and levels of perfection, and manifests itself to the maximum in man, in any case much more so than in any other creature known to us. But man is not divided from the lower creatures at all by that impassable boundary that Descartes drew between them by his concept of soul or spirit. The actions of animals, especially of the higher animals, are also subsumed, though to a limited degree, under Spinoza's definition of thinking. History of dialectics. 15. This is a very important point, which presents very real interest. For Descartes the animal was only an automaton, i.e. all its actions were determined in advance by ready-made structures, internally inherent to it, and by the distribution of the organs located within its body. These actions, therefore, could and had to be completely explained by the following scheme: external effect, movement of the inner parts of the body, external reaction. The last represents the response of the body evoked by the external effect, which in essence is only transformed by the working of the inner parts of the body, following the scheme rigidly programmed in its construction. There is a full analogy with the working of a self-activating mechanism. This explanation excluded the need for any kind of incorporeal soul. Everything was beautifully explained without its intervention. Such in general, and on the whole, is the theoretical scheme of a reflex that was developed 200 years later in natural science in the work of Sechenov and Pavlov. But this scheme is not applicable to man because in him, as Descartes himself so well understood, there is a supplementary link in the chain of events that powerfully interferes with it, forces its way into it, breaking the ready-made chain and then joining its disconnected ends together in a new way, each time in a different way. Each time in accordance with new conditions and circumstances in the external action not previously foreseen by any prepared scheme, and this supplementary link is reflection or consideration. But a reflection is that activity which directs reconstruction of the very schemes of the transformation of the initial effect into response. Here the body itself is the object of its own activity. Men's response mechanisms are by no means switched on just as soon as the appropriate button is pressed, as soon as he experiences an effect from outside. Before he responds he contemplates, i.e. he does not act immediately according to any one prepared scheme, like an automaton or an animal, but considers the scheme of the forthcoming action critically, elucidating each time how far it corresponds to the needs of the new conditions, and actively correcting, even designing all over again, the whole setup and scheme of the future actions in accordance with the external circumstances and the forms of things. And since the forms of things and the circumstances of actions are in principle infinite in number, the soul must be capable of an infinite number of actions. But that is impossible to provide for in advance in the form of ready-made, bodily programmed schemes. Thinking is the capacity of actively building and reconstructing schemes of external action in accordance with any new circumstances, and does not operate according to a prepared scheme as an automaton or any inanimate body does. For while reason is a universal instrument which can serve for all contingencies, these organs have need of some special adaptation for every particular action, Descartes wrote. For that reason he was unable to conceive of the organ of thought bodily, as structurally organized in space. Because, in that case, as many ready-made, structurally programmed patterns of action would have to be postulated in it as there were external bodies and combinations of external bodies and contingencies that the thinking body would generally encounter in its path, that is, in principle, an infinite number. From this it follows, Descartes said, that it is morally impossible that there should be sufficient diversity in any machine to allow it to act in all the events of life in the same way as our reason causes us to act, i.e. each time taking account again of any of the infinite conditions and circumstances of the external action. 13 Descartes, opposite, page 59, 14 Descartes, opposite, page 59. History of dialectics. 16. Spinoza counted the considerations that drove Descartes to adopt the concept of soul to be quite reasonable. But why not suppose that the organ of thought, while remaining wholly corporeal and therefore incapable of having schemes of its present and future actions reanimate and innate within it together with its bodily organized structure, was capable of actively building them anew each time in accordance with the forms and arrangement of the external things? Why not suppose that the thinking thing was designed in a special way, that not having any ready-made schemes of action within it, it acted for that very reason in accordance with whatever scheme was dictated to it at a given moment by the forms and combinations of other bodies located outside it? For that was the real role or function of the thinking thing, the only functional definition of thinking corresponding to the facts that it was impossible to deduce from structural analysis of the organ in which and by means of which it was performed. Even more so, a functional definition of thinking as action according to the shape of any other thing also puts structural, spatial study of the thinking thing on the right track, i.e. study in particular of the body of the brain. It is necessary to elucidate and discover in the thinking thing those very structural features that enable it to perform its specific function, i.e. to act according to the scheme of its own structure but according to the scheme and location of all other things, including its own body. In that form the materialist approach to the investigation of thought comes out clearly. Such is the truly materialist, functional definition of thought, or its definition as the active function of a natural body organized in a special way, which prompts both logic and brain physiology to make a really scientific investigation of the problem of thought, and which excludes any possibility of interpreting thinking in the matter of its relation to the brain by the logic of either spiritualist and dualist constructions or of vulgar mechanistic ones. In order to understand thought as a function, i.e. as the mode of action of thinking things in the world of all other things, it is necessary to go beyond the bounds of considering what goes on inside the thinking body, and how, and to examine the real system within which this function is performed, i.e. the system of relations thinking body and its object. What we have in mind here, moreover, is not any single object or other in accordance with whose form the thinking body's activity is built in any one specific case, but any object in general, and correspondingly any possible meaningful act or action in accordance with the form of its object. Thought can therefore only be understood through investigation of its mode of action in the system thinking body, nature as a whole. But if we examine a system of smaller volume and scale, i.e. the relations of the thinking body with as wide a sphere of things and their forms as you like, but still limited, then we shall not arrive at what thought is in general, but only at that limited mode of thinking that happens in a given case, and we shall therefore be taking only definitions of a partial Cassioff thinking. Only its modus as scientific definitions of thought in general. The whole business consists in this, that the thinking body is not linked at all by its structural, anatomical organization with any partial mode of action whatsoever. It is linked with them, but only currently, at the given moment, and by no means originally or forever. Its mode of action has a clearly expressed universal character, i.e. is constantly being extended, embracing ever newer and newer things and forms of things, and actively and plastically adapting itself to them. That is why Spinoza also defined thought as an attribute of substance, and not as its modus, not as a partial case. Thus he affirmed, in the language of his day, that the single system, within which thought was found of necessity and not fortuitously, was not a single body or even as wide a range of bodies as you wished, but only and solely nature as a whole. The individual body possessed thought only by virtue of chance or coincidence. The crossing and combination of masses of chains of cause and effect could lead in one case to the appearance of a thinking body and in another case simply to a body, a stone, a tree, etc. so that the individual body, even the human body, did not. History of dialectics. 17. Possess thought one whit of necessity. Only nature as a whole was that system which possessed all its perfections, including thought, of absolute necessity, although it did not realize this perfection in any single body and at any moment of time, or in any of its modi. In defining thought as an attribute, Spinoza towered above any representative of mechanistic materialism and was at least 2 centuries in advance of his time in putting forward a thesis that Engels expressed in rather different words. The point is, however, that mechanism does not get away from abstract necessity, and hence not from chance either. That matter evolves out of itself. The thinking human brain is for him a pure accident, although necessarily determined, step by step, where it happens. But the truth is that it is in the nature of matter to advance to the evolution of thinking beings, hence, too, this always necessarily occurs wherever the conditions for it are present. That is what distinguishes materialism, sensible and dialectical, from mechanistic materialism that knows and recognizes only one variety of necessity, namely that which is described in the language of mechanistically interpreted physics and mathematics. Yes, only nature as a whole, understood as an infinite whole in space and time, generating its own partial forms from itself, possesses at any moment of time, though not at any point of space, all the wealth of its attributes. I.e. those properties that are reproduced in its makeup of necessity and not by a chance, miraculous coincidence that might just as well not have happened. Hence it inevitably follows logically, as Engels said, that matter remains eternally the same in all its transformations, that none of its attributes can ever be lost, and therefore, also, that with the same iron necessity that it will exterminate on the earth its highest creation. The thinking mind, it must somewhere else and at another time again produce it. That was Spinoza's standpoint, a circumstance that seemingly gave Engels grounds for replying categorically and unambiguously to Plekhanov when he asked, so in your opinion old Spinoza was right in saying that thought and extension were nothing but 2 attributes of one and the same substance? Of course, answered Engels, old Spinoza was quite right. Spinoza's definition means the following: in man, as in any other possible thinking creature, the same matter thinks as in other cases only extends in the form of stones or any other unthinking body. That thought in fact cannot be separated from world matter and counterposed to it itself as a special, incorporeal soul, and it is matter's own perfection. That is how Herder and Goethe, La Mettrie and Diderot, Marx and Plekhanov and even the young Schelling, understood Spinoza. Such, let us emphasize once more, is the general, methodological position that later allowed Lenin to declare that it was reasonable to assume, as the very foundation of matter, a property akin to sensation though not identical with it, the property of reflection. Thought, too, according to Lenin, is the highest form of development of this universal property or attribute, extremely vital for matter. And if we deny matter this most important of its attributes, we shall be thinking of matter itself imperfectly, as Spinoza put it, or simply, as Engels and Lenin wrote, incorrectly, one-sidedly, and mechanistically. And then, as a result, we should continually be falling into the most real Berkeleyanism, into interpreting nature as a complex of our sensations, as the bricks or elements absolutely specific to the animated being from which the whole world of ideas is built, because Berkeleyanism too is the absolutely inevitable complement making good of a one-sided, mechanistic understanding of nature. That is why Spinoza too said that substance, i.e. the universal world matter, did not possess just the single attribute of being extended but also possessed many other properties and attributes as inalienable from it. 15 Engels, Dialectics of Nature, MECW Vol 25 page 490, 16 Engels, Dialectics of Nature, MECW Vol 25 page 335, 17 GV Plekhanov Bernstein and Materialism Sachin and I Vol 11, Moscow 1923 page 22. History of Dialectics. 18. Spinoza said more than once that it was impermissible to represent thought as attribute in the image and likeness of human thought. It was only the universal property of substance that was the basis of any finite thought, including human thought, but in no case was it identical with it. To represent thought in general in the image and likeness of existing human thought, of its modus, or particular case, meant simply to represent it incorrectly, in an incomplete way, by a model, so to say, of its far from most perfected image. With that Spinoza also linked his profound theory of truth and error, developed in detail in the Ethica Ordine Geometrico Demonstrata, Tractatus de Intellectus Ernundationer, Tractatus Theologico Politicus, and in numerous letters. If the mode of action of the thinking body as a whole is determined in the form of another, and not of the immanent structure of this body, the problem arises, however are we to recognize error? The question was posed then with special sharpness because it appeared in ethics and theology as the problem of sin and evil. The criticism of Spinozism from the angle of theology was invariably directed at this point. Spinoza's teaching took all the sense out of the very distinguishing of good and evil, sin and righteousness, truth and error. In fact, in what then did they differ? Spinoza's answer again was simple, like any fundamentally true answer. Error was not a characteristic of ideas and actions as regards their own composition, and was not a positive attribute of them. The erring man also acted in strict accordance with the thing's form, but the question was what the thing was. If it were trivial, imperfect in itself, i.e. fortuitous, the mode of action adapted to it would also be imperfect. And if a person transferred this mode of action to another thing, he would slip up. Error, consequently, only began when a mode of action that was limitedly true was given universal significance, when the relative was taken for the absolute. It is understandable why Spinoza put so low a value on acting by abstract, formal analogy, formal deduction based on an abstract universal. What was fixed in the abstract idea was what most often struck the eye. But it, of course, could be a quite accidental property and form of the thing, and that meant that the narrower the sphere of the natural whole with which the person was concerned, the greater was the measure of error and the smaller the measure of truth. For that very reason the activity of the thinking body was in direct proportion to the adequateness of its ideas. The more passive the person, the greater was the power of the nearest, purely external circumstances over him, and the more his mode of action was determined by the chance form of things. Conversely, the more actively he extended the sphere of nature determining his activity, the more adequate were his ideas. The complacent position of the Philistine was therefore the greatest sin. Man's thinking could achieve maximum perfection only in one case, when his actions conformed with all the conditions that the infinite aggregate of interacting things, and of their forms and combinations, imposed on them, i.e. if they were built in accordance with the absolutely universal necessity of the natural whole and not simply with some one of its limited forms. Real earthly man was, of course, still very, very far from that, and the attribute of thought was therefore only realized in him in a very limited and imperfect form. And it would be fallacious to build oneself an idea of thinking as an attribute of substance in the image and likeness of finite human thought. On the contrary, one's finite thought must be built in the image and likeness of thought in general. For finite thought, the philosophical, theoretical definition of thinking as an attribute of substance poses some sort of ideal model, to which man can and must endlessly approximate, though never having the power to bring himself up to it in level of perfection. That is why the idea of substance and its all-embracing necessity functioned as the principle of the constant perfecting or improvement of intellect. As such, it had immense significance. Every finite thing was correctly understood only as a fading moment in the bosom of infinite substance, and not one of its partial forms, however often encountered, should be given universal significance. In order to disclose the really general, truly universal forms of things in accordance with which the perfected thinking body should act, another criterion and another mode of knowledge than formal abstraction was required. The idea of substance was not formed by abstracting the attribute that be. History of dialectics. 19. Longed equally to extension and thought. The abstract and general in them was only that they existed, existence in general, i.e. an absolutely empty determination in no way disclosing the nature of the one or the other. The really general relation between thought and spatial, geometric reality could only be understood, i.e. the idea of substance arrived at, through real understanding of their mode of interaction within nature. Spinoza's whole doctrine was just the disclosure of this infinite relation. Substance thus proved to be an absolutely necessary condition, without assuming which it was impossible in principle to understand the mode of the interaction between the thinking body and the world within which it operated as a thinking body. This is a profoundly dialectical point. Only by proceeding from the idea of substance could the thinking body understand both itself and the reality within which it operated and about which it thought. Any other way it could not understand either the one or the other and was forced to resort to the idea of an outside power, to a theologically interpreted God, to a miracle. But, having once understood the mode of its actions, the thinking body just so comprehended substance as the absolutely necessary condition of interaction with the external world. Spinoza called the mode of knowledge or cognition described here intuitive. In creating an adequate idea of itself, i.e. of the form of its own movement along the contours of external objects, the thinking body thus also created an adequate idea of the forms and contours of the objects themselves. Because it was one and the same form, one and the same contour. In this understanding of the intuitive there was nothing resembling subjective introspection, rather the contrary. On Spinoza's lips, intuitive knowledge was a synonym of rational understanding by the thinking body of the laws of its own actions within nature. In giving itself a rational account of what and how it did in fact operate, the thinking body at the same time formed a true idea of the object of its activity. From that followed the consistent materialist conclusion that the true definition of any one thing neither involves nor expresses anything except the nature of the thing defined. That is why there can only be one correct definition in contrast and in opposition to the plurality and variety of the individual bodies of the same nature. These bodies are as real as the unity of their nature expressed by the definition in the attribute of thought and by real diversity in the attribute of extension, variety and plurality are clearly understood here as modes of realization of their own opposition, i.e. of the identity and unity of their nature. That is a distinctly dialectical understanding of the relation between them, in contrast to the feeble eclectic formula that both unity and plurality, both identity and difference equally really exist. Because eclectic pseudo-dialectics, when it comes down to solving the problem of knowledge and of definition or determination, arrives safely at exactly the contrary. At the idea that the definition of a concept is a verbally fixed form of expression in consciousness, in the idea of a real, sensuously given variety. Talk of the objective identity, existing outside the head, of the nature of a given range of various and opposing single phenomena thus safely boils down to talk about the purely formal unity of sensuously contemplated, empirically given things, of isolated facts, formally subsumed under concept. And it then generally becomes impossible to consider the definition of the concept as the determination of the nature of the defined thing. The starting point then proves to be not the identity and unity of the phenomena but in fact the variety and plurality of isolated facts allegedly existing originally quite independently of one another, and later only formally united, tied together as it were with string. By the unity of the concept and the identity of the name, so the sole result proves to be the identity and consciousness of the initially heterogeneous facts, and their purely verbal unity. Hence it is not difficult to understand why neopositivists are dissatisfied with Spinoza and attack the logical principle of his thinking. Spinoza's metaphysic is the best example of what may be called logic monism, the doctrine, namely, that the world as a whole is a single substance, none of whose. 18 Spinoza, Ethics, in Great Books of the Western World, Vol. 31 page 357. History of dialectics. 20. Parts are logically capable of existing alone. The ultimate basis for this view is the belief that every proposition has a single subject and a single predicate, which leads us to the conclusion that relations and plurality must be illusory. The alternative to Spinoza's view, in fact, is the affirmation that any part of the world is not only capable of existing independently of all other parts, but must do so. As another authority of this trend postulated it, the world is the totality of facts not of things, by virtue of which the world divides into facts, and so any one can either be the case or not be the case, and everything else remain the same. Thus, according to the metaphysic of neopositivism, the external world must be considered some kind of immeasurable accumulation, a simple conglomeration, of atomic facts absolutely independent of each other. The proper determination of each of which is bound to be absolutely independent of the determination of any other fact. The determination remains correct even given the condition that there are no other facts in general. In other words, a scientific consideration of the world consists in a purely formal, verbal uniting of a handful of odd facts by subsuming them under one and the same term, under one and the same general. The general, interpreted only as the meaning of the term or sign, always turns out to be something quite arbitrary or previously agreed upon, i.e. conventional. The general, as the sole result of the scientific logical treatment of the atomic facts, is consequently not the result at all, but a previously established, conventional meaning of the term, and nothing more. Spinoza's position, of course, had no connection with this principle of logical analysis of the phenomena given in contemplation and imagination. For him the general, identical, united were by no means illusions created only by our speech, by its subject-predicate structure, but primarily the real, general nature things. And that nature must find its verbal expression in a correct definition of the concept. It is not true, moreover, that relations and plurality must be illusory for Spinoza, as Russell said. That is not at all like Spinoza, and the affirmation of it is on Russell's conscience, that he should have stooped so low to discredit the concept of substance in the eyes of modern science as incompatible with modern logic and with scientific method. One thing, however, is beyond doubt here. What Russell called modern logic and scientific method really is incompatible with the logic of Spinoza's thinking, with his principles of the development of scientific definitions, with his understanding of correct definitions. For Spinoza, relations and plurality were not illusory and identity and unity were not illusions created solely by the subject-predicate structure. Both the one and the other were wholly real, and both existed in God, i.e. in the very nature of things, quite irrespective of whatever the verbal structures of the so-called language of science were. But for Bertrand Russell, both the one and the other were equally illusions. Identity was an illusion created by language, and relations and plurality were illusions created by our own sensuality. But what, in fact, is independent of our illusions? I do not know, and I don't want to know. I don't want to know because I cannot, Russell answered. I know only what is the world given to me in my sensations and perceptions and in my language. But what is there besides this world? God only knows, answered Russell, word for word repeating Bishop Berkeley's thesis, though not risking to affirm categorically after him that God in fact knew it, because it was still not known if God himself existed. There we have the polar contrast of the positions of Spinoza and of Berkeley and Hume. Berkeley and Hume also primarily attacked. 19 Russell, opposite, pages 601, 20 Wittgenstein, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, London 1955, page 31, 21 Russell, opposite, page 601. History of Dialectics. 21. The whole concept of substance, trying to explain it as the product of an impious mind, because there is a really unpersuasive alternative here. Namely two polar and mutually exclusive solutions of one and the same problem, the problem of the relation of the world in consciousness to the world outside consciousness. For here a choice must be made, either nature, including man as part of it, must be understood through the logic of the concept of substance, or it must be interpreted as a complex of one's sensations. But let us return to consideration of Spinoza's conception. Spinoza well understood all the skeptical arguments against the possibility of finding a single one correct definition of the thing that we are justified in taking as a definition of the nature of the thing itself and not of the specific state and arrangement of the organs within ourselves, in the form of which this thing is represented within us. In considering different variants of the interpretation of one and the same thing, Spinoza drew the following direct conclusion: all these things sufficiently show that every one judges things by the constitution of his brain, or rather accepts the affections of his imagination in the place of things. In other words, we have within us, in the form of ideas, not the thing itself in its proper form, but only the inner state that the effect of the external things evoked in our body. Therefore, in the ideas we directly have of the external world, two quite dissimilar things are muddled and mixed up, the form of our own body and the form of the bodies outside it. The naive person immediately and uncritically takes this hybrid for an external thing, and therefore judges things in conformity with the specific state evoked in his brain and sense organs by an external effect in no way resembling that state. Spinoza gave full consideration to the Cartesian's argument, that toothache was not at all identical in geometric form to a dentist's drill and even to the geometric form of the changes the drill produced in the tooth and the brain. The brain of every person, moreover, was built and tuned differently, from which we get the skeptical conclusion of the plurality of truths and of the absence of a truth one and the same for all thinking beings. For every one has heard the expressions, so many heads, so many ways of thinking, each is wise in his own manner. Differences of brains are not less common than differences of taste, all which maxims show that men decide upon matters according to the constitution of their brains. And imagine rather than understand things. The point is this: to understand and correctly determine the thing itself, its proper form, and not the means by which it is represented inside ourselves, i.e. in the form of geometric changes in the body of our brain and its microstructures. But how is that to be done? Perhaps, in order to obtain the pure form of the thing, it is simply necessary to subtract from the idea all its elements that introduce the arrangement and means of action of our own body, of its sense organs and brain into the pure form of the thing. But we know as little of how our brain is constructed and what exactly it introduces into the composition of the idea of a thing as we know of the external body itself. And the thing in general cannot be given to us in any other way than through the specific changes that it has evoked in our body. If we subtract everything received from the thing in the course of its refraction through the prism of our body, sense organs, and brain, we get pure nothing. Within us there remains nothing, no idea of any kind. So it is impossible to proceed that way. However differently from any other thing man's body and brain are built, they all have something in common with one another, and it is to the finding of this something common that the activity of reason is in fact directed, i.e. the real activity of our body that we call thinking. In other words, an adequate idea is only the conscious state of our body identical in form with the thing, outside the body. This can be represented quite clearly. When I describe a circle with my hand on a piece of paper, my body, according to Spinoza, comes into a state fully identical with the form. 22 Spinoza, opposite, page 372, 23 Spinoza, opposite, page 372. History of Dialectics. 22. Of the circle outside my body, into a state of real action in the form of a circle. My body really describes a circle, and the awareness of this state is also the idea, which is, moreover, adequate. And since the human body needs for its preservation many other bodies by which it is, as it were, continually regenerated, and since it can move and arrange external bodies in many ways, it is in the activity of the human body in the shape of another external body that Spinoza saw the key to the solution of the whole problem. Therefore the human mind is adapted to the perception of many things, and its aptitude increases in proportion to the number of ways in which its body can be disposed. In other words, the more numerous and varied the means it has to move and arrange external bodies, the more it has in common with other bodies. Thus the body, knowing how to be in a state of movement along the contours of circle, in that way knows how to be in a state in common with the state and arrangement of all circles or external bodies moving in a circle. In possessing consciousness of my own state, I thus also possess a quite exact awareness of the shape of the external body. That, however, only happens where and when I actively determine myself, and the states of my body, i.e. its actions, in accordance with the shape of the external body, and not in conformity with the structure and arrangement of my own body and its parts. The more of these actions I know how to perform, the more perfect is my thinking, and the more adequate are the ideas included in the mind, or simply in the conscious states of my body. As he interpreted the term mind on neighboring pages, Descartes' dualism between the world of external objects and the inner states of the human body thus disappeared right at the very start of the explanation. It is interpreted as a difference within one and the same world, as a difference in their mode of existence. The specific structure of the human body and brain is here, for the first time, interpreted not as a barrier separating us from the world of things, which are not at all like that body, but on the contrary as the same property of universality that enables the thinking body to be in the very same states as things, and to possess forms in common with them. Spinoza himself expressed it thus: there will exist in the human mind an adequate idea of that which is common and proper to the human body, and to any external bodies by which the human body is generally affected, of that which is equally in the part of each of these external bodies and in the whole is common and proper. Hence it follows that the more things the body has in common with other bodies, the more things will the mind be adapted to perceive. Hence, also it follows that some ideas or notions exist which are common to all men, for all bodies agree in some things, which must be adequately, that is to say, clearly and distinctly, perceived by all. In no case can these common ideas be interpreted as specific forms of the human body, and they are only taken for the forms of external bodies by mistake. Despite the fact that the human mind perceives no external body as actually existing, unless through the ideas of the affections of its body. The fact is that the affections of one's body are quite objective, being the actions of the body in the world of bodies, and not the results of the action of bodies on something unlike them, in corpo. 24 Ibid, page 380 25 Ibid 26 Ibid 27 Spinoza, opposite, pages 386 728 Ibid, page 386, 29 Ibid, page 384. History of Dialectics. 23. Real. Therefore, he who possesses a body fit for many things possesses a mind of which the greater part is external. From all that it follows that the more we understand individual objects, the more we understand God, i.e. the general universal nature of things, world substance. The more individual things our activity embraces and the deeper and more comprehensively we determine our body to act along the shape of the external bodies themselves, and the more we become an active component in the endless chain of the causal relations of the natural whole. The greater is the extent to which the power of our thinking is increased, and the less there is of the specific constitution of our body and brain mixed into the ideas making them vague and inadequate. The more active our body is, the more universal it is, the less it introduces from itself, and the more purely it discloses the real nature of things. And the more passive it is, the more the constitution and arrangement of the organs within it affect ideas. Therefore the real composition of psychic activity is not in the least determined by the structure and arrangement of the parts of the human body and brain, but by the external conditions of universally human activity in the world of other bodies. This functional determination gives an exact orientation to structural analysis of the brain, fixes the general goal, and gives a criterion by which we can distinguish the structures through which thinking is carried on within the brain from those that are completely unrelated to the process of thought, but govern, say, digestion, circulation of the blood, and so on. That is why Spinoza reacted very ironically to all contemporaneous morphological hypotheses, and in particular to that of the special role of the pineal gland as primarily the organ of the mind. On this he said straight out, since you are philosophers, do not build speculative hypotheses about the structure of the body of the brain, but leave investigation of what goes on inside the thinking body to doctors, anatomists, and physiologists. You, as philosophers, not only can, but are bound to, work out for doctors and anatomists and physiologists the functional determination of thinking and not its structural determination, and you must do it strictly and precisely, and not resort to vague ideas about an incorporeal mind, God, and so on. But you can find the functional determination of thought only if you do not probe into the thinking body, but carefully examine the real composition of its objective activities among the other bodies of the infinitely varied universe, and within the skull you will not find anything to which a functional definition of thought could be applied, because thinking is a function of external, objective activity, and you must therefore investigate not the anatomy and physiology of the brain but the anatomy and physiology of the body whose active function in fact is thought, i.e. the inorganic body of man, the anatomy and physiology of the world of his culture, the world of the things that he produces and reproduces by his activity. The sole body that thinks from the necessity built into its special nature is not the individual brain at all, and not even the whole man with the brain, heart, and hands, and all the anatomical features peculiar to him. Of necessity, according to Spinoza, only substance possesses thought. Thinking has its necessary premise and indispensable condition in all nature as a whole, but that, Marx affirmed, is not enough. According to him, only nature of necessity thinks, nature that has achieved the stage of man socially producing his own life, nature changing and knowing itself in the person of man or of some other creature like him in this respect, universally altering nature. Both that outside him and his own, a body of smaller scale and less structural complexity will not think. Labor is the process of changing nature by the action of social man, and is the subject to which. 30 Ibid, page 462, 31 Spinoza, opposite, pages 458. History of Dialectics. 24. Thought belongs as predicate, but nature, the universal matter of nature, is also its substance. Substance, having become the subject of all its changes in man, the cause of itself. 3. Kant, Logic and Dialectics. The most direct path to the creation of dialectical logic, as we have already said, is repetition of the past, made wise by experience, repetition of the work of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, or critical, materialist rethinking of the achievements that humanity owes in the realm of the higher logic to classical German philosophy of the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries, to the process of spiritual maturing, striking in its rapidity, associated with the names of Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. The matter of logic then underwent, in a very short historical period, the most prodigious flight of imagination since antiquity, marked in itself by an inner dialectic so tense that even simple acquaintance with it still cultivates dialectical thinking. First of all, we must note that it was German classical philosophy that clearly recognized and sharply expressed the fact that all problems of philosophy as a special science somehow or other turned on the question of what thought was and what were its interrelations with the external world. Understanding of this fact, already matured earlier in the systems of Descartes and Locke, Spinoza and Leibniz, was now transformed into the consciously established jumping-off point of all investigations, into the basic principle of a critical rethinking of the results of the preceding development. Philosophy, completing in Kant a more than two-century cycle of investigation, entered on a fundamentally new stage of understanding and resolving of its special problems. The need to examine and analyze the path critically was not of course dictated only by the inner needs of philosophy itself, by the striving to completeness and orderliness, but mainly by the powerful pressure of outside circumstances. The crisis-ridden, pre-revolutionary state of all intellectual culture. The intense conflict of ideas in all spheres of intellectual life, from politics to natural science, willy-nilly involved in ideological struggle, more and more insistently impelled philosophy to dig down ultimately to the very roots and sources of what was happening. To understand where the general cause of the mutual hostility between people and ideas was hidden, to find and point out to people the rational way out of the situation that had arisen. Kant was the first to attempt to embrace within the framework of a single conception all the main opposing principles of the thought of the time which was approaching a catastrophic collision. In trying to unite and reconcile those principles within one system he only, against his will, exposed more clearly the essence of the problems which were unresolvable by the tried and known methods of philosophy. The actual state of affairs in science presented itself to Kant as a war of all against all, in the image of that natural state which, following Hobbes, he characterized as a state of injustice and violence. In this state scientific thought can establish and secure its assertions only through war. In that case the disputes are ended by a victory to which both sides lay claim, and which is generally followed by a merely temporary armistice. Arranged by some mediating authority. Putting it another way, it was the tension of the struggle between opposing principles, each of which had been developed into a system claiming universal significance and recognition, that constituted the natural state of human thought for Kant. The natural, actual, and obvious state of thought, consequently, was just dialectics. Kant was not at all concerned to extirpate it once and for all from the life of reason, i.e. from science understood as a certain developing whole, but only ultimately to find a corresponding rational means of resolving the contradictions, discussions, disputes, conflicts, and antagonisms arising in science. Could reason itself, without the aid of authority, overcome the anguish of dissension? 32 Kant, Critique of Pure Reason, T.R.N. K. Smith, London 1929 page 601. History of Dialectics. 25. The endless disputes of a merely dogmatic reason, as he put it, thus finally constrain us to seek relief in some critique of reason itself, and in a legislation based upon such criticism. The state of endless disputes, and hostility between theoreticians, seemed to Kant to be a consequence of the fact that the Republic of Scholars did not as yet have a single, systematically developed legislation recognized by all, or constitution of reason, which would enable it to seek solution of the conflicts not in war to the death but in the sphere of polite, academic discussion, in the form of a legal process or action in which each party would hold to one and the same code of logical substantiation and, recognizing the opponent as an equally competent and equally responsible party as himself, would remain not only critical but also self-critical, always ready to recognize his mistakes and transgressions against the logical rules. This ideal of the interrelations of theoreticians, and it is difficult to raise any objection against it even now, loomed before Kant as the goal of all his investigations. But thereby, at the center of his attention, there was above all that field which tradition assigned to the competence of logic. It was quite obvious to Kant, on the other hand, that logic in the form in which it existed could not in any way satisfy the pressing needs of the situation created, or serve as a tool to analyze it. The very term logic was so discredited by then that Hegel was fully justified in speaking of the universal and complete scorn for the science that for hundreds and thousands of years was just as much honored as it is despised now. And only the profound reform that it underwent in the work of the classical German philosophers restored respect and dignity to the very name of the science of thought. Kant was the very first to try to pose and resolve the problem of logic specifically by way of a critical analysis of its content and historical fate. For the first time he compared its traditional baggage with the real processes of thinking in natural science and in the sphere of social problems. Kant above all set himself the goal of bringing out and summing up the undisputed truths which had been formulated within the framework of traditional logic, though also scorned for their banality. In other words, he tried to bring out those invariants that had remained unaffected during all the discussions on the nature of thinking stretching over centuries and millennia, the propositions that no one had called in question, neither Descartes nor Berkeley, neither Spinoza nor Leibniz, neither Newton nor Huygens, not one theoretically thinking individual. Having singled this residue out from logic, Kant was satisfied that what remained was not very much, a few quite general propositions formulated in fact by Aristotle and his commentators. From the angle from which Kant surveyed the history of logic it was impossible to draw any other conclusion, for it went without saying that if one sought only those propositions in logic with which everyone equally agreed, both Spinoza and Berkeley, both the rationalist naturalist and the theologian, and all their disagreements were taken out of the brackets, then nothing else would remain within the brackets. Nothing except those completely general ideas about thought that seemed indisputable to all people thinking in the defined tradition. There thus existed a purely empirical generalization, really stating only that not a single one of the theoreticians so far occupying themselves with thought had actually disputed a certain totality of judgments. But you could not tell from these judgments whether they were true in themselves, or were really only common and generally accepted illusions. For all theoreticians had hitherto thought in accordance with a number of rules. Kant, however, transformed the purely empirical generalization into a theoretical judgment about the subject matter of logic in general, about the legitimate limits of its subject matter. The sphere of logic is quite precisely delimited. Its sole concern is to give an exhaustive exposition and a strict proof of the formal rules of all thought. Here formal means quite independent of how thought precisely is understood, and of its origins and objects or goals. It's 33 Ibid, page 604, 34 Hegel, Lectures on the History of Philosophy, Vol. 2, page 210, 35 Kant, opposite, page 18. History of Dialectics. 26. Relations to men's other capacities and to the external world, and so on and so forth, i.e. independent of how the problem of the external conditions within which thinking is performed according to the rules is resolved, and of metaphysical, psychological, anthropological, and other considerations. Kant declared these rules to be absolutely true and universally obligatory for thought in general, whether it be a priori or empirical, whatever be its origin or object, and whatever hindrances, accidental or natural, it may encounter in our minds. Having thus drawn the boundaries of logic, that logic should have been thus successful is an advantage which it owes entirely to its limitations, whereby it is justified in abstracting indeed. It is under obligation to do so from all objects of knowledge and their differences. Kant painstakingly investigated its fundamental possibilities. Its competence proved to be very narrow. By virtue of the formality mentioned, it of necessity left out of account the differences in the views that clashed in discussion, and remained absolutely neutral not only in, say, the dispute between Leibniz and Hume but also in a dispute between a wise man and a fool. So long as the fool correctly set out whatever ideas came into his head from God knew where, and however absurd and foolish they were. Its rules were such that it must logically justify any absurdity so long as the latter was not self-contradictory. A self-consistent stupidity must pass freely through the filter of general logic. Kant especially stresses that general logic contains, and can contain, no rules for judgment, that is the faculty of subsuming under the rules, that is, of distinguishing whether something does or does not stand under a given rule. The firmest knowledge of the rules in general is therefore no guarantee of their faultless application. Since deficiency in judgment is just what is ordinarily called stupidity, and since for such a failing there is no remedy, general logic cannot serve either as an organon of real knowledge or even as a canon of it, i.e. as a criterion for testing ready-made knowledge. In that case then, for what is it in general needed? Exclusively for checking the correctness of so-called analytical judgments, i.e. ultimately, acts of verbal exposition of ready-made ideas already present in the head, however unsound these ideas are in themselves. Kant stated in full agreement with Berkeley, Descartes, and Leibniz. The contradiction between a concept and experience and the facts is a situation about which general logic has no right to say anything. Because then it is a question already of an act of subsuming facts under the definition of a concept and not of disclosures of the sense that was previously contained in the concept. For example, if I affirm that all swans are white, then, having seen a bird identical in all respects except color with my idea of a swan, I shall be faced with a difficulty, which general logic cannot help me to resolve in any way. One thing is clear, that this bird will not be subsumed under my concept swan without contradiction, and I shall be obliged to say, it is not a swan. If, all the same, I recognize it as a swan, then the contradiction between the concept and the fact will already be converted into a contradiction between the determinations of the concept. Because the subject of the judgment will be defined through two mutually exclusive predicates. And that is already inadmissible and equivalent to recognition that my initial concept was incorrectly defined, and that it must be altered, in order to eliminate the contradiction. So that every time the question arises of whether or not to subsume a given fact under a given concept, the appearance of a contradiction cannot be taken at all as an index of the accuracy or inaccuracy of a judgment. A judgment may prove to be true simply because the contradiction in the given case demolishes the initial concept, and reveals its contradictoriness, and hence its falsity. That is why 1. 36 Ibid, page 18, 37 Ibid, 38 Ibid, page 177, 39 Kant, opposite 40 Ibid. History of dialectics. 27. Cannot apply the criteria of general logic unthinkingly where it is a matter of experimental judgments, of the acts of subsuming facts under the definition of a concept, of acts of concretizing an initial concept through the facts of experience. For in such judgments the initial concept is not simply explained but has new determinations added to it. A synthesis takes place, a uniting of determinations, and not analysis, i.e. the breaking down of already existing determinations into details. All judgments of experience, without exception, have a synthetic character. The presence of a contradiction in the makeup of such a judgment is consequently a natural and inevitable phenomenon in the process of making a concept more precise in accordance with the facts of experience. To put it another way, general logic has no right to make recommendations about the capacity of a judgment since this capacity has the right to subsume under the definition of a concept those facts that directly and immediately contradict that definition. Any empirical concept is therefore always in danger of being refuted by experience, by the first fact that strikes the eye. Consequently, a judgment of a purely empirical character, i.e. one in which an empirically given, sensuously contemplated thing or object functions as subject, e.g. our statement about swans, is true and correct only with the obligatory reservation, all swans that have so far come within our field of experience are white. Such a statement is indisputable, because it does not claim to apply to any individual things of the same kind that we have not yet been able to see. And further experience has the right to correct our definitions and to alter the predicates of the statement. Our theoretical knowledge is constantly coming up against such difficulties in fact, and always will. But if that is so, if science develops only through a constant juxtaposition of concepts and facts, through a constant and never-ending process of resolving the conflict that arises here again and again, then the problem of the theoretical scientific concept is sharply posed immediately. Does a theoretical scientific generalization, claiming universality and necessity, differ from any empirical, inductive generalization? The complications that arise here were wittily described a century or more later by Bertrand Russell in the form of a fable. Once there was a hen in a hen coop. Every day the farmer brought it corn to peck, and the hen certainly drew the conclusion that appearance of the farmer was linked with the appearance of corn. But one fine day the farmer appeared not with corn but with a knife, which convincingly proved to the hen that there would have been no harm in having a more exact idea of the path to a scientific generalization. In other words, are such generalizations possible as can, despite being drawn from only fragmentary experience relative to the given object, nevertheless claim to be concepts providing scientific prediction, i.e. to be extrapolated with assurance to future experience about the self-same object? Are concepts possible that express not only and not simply more or less chance common attributes, which in another place and another time may not be present, but also the substance itself, the very nature of the given kind of object, the law of their existence? That is to say, are such determinations possible, in the absence of which the very object of the given concept is absent, and when there is already another object, which for that very reason is competent neither to confirm nor to refute the definition of the given concept? As, for example, consideration of a square or a triangle has no bearing on our understanding of the properties of a circle or an ellipse. Since the definition of the concept circumference of a circle contains only such predicates as strictly describe the boundaries of the given kind of figure, boundaries that it is impossible to cross without passing into another kind. The concept thus presupposes such predicates as cannot be eliminated by any future, any possible experience. So the Kantian distinction between purely empirical and theoretical scientific generalizations arises. The determinations of concepts must be characterized by universality and necessity, i.e. must be given in such a way that they cannot be refuted by any future experience. Theoretical scientific judgments and generalizations, unlike purely empirical ones, in any case claim to be universal and necessary however the metaphysical, psychological, or anthropological foundations. History of dialectics. 28. Of such claims are explained, to be confirmable by the experience of everybody of sound mind, and not refutable by that experience. Otherwise all science would have no more value than the utterances of the fool in the parable who produces sententious statements at every opportune and inopportune moment that are only pertinent and justified in strictly limited circumstances. I.e. thoughtlessly uttering statements applicable only on particular occasions as absolutes and universals, true in any other case, in any conditions of time and place. The theoretical generalizations of science have to indicate not only the definition of the concept but also the whole fullness of the conditions of its applicability, universality, and necessity. But that is the whole difficulty. Can we categorically establish that we have listed the whole series of necessary conditions? Can we be sure that we have included only the really necessary conditions in it? Or have we perhaps included superfluous ones, not absolutely necessary? Kant remained open on this question, too, and he was right, since there is always the chance of a mistake here. In fact, how many times science has taken the particular for the general? In any case it is clear that general, i.e. purely formal, logic has no right here either to formulate a rule making it possible to distinguish the simply general from the universal, to distinguish that which has been observed up to now from that which will be observed in the future. However long our experience goes on for and however broad the field of facts that it embraces. For the rules of general logic, judgments of the type of all swans are white are quite indistinguishable from statements of the type of all bodies are extended. Because the difference in them consists not in the form of the judgment but exclusively in the content and origin of the concept embraced in it. The first is empirical and preserves its full force only in relation to experience already past, the second claims to a greater force, to be correct also in relation to the future. And to any possible experience regarding natural bodies. For that reason we are convinced that however far we traveled in space and however deep we penetrated into matter we would never and nowhere encounter a natural body that refuted our conviction. I.e. a body without extension. Why? Because there cannot be a body without extension in nature. To answer thus, Kant said, would be impudent. All we can say is the following: if, even in the infinite universe, such remarkable bodies did exist, they could never, in any case, come within our field of vision, within our field of experience. And if they could, then they would be perceived by us as extended, or would not be perceived at all. For such is the structure of our organs of perception that they can only perceive things in the form of space, only as extensions and continuities. It may be said that they are such in themselves. Kant did not consider it possible to deny that, or to assert it. But for us they are precisely such, and cannot be otherwise, because then they would not in general be part of our experience, would not become objects of experience, and therefore would not serve as the basis for scientific statements and propositions, for mathematics, physics, chemistry, and other disciplines. The spatial temporal determinations of things are thus rescued from danger of refutation by any possible experience, because they are precisely true on condition of that very experience being possible. All theoretical propositions as such acquire a universal and necessary character and no longer need to be confirmed by experience. That is why Kant defined them as a priori, synthetic statements. It is by virtue of this character of theirs that we can be quite confident that 2 times 2 are 4 and not 5 or 6, not only on our sinful earth but also on any other planet, that the diagonal of a square will be just as incommensurate with its sides, and that the laws discovered by Galileo, Newton, and Kepler will be the same in any corner of the universe as in the part investigated by us. Because only and exclusively universal and necessary definitions, predicates of the concept, are linked together in these propositions. History of dialectics. 29. But if the main problem that science comes up against proves not to be analytical judgments but synthetic ones, and general logic is only competent to judge analytical correctness, then we must inevitably conclude that there must be a special logic, apart from general logic, having to do only with theoretical applications of the intellect, with the rules of producing theoretical judgments, i.e. judgments that we are entitled to appraise as universal, necessary, and therefore objective. When we have reason to consider a judgment necessarily universal, we must consider it objective also, that is, that it expresses not merely a reference of our perception to a subject, but a quality of the object. For there would be no reason for the judgments of other men necessarily agreeing with mine, if it were not the unity of the object to which they all refer, and with which they accord, hence they must all agree with one another. True, we still do not know anything about the thing in itself, i.e. outside the experience of all people in general, but that, in the experience of all existing and future people organized like ourselves, it will necessarily look exactly the same a theoretical judgment must guarantee. Hence Kant also drew the conclusion that there must be a logic that dealt specially with the principles and rules of the theoretical application of thought or the conditions of applying the rules of general logic to the solution of special, theoretical problems, to acts of producing universal, necessary, and thus objective judgments. This logic was still not entitled, unlike general logic, to ignore the difference between knowledge and content and origin. It could and must serve as an adequate canon for thinking that laid claim to the universality and necessity of its conclusions, generalizations, and propositions. Kant conferred the title of transcendental logic on it, i.e. the logic of truth. The center of attention here naturally turned out to be the problem of what Kant called the intellect's synthetic activity, i.e. the activity by which new knowledge was achieved, and not ideas already existing in the head clarified. By synthesis, in its most general sense, he said, I understand the act of putting different representations together and of grasping what is manifold in them in one knowledge. Thus he assigned synthesis the role and sense of the fundamental operation of thinking, preceding any analysis in content and in time. Whereas analysis consisted in act of arranging ready ideas and concepts, synthesis served as an act of producing new concepts. And the rules of general logic had a very conditional relation to that act, and so in general to the original, initial forms of the working of thought. In fact, Kant said, where reason had not previously joined anything together there was nothing for it to divide, and before we analyze our representations, the representations must themselves be given, and therefore as regards content no concepts can arise by way of analysis. So the original, fundamental, logical forms, it transpired, were not the principles of general logic, not the fundamental principles of analytical judgments, but only universal forms, schemas, and means of uniting various ideas into the body of some new idea, schemas ensuring unity of diversity, means of identifying the different and uniting the heterogeneous. Thus, notwithstanding the formal order of his exposition, and despite it, Kant in essence affirmed that the really universal initial and fundamental logical forms were not those at all that were considered such by traditional formal logic, but that these were rather the second story of logical science, and so derivative, secondary, and true only insofar as they agreed with the more universal and important, with the propositions relating to the synthesis of determinations in the composition of a concept and judgment. 41 Kant, Prologamina zu einer Künftigen Metaphysik, Songliche Werke, page 58, 42 Kant, Critique of Pure Reason, page 111, 43 Kant, Opposite, page 111. History of Dialectics. 30. It was clearly a complete revolution in views on the subject matter of logic as the science of thought. Not enough attention is usually paid to this point in expounding Kant's theory of thought, although it is here that he proved to be the real progenitor of a fundamentally new dialectical stage in the development of logic as a science. Kant was the first to begin to see the main logical forms of thinking in categories, thus including everything in the subject matter of logic that all preceding tradition had put into the competence of ontology and metaphysics, and never into that of logic. The union of representations in one consciousness is judgment. Thinking therefore is the same as judging, or referring representations to judgments in general. Hence judgments are either merely subjective, when representations are referred to a consciousness in one subject only, and united in it, or objective, when they are united in a consciousness generally, that is, necessarily. The logical functions of all judgments are but various modes of uniting representations in consciousness, but if they serve for concepts, they are concepts of their necessary union in a consciousness, and so principles of objectively valid judgments. Categories are also principles of objectively valid judgments. And just because the old logic had turned up its nose at investigating these fundamental logical forms of thinking, it could neither help the movement of theoretical, scientific knowledge with advice nor tie up the loose ends in its own theory. I have never been able to accept the interpretation which logicians give of judgment in general. Kant said, it is, they declare, the representation of a relation between two concepts. I do not here dispute with them as to what is defective in this interpretation, that in any case it applies only to categorical, not to hypothetical and disjunctive judgments. An oversight from which many troublesome consequences have followed. I need only point out that the definition does not determine in what the asserted relation consists. Kant clearly posed the task of understanding categories as logical units, and of disclosing their logical functions in the process of producing and transforming knowledge. True, as we shall see below, he also displayed an almost uncritical attitude to the definitions of the categories borrowed by logic from ontology. But the problem was posed. The definitions of categories were understood as logical schemas or the principles of linking ideas together in objective judgments. Categories were thus those universal forms of the activity of the subject by means of which coherent experience became possible in general, i.e. by which isolated perceptions were fixed in the form of knowledge, since experience is knowledge by means of connected perceptions. The categories are conditions of the possibility of experience, and are therefore valid a priori for all objects of experience. Any judgment, therefore, that claimed to universal significance, always overtly or covertly included a category. We cannot think an object save through categories. And if logic claimed to be the science of thinking, it must also develop just this doctrine of categories as a coherent system of categorical determinations of thought. Otherwise it simply had no right to call itself the science of thought. Thus it was Kant who saw the main essence of logic in categorical definitions of knowledge, and began to understand logic primarily as the systematic exposition of categories, universal and necessary concepts characterizing an object in general. Those very concepts that were traditionally considered the monopoly of metaphysical investigations. At the same time, and this is linked with the very essence of Kant's conception, categories were nothing other than universal forms of the cognitive activity of the subject. Purely logical forms of thinking understood not as a psychic act of the individual but a generic activity of man, as the impersonal process of development of science, as the process of the crystallizing out of universal scientific knowledge in the individual consciousness. 44 Kant, Prolegomena, opposite, page 66, 45 Kant, Critique of Pure Reason, page 158, 46 Kant, Prolegomena, opposite, page 171, 47 Idid, page 173. History of Dialectics. 31. Kant, not without grounds, considered Aristotle the founder of this understanding of logic, that same Aristotle on whom, following medieval tradition, responsibility had been put for the narrow, formal understanding of the boundaries and competence of logic. Though in fact it was not as at all. Kant, however, reproached Aristotle for not having given any deduction of his table of categories, but simply only setting out and summing up those categories that already functioned in the existing consciousness of his time. The Aristotelian list of categories therefore suffered from empiricism. In addition, and on Kant's lips the reproach sounds even more severe, Aristotle, not having been content with explaining the logical function of categories, had also ascribed a metaphysical meaning to them, explaining them not only as logical, i.e. theoretical cognitive schemes of the activity of the mind but also as universal forms of existence, universal determinations of the world of things in themselves, that is to say he hypostatized the purest logical schemas as metaphysics, as a universal theory of objectivity as such. Kant thus saw Aristotle's main sin as having taken the forms of thinking for the forms of being or existence, and so having converted logic into metaphysics, into ontology. Hence also the task of having, in order to correct Aristotle's mistake, to convert metaphysics into logic. In other words, Kant still saw the real significance of Aristotle, through the converting prism of his initial precepts, as the father of logic and understood that Aristotle was such in his capacity as author of the metaphysics. So Kant once and for all cut the roots of the medieval interpretation both of Aristotle and of logic, which had seen the logical doctrine of the Stagirite only in the texts of the Organon. This unnatural separation of logic from metaphysics, which in fact was due not to Aristotle at all but to the Stoics and Scholastics, acquired the force of prejudice in the Middle Ages, but was removed and overcome by Kant. Kant did not give his system of categories in the Critique of Pure Reason, but only posed the task of creating one in general fashion, since at present we are concerned not with the completeness of the system, but only with the principles to be followed in its construction. He also did not set out the logic, but only the most general principles and outlines of its subject matter in its new understanding, its most general categories quantity, quality, relation, and modality, each of which was made more concrete in three derivatives. Kant considered that the further development of the system of logic in the spirit of these principles no longer constituted a special work. It will be obvious that a full glossary, with all the requisite explanations, is not only a possible, but an easy task. It can easily be carried out, with the aid of the ontological manuals for instance, by placing under the category of causality the predicables of force, action, passion, under the category of community the predicables of presence, resistance, under the predicaments of modality, the predicables of coming to be, ceasing to be, change, etc. Here again, as was the case with general logic, Kant displayed an absolutely uncritical attitude to the theoretical baggage of the old metaphysics, and to the determinations of categories developed in it. Since he reduced the business of creating the new logic to very uncritical rethinking, to a purely formal transformation of the old metaphysics into logic. In practice it sometimes resulted simply in the renaming of ontological concepts as logical. But the very carrying out of the task posed by Kant very quickly led to an understanding that it was not so simple to do, since what was required was not a formal change but a very serious and far-reaching, radical transformation of the whole system of philosophy. Kant himself still did not clearly and completely realize this fact. He had only partially detected the dialectical contradictions of the old metaphysics, in the form of the famous four antinomies of pure reason. A start, however, had been made. According to Kant, categories were purely logical forms, schemas of the activity of the intellect linking together the facts of sensuous experience in the form of concepts and theoretical judgments. In themselves categories were empty, and any attempt to use them as other than. 48 Kant, Prolegomena, opposite, page 114, 49 Ibid, page 115, 50 Ibid, page 115. History of Dialectics. 32. Logical forms of the generalization of empirical facts led one way or the other only to balderdash and logomachy. Kant expressed this idea in his own manner, affirming that it was impossible in any case to understand categories as abstract determinations of things in themselves as they existed outside the consciousness of people and outside experience. They characterized, in a universal way, only the conceivably object, i.e. the external world as in how we of necessity thought of it, as in how it was represented in consciousness after being refracted through the prism of our sense organs and forms of thinking. Transcendental logic, therefore, the logic of truth, was logic, only the doctrine of thinking. Its concepts told us absolutely nothing about how matters stood in the world outside experience, whether in the world of the transcendental outside the bounds of experience, there was causality, necessity, and chance, quantitative and qualitative differences. A difference in the probability and inevitability of an event occurring, and so on and so forth. That question Kant thought it impossible to answer, but in the world as given to us by experience matters stood exactly as logic pictured them, and science needed nothing more. Science was therefore always and everywhere obliged to discover causes and laws, to differentiate the probable from the absolutely inevitable, to explain and numerically express the degree of probability of any particular event happening, and so on. In the world with which science was concerned there was no need, even as hypothetically assumed factors, for unextended or eternal factors, incorporeal forces, absolutely unalterable substances, and other accessories of the old metaphysics. The place of the old ontology must now be taken not by some one science, even though new in principle and clarified by criticism, but only the whole aggregate of real experimental sciences: mathematics, mechanics, physics, chemistry, celestial mechanics, geology, anthropology, physiology. Only all the existing sciences together, generalizing the data of experience by means of the categories of transcendental logic, were in a position to tackle the task that the old ontology had monopolized. Tautical at Kant, however, emphasized, but by no means to solve it. They could not solve it, for it was insoluble by the very essence of the matter, and not at all because the experience on which such a picture of the world as a whole was built was never complete, and not because science, developing with time, would discover more and more new fields of facts and correct its own propositions, thus never achieving absolute finality in its constructions of the world and concepts. If Kant had argued like that he would have been absolutely right, but with him this quite true thought acquired a rather different form of expression, and was converted into a basic thesis of agnosticism, into an affirmation that it was impossible in general to construct a unified, scientifically substantiated picture of the world even relatively satisfactory for a given moment of time. The trouble was that any attempt to construct such a picture inevitably collapsed at the very moment of being made, because it was immediately smashed to smithereens by antinomies and imminent contradictions, by the shattering forces of dialectics. The picture sought would inevitably be self-contradictory, which was the equivalent for Kant of its being false. Why was that so? The answer is in the chapter of the Critique of Pure Reason devoted to analysis of the logical structure of reason as the highest synthetic function of the human intellect. Another task, it turned out, remained outside the competence of either general or transcendental logic, a task with which scientific understanding was constantly in collision. That of the theoretical synthesis of all the separate experimental statements that made up a single theory developed from a single common principle. Now the job already was not to generalize, i.e. to unite and link together, the sensuously contemplated, empirical facts given in living contemplation, in order to obtain concepts, but the concepts themselves. It was no longer a matter of schemas of the synthesis of sensuous facts and reason, but of the unity of reason itself in the products of its activity in the structure of a theory, in the structure of a system of concepts and judgments. Generalizing of the factual data by means of a concept, and the generalizing of concepts by means of a theory, by means of an idea or general guiding principle, were of course quite different operations, and the rules for them must be different. History of dialectics. 33. There is therefore yet another story in Kant's logic, a kind of meta-logic of truth bringing under its critical control and surveillance not individual acts of rational activity but all reason as a whole, thinking with a capital T, so to say. Thinking in its highest synthetic functions and not separate and partial operational schemas of synthesis. The striving of thought to create a single, integral theory is natural and ineradicable. It cannot be satisfied, and does not wish to be, by simple aggregates, simple piling up of partial generalizations, but is always striving to bring them together, to link them together by means of general principles. It is a legitimate striving, and since it is realized in activity and thus appears as a separate power, Kant called it reason in distinction from understanding. Reason is the same as understanding, only it is involved in the solving of a special task, explanation of the absolute unity and diversity, the synthesis of all its schemas and the results of their application and experience. Naturally it also operates there according to the rules of logic, but in resolving this task, thought, though exactly observing all the rules and norms of logic without exception, still inevitably lands in a contradiction, in self-destructing. Kant painstakingly showed that this did not happen as a consequence of slovenliness or negligence in any thinking individuals at all, but precisely because the individuals were absolutely guided by the requirements of logic, true. Where its rules and norms were powerless and without authority, in entering the field of reason, thinking invades a country where these laws do not operate. The old metaphysics struggled for whole millennia in hopeless contradictions and strife because it stubbornly tried to do its job with unsuitable tools. Kant set himself the task of discovering and formulating the special rules that would subordinate the power of thinking to organize all the separate generalizations and judgments of experience into a unity, into the structure of an integral theoretical schema, i.e. to establish the legislation of reason. Reason, as the highest synthetic function of the intellect, endeavors to carry out the synthetic unity, which is thought in the category, up to the completely unconditioned. In this function thinking strives for a full explanation of all the conditions in which each partial generalization of understanding can be considered justified without further reservations. For only then would a generalization be fully insured against refutation by new experience, i.e. from contradiction with other, just as correct generalizations. The claim to absolutely complete, unconditional synthesis of the existing determinations of a concept, and so of the conditions within which these determinations are unreservedly true is exactly equivalent to a claim to understand things in themselves. In fact, if I risk asserting that subject A is determined by predicate B in its absolute totality, and not just in part that existed or might exist in our field of experience, I remove the very limitation from my assertion that transcendental logic has established for all experimental judgments, that is to say, I am no longer stating that it is true only in conditions imposed by our own forms of experience, our modes of perception, schemas of generalization, and so on. I begin to think that the statement describing predicate B to subject A is already true not only within the conditions of experience but outside them, that it relates to A not only as the object of any possible experience but also irrespective of that experience, and defines A as an object existing in itself. That means to remove all the limitations governing it from the generalization, including the conditions imposed by experience. But all the conditions cannot be removed, for the conception of the absolute totality of conditions is not applicable in any experience, since no experience is unconditioned. This illegitimate démarche of thinking Kant called transcendental application of reason, i.e. the attempt to affirm that things in themselves are such as they appear in scientific thinking. That the properties and predicates we attribute to them as objects of any possible experience also belong to them when they exist in themselves and are not converted into objects of somebody's experience. 51 Kant, Prolegomena, opposite, page 318, 52 Kant, Prolegomena, opposite, page 318. History of dialectics. 34. Such a transcendental application of understanding entails contradictions and antinomies. A logical contradiction arises within reason itself, disrupting it, breaking up the very form of thinking in general. A logical contradiction is also an index for thought indicating that it has taken on the solution of a problem that is in general beyond its strength. A contradiction reminds thought that it is impossible to grasp the ungraspable. Understanding falls into a state of logical contradiction here not only because, and even not so much because, experience is always unfinished, and not because a generalization justified for experience as a whole has been drawn on the basis of partial experience. That is just what reason can and must do, otherwise no science would be possible. The matter here is quite different, in trying fully to synthesize all the theoretical concepts and judgments drawn from past experience. It is immediately discovered that the experience already past was itself internally antinomic if it of course was taken as a whole and not some arbitrarily limited aspect or fragment of it in which, it goes without saying, contradiction may be avoided. And the past experience is already antinomic because it includes generalizations and judgments synthesized according to schemas of categories that are not only different but are directly opposite. In the sphere of understanding, as transcendental logic showed, there were pairs of mutually opposing categories, i.e. schemas of the action of thinking having diametrically opposite directions. For example, there is not only a category of identity orienting the intellect to discovering the same invariant determinations in various objects, but also its polar category of difference, pointing to exactly the opposite operation. To the discovery of differences and variants in objects seemingly identical. In addition to the concept of necessity there is the concept of chance, and so on. Each category has another, opposite to it and not unitable with it without breaking the principle of contradiction. For clearly, difference is not identity, or is non-identity, while cause is not effect. True, both cause and effect are subsumed purely formally under one and the same category of interaction, but that only means that a higher category embracing both of them is itself subordinated to the law of identity, i.e. ignores the difference between them. And any phenomenon given in experience can always be comprehended by means both of one and of another categorial schema directly opposite to it. If, for example, I look on some fact as an effect, my search is directed to an infinite number of phenomena and circumstances preceding the given fact, because behind each fact is the whole history of the universe. If, on the contrary, however, I wish to understand a given fact as a cause, I shall be forced to go into the chain of phenomena and facts following it in time, and to go further and further away from it in time with no hope of encountering it again anywhere. Here are two mutually incompatible lines of search, never coinciding with one another, two paths of investigating one and the same fact. And they will never converge because time is infinite at both ends, and the causal explanation will go further and further away from the search for effects. Consequently, relative to anything or object in the universe, two mutually exclusive points of view can be expressed, and two diverging paths of investigation outlined, and therefore two theories, two conceptions developed. Each of which is created in absolute agreement with all the requirements of logic and with all the facts relating to the matter, but which nevertheless, or rather precisely because of this, cannot be linked together within one theory without preserving and without reproducing the same logical contradiction within it. The tragedy of understanding is that it itself, taken as a whole, is eminently contradictory, containing categories each one of which is as legitimate as the other, and whose sphere of applicability within the framework of experience is not limited to anything, i.e. is as wide as experience itself. In relation to any object, therefore, two mutually opposite theories inevitably must always arise and develop, before, now, and henceforth, forevermore, each of which advances a fully logical claim to be universal, to be correct in relation to all experience as a whole. The antinomies could be eliminated in one way only, by discarding from logic exactly half of its categorical schemas of synthesis, recognizing one category in each pair as legitimate and correct, and banning the other from use in the arsenal of science. That is what the old metaphysics did. It, for example, proclaimed chance or fortuity a purely subjective concept, a characteristic of our ignorance of. History of dialectics. 35. The causes of phenomena, and so converted necessity into the sole objective categorical schema of a judgment, which led to recognition of the fatal inevitability of any fact, however minute and ridiculous. That is why Hegel somewhat later called this method of thinking metaphysical. It was, in fact, characteristic of the old, pre-Kantian metaphysics, delivering itself from internal contradictions simply by ignoring half of all the legitimate categories of thought, half of the schemas of judgments with objective significance. But at the same time the question arises of which category in the polar pair to prefer and keep, and which to discard and declare a subjective illusion. Here, Kant showed, there was not, and could not be, any objective basis for choosing. It was decided by pure arbitrariness, by individual preference. Both metaphysical systems were therefore equally correct and equally subjective, since each of them denied the objective principle contrary to it. The old metaphysics strove to organize the sphere of reason directly on the basis of the law of identity and of the principle of contradiction and determinations. The job was impracticable in principle because, if categories were regarded as the universal predicates necessarily inherent in some subject, then this subject must be the thing in itself, but the categories, considered as the predicates of one and the same subject of a judgment, proved to contradict one another and to create a paradoxical situation, and then the statement fell under the principle of contradiction, which Kant formulated thus: no predicate contradictory of a thing can belong to it. So, if I determine a thing in itself through a category, I still have no right, without breaking the principle, to ascribe the determinations of the opposing category to it. Kant's conclusion was this: quite rigorous analysis of any theory claiming to be an unconditionally full synthesis of all determinations, all the predicates of one and the same thing in itself, claiming the unconditional correctness of its own judgments, will always discover more or less artfully disguised antinomies in the theory. Understanding, clarified by criticism, i.e. conscious of its legitimate rights and not claiming any sphere of the transcendental band to it, will always strive for an unconditionally full synthesis as the highest ideal of scientific knowledge, but will never permit itself to assert that it has already achieved such a synthesis, that it has finally determined the thing in itself through a full series of its universal and necessary predicates, and so given a full list of the conditions of the truthfulness of its concept. The age-old theoretical opponents should therefore, instead of waging endless war to the death, come to some kind of peaceful coexistence between them, recognizing the equal rights of each other to relative truth, to a relatively true synthesis. They should understand that, in relation to the thing in itself, they are equally untrue, that each of them, since he does not violate the principle of contradiction, possesses only part of the truth, leaving the other part to his opponent. Conversely, they are both right in the sense that understanding as a whole always has not only different interests within it but also opposing ones, equally legitimate and of equal standing. One theory is taken up with the identical characteristics of a certain range of phenomena, and the other with their differences. Each of the theories realizes in full the legitimate, but partial interest of reason, and therefore neither the one nor the other, taken separately, discloses an objective picture of the thing as it exists outside of and prior to consciousness, and independently of each of these interests. And it is impossible to unite these theories into one without converting the antinomic relation between them into an antinomic relation between the concepts within one theory, without disrupting the deductive analytical schema of its concepts. What should critique of reason give to scientific understanding? Not, of course, recipes for eliminating dialectics from knowledge. That is impossible and impracticable because knowledge as a whole is always obtained through polemic, through a struggle of opposing principles and interests. It is therefore necessary that the warring parties in science will be fully self-critical, and that the legitimate striving to apply its principle rigorously in investigating the facts will not be converted into paranoiac stubborn. 53 Kant, Prolegomena, opposite, page 190. History of dialectics. 36. Ness, into dogmatic blindness preventing the rational kernel in the theoretical opponent's statements from being seen. Criticism of the opponent then becomes a means of perfecting one's own theory, and helps stipulate the conditions for the correctness of one's own judgments more rigorously and more clearly, and so on and so forth. Thus the critique of reason and its inevitable dialectic were converted by Kant into the most important branch of logic. Since prescriptions were formulated in it capable of rescuing thought from the bigoted dogmatism into which understanding inevitably fell when it was left to its own devices, and also from the natural complement of this dogmatism, skepticism. After this broadening of the subject matter of logic, after the inclusion in it both of the categorical schemas of thinking and principles of constructing theories, and after the comprehension of the constructive and regulative role and function of ideas in the movement of knowledge, this science acquired the right for the first time to be, and to be called, the science of thinking. The science of the universal and necessary forms and patterns of real thought, of the processing of the facts of experience and the facts of contemplation and representation. In addition, dialectics was also introduced into the structure of logic, as the most important branch crowning the whole, that same dialectics that had seemed, before Kant, either a mistake, only a sick state of the intellect, or the result of the casuistic unscrupulousness and incorrectness of individual persons in the handling of concepts. Kant's analysis showed that dialectics was a necessary form of intellectual activity, characteristic precisely of thinking concerned with solving the highest synthetic problems and with constructing a theory claiming universal significance, and so objectivity. Kant thus weaned dialectics, as Hegel put it, of its seeming arbitrariness and showed its absolute necessity for theoretical thinking. Since it was the supreme synthetic tasks that were pushed to the foreground in the science of that period, the problem of contradiction proved to be the central problem of logic as a science. At the same time, since Kant himself considered the dialectical form of thought a symptom of the futility of scientists striving to understand the position of things outside their own ego, outside the consciousness of man, the problem also rapidly acquired ideological significance. The fact is that at that time the development of science was generating ever tenser conflicts between its theories, ideas, and conceptions. The Kantian dialectic did not in fact indicate any way out, no path for solving conflicts of ideas. It simply stated in general form that conflict of ideas was the natural state of science, and counseled ideological opponents everywhere to seek some form or other of compromise according to the rule of live and let live. To hold to their truth but to respect the truth of the other man, because they would both find themselves ultimately in the grip of subjective interests, and because objective truth common for all was equally inaccessible to both of them. In spite of this good advice, however, not one of the really militant theories of the time wanted to be reconciled with such a pessimistic conclusion and counsel, and orthodoxy became more and more frantic in all spheres as the revolutionary storm drew nearer. When, in fact, it broke, Kant's solution ceased to satisfy either the orthodox or the revolutionaries. This change of mood was also reflected in logic in the form of a critical attitude to the inconsistency, reticence, and ambiguity of the Kantian solution. These moods were expressed most clearly of all in the philosophy of Fichte, through it the monistic strivings of the times to create a single theory, a single sense of law, a single system of all the main concepts on life and the world, also burst into the sphere of logic. Into the sphere of understanding of the universal forms and patterns of developing thought. 54 CVF Asmus, Dialectica Kanta, Moscow 1930, pages 126-27. History of Dialectics. 37. 4. Fichte and Schelling, the structural principle of logic, dualism or monism. Kant did not accept the improvements that Fichte suggested for his theory of thought, on the grounds that they led directly to a need once more to create that very unified metaphysic that Kant had declared impossible and doomed to death from internal contradictions. Before Fichte, in fact, there loomed the image of a certain, perhaps transcendental, but still single and uncontradictory system of concepts providing the main principles of life for humanity. Dialectics was dialectics, but a true theory appertaining to the most important things in the world should still be the one and only theory. The author of this system, for his part, is convinced that there is only one single philosophy, as there is only one single mathematics. And that as soon as this one possible philosophy had been founded and recognized, no new one will arise, and that everything that hitherto had been called philosophy will be counted as an attempt and preparation. This single system should still, in spite of Kant's advice, defeat any other not agreeing with it. For that it would have to be more rational in every respect, in other words would have to explain and interpret the other system and so become broader than it. For Fichte the position that Kant pictured as eternally insuperable, i.e. the existence of two equally true, and at the same time equally untrue, theories, was only a temporary, transitional state of spiritual culture that had to be overcome and resolved in a united, single world conception. The dialectic that Kant recognized on the scale of all scientific knowledge developing through discussion Fichte therefore wished to incorporate into a single scientific system that would include the principle opposing it, interpret it in a certain fashion, and convert it into its own partial and derivative principle. Let the single world conception be transcendental as before, i.e. let it equally say nothing about the world in itself, but for all normally thinking people it should be one and the same, necessarily universal, and in that sense absolutely objective. The dualism that Kant affirmed as a quality of the eternally insuperable state of spiritual culture seemed to revolutionary-minded Fichte only a manifestation of the timidity and inconsistency of thought in realizing its own principles. Logic could not justify two mutually exclusive systems at once, and if, for all that, it did, then not everything in it was in order. Fichte sought and found the fundamental inconsistency in the Kantian doctrine on thought in the initial concept that Kant consciously proposed as the basis of all his constructions, in the concept of the thing in itself. Already, in this concept, and not in the categorical predicates that might be ascribed to things, there was a flagrant contradiction. The supreme fundamental principle of all analytical statements was violated, the principle of contradiction in determinations. This concept was thus inconsistent in a logically developed system theory. In fact, in the concept of a thing as it exists before and outside any possible experience there was included a bit of nonsense not noted by Kant. To say that the ego was conscious of a thing outside consciousness was the same as to say that there was money in one's pocket outside one's pocket. Whether the famous thing in itself existed was not the question here, for Fichte was convinced that its concept was logically impossible. It was therefore also impossible to build a system of concepts on this foundation because the flaw of contradiction ran right through the very foundation of Kant's theoretical construction. Fichte's conclusion was irreproachable. To think a thing in itself meant to think the unthinkable. Meant to violate the supreme fundamental principle of all analytical statements in the very course of their substantiation. He reproached Kant with having set a bad example of juggling with the rules of logic itself in the course of substantiating his own system of logic. 55 Jules G. Fichte, Sonnenklärer Berichten das Grossier Publikum über das eigentliche Wesen der neuesten Philosophie, Berlin 1801, p4. History of Dialectics. 38. Fichte posed the problem as follows. Was logic itself, as a science, obliged to follow the same principles that it affirmed as absolutely universal for any correct thinking, or was it entitled to ignore them? Should logic be a science among other sciences, or was it rather to be likened to a willful princeling who dictated laws obligatory for all other people but not binding in himself? The question, it would seem, was purely rhetorical. But surely, according to Kant, it was right after all that man thought of things given in contemplation by one set of rules and about the things given in thought by another set. It was not surprising that contradictions and the flaws of antinomies appeared between understanding and reason, and, furthermore, within reason itself. But in that case the very concept of thinking, of the subject, I, was made senseless from the very beginning, i.e. was made contradictory within itself. All the fundamental categories of logic proved to be concepts that denoted not only different but diametrically opposite objects of thought. So we got the position that there were two different as in every person, in every thinking individual, in constant polemic with each other. One of them contemplated the world and the other thought. Correspondingly, it was suggested, there were two different worlds, the contemplated and the thought of, although they merged into one in direct experience and in real life. In general Kant was also inclined to that idea, that the I itself, the subject of thinking, was also a thing in itself. And for that reason, when one tried to create a system of all the determinations of this I, i.e. logic as a system of the logical parameters of thinking, the system proved contradictory through and through, i.e. self-destroying. As a result, if one followed Kant, it was quite impossible to construct a logic as a science. It was impossible, in constructing it, to observe the very rules that it prescribed as universal and necessary for all other sciences. But then there was no thought in general as one in the same capacity in different applications, but two different subjects, two different as two fundamentally heterogeneous objects. Yet nevertheless called by one and the same name. Apart from the fact that this led to a muddle of concepts, the very idea of logic as a science quite lost sense for, according to Fichte. All the conclusions drawn from considering thinking about thinking would equally have no relation at all to thinking about things given in contemplation and representation. So all the propositions of logic would have no binding force for thinking about things, i.e. for the thinking of natural scientists. Hence that central idea of Fichte's philosophy was born, the idea of a general scientific doctrine, a theory that, unlike Kantian logic, would set out principles that were really significant for any application of thought. This science would set out laws and rules equally binding on both thinking about thinking and thinking about things. Thinking about thinking, i.e. logic, must provide a model and example of observation of the principles of thought for the other sciences in general. These principles must remain the same both when thinking was directed to phenomena in mathematics, physics, or anthropology, and when directed to concepts, i.e. to itself. For a concept was just as much an object of scientific study as any other object, the more so that we only knew any other object scientifically insofar as it was expressed in concepts, and in no other way. That meant that to determine or define a concept and to determine the object were absolutely identical expressions. The initial principle of Fichte's science of science was therefore not the contrast or opposition of things and consciousness, of the object and its concept, but the opposition within the I itself. From two different, dualistically isolated halves, having no connection at all with each other, you could not create a single, integral system. What was needed was not dualism, but monism, not two initial principles but one only. Because, when there were two different initial principles, there were two different sciences, which never merged into one. Fichte also interpreted the object and its concept as two different forms of existence of one and the same I, as the result of self-differentiation of the I into itself. What had appeared to Kant as the object? History of dialectics. 39. Or thing in itself was in fact the product of the unconscious, unreflecting activity of the I, since it produced the sensuously contemplated image of the thing by virtue of imagination. A concept was the product of the same activity, but taking place with consciousness of the course and meaning of the activities themselves. The initial identity of concept and object, or rather of the laws by which the sensuously contemplated world was constituted and those by which the world thought about, the world of concepts, was built, was therefore already included in the identity of their subject, of their origin. The ego initially created a certain product, by virtue of imagination, and then began to look on it as something distinct from itself, as the object of the concept, as the non-ego or not I. But in fact the ego, in the form of the not I, was solely concerned, as before, with itself, and regarded itself as it were from the side, as in a mirror, as an object located outside itself. The job of thought as such thus consisted in understanding its own activity and creating an image of contemplation and representation, in consciously reproducing that which it had produced earlier unconsciously, without giving itself a clear account of what it was doing. The laws and rules of discursive thinking were in fact nothing more nor less than the conscious laws of intuitive thinking, i.e., of the creative activity of the subject, the I, creating the world of contemplated images. The world as it is given in contemplation. Only from that angle did the operation of comparing a concept with its object acquire rational sense. Fichte showed that the opposition, in no way mediated, between the thing in itself and its concept had also led Kant into the fullest dualism both within the concept itself and within the system of concepts. Fichte quite consistently, from his point of view, showed that denying the principle of the identity of an object and its concept as the initial principle of logic and logical thinking meant, as well, denying the principle of identity in its general form, as a logical postulate. In other words, if logic as a science considered the principles of identity and contradiction as an absolutely indispensable condition of the correctness of any thinking, then it must apply them to the understanding of thinking itself, and to determinations of its specific object or subject matter, which was the concept. In logic, in fact, the concept was also the object of study, and logic must dissect the concept of concept. That being so, in logic, of all sciences, the concept and its object were fully synonymous because any other object could only interest logic to the extent that, and insofar as, it had already been converted into a concept, expressed in a concept. For logic was not concerned with sensuously contemplated or intuited things. There was no place in logic, therefore, as a scientific system of determinations of thought, and could not be, for such expressions as a thing in itself or the object before its expression in a concept. Logic had no business in general with such objects, for they were transcendental things for it, that is lying beyond its possibilities of expression, beyond its competence. Beyond those limits began the sphere of suprarational understanding, faith, irrational intuition, and other aptitudes, but they were not competent to operate within science. And Fichte did not want to have anything to do with them, at least within his Wissenschaftslehre. Such, in essence, was Fichte's criticism of Kant's attempt to create a logic, a classically consistent model of a right-wing critique of dualism, i.e. from the position of subjective idealism. It is no accident that all modern neopositivists repeat Fichte word for word, discarding the question of the relation of a concept to the external object in a similar way, and replacing it by the question of its relation to the concept. The latter relation is also naturally defined as an identity of sign and of the designatum. The law of identity then boils down to this, that one and the same sign must designate one and the same thing, must have one and the same meaning or sense. Let us, however, return to Fichte. He, having contemplated building a system of logic and a logical model of the world, naturally came into conflict with the conceptions of his teacher Kant. To Kant his venture immediately seemed unacceptable. I declare herewith, that I consider Fichte's science of null. History of dialectics. 40. A completely untenable system, because a pure science of knowledge is nothing more nor less than a naked logic, which, with its principles, does not achieve the material of understanding but abstracts from the content of the latter as pure logic. From which it is a vain task to pick out a real object and therefore one never attempted, but which, when transcendental philosophy is at stake, must pass into metaphysics. Kant from the outset repudiated the attempt to create a metaphysic, not because it must describe the world of things in themselves but only because Fichte wanted to create a logic which when applied, would ensure the building of a single system of concepts not cracked by the flaws of antinomies. A system that would synthesize in itself all the most important conclusions and generalizations of science. That, according to Kant, was unrealizable however the system obtained was interpreted, whether objectively or subjectively. One way or the other it was equally impossible. It was quite natural therefore that Kant considered it a groundless reproach that he had not created a system but had only posed the task and equipped science with the important principles needed for such a construction. The presumption, attributing to me the intention, that I wish to provide a propedeutic to transcendental philosophy and not the system of the philosophy itself, is incomprehensible to me. Fichte began by insisting that Kant's system of philosophical concepts was not a system but only a concatenation of the opinions and principles needed for constructing such and, moreover, very inconsistent ones. The argument therefore passed to a new plane. What was a system? What were the principles and criteria enabling us to differentiate a system of scientific concepts from a concatenation of judgments each of which might be true of and by itself, but was not, all the same, linked with the others? In explaining his concept of system, Fichte formulated it as follows: my exposition, as any scientific one must, proceeds from the most indefinite, which is again determined before the reader's eyes, therefore, in the course of it, quite other predicates will, of course, be linked to the objects than were originally linked to them, and further this exposition will very often pose and develop propositions which it will afterward refute, and in this way advance through antithesis to synthesis. The finally determined true result obtained from it is only found here in the end. You, of course, only seek this result, and the way that it is found is of no interest to you. Thus, according to him, a system proved to be the result of the removal of contradictions. They remained unmediated outside the system, and as such negated each other. Therefore there was no system in Kant, but only propositions unmediated by development that he took over ready-made and vainly tried to link together formally, which was impossible since they had already negated one another. With Fichte the whole arose precisely from bits, through their successive unification. In counterposing his position to Kant's, Fichte said, the generality that I affirm in no way arises through apprehension of plurality under unity, but rather through derivation of endless plurality from the unity grasped in a glance. The initial generality, which was differentiated in the course of its own disintegration into a variety of particulars, also had to be established in scientific system before all else. But Kant's image of the whole, too, was brought to light through the particulars from which it was built up, as from bits. And now, after Kant, the task could only consist in getting from this whole to the particulars, in testing and retesting them critically, in purging the system of everything superfluous and fortuitous, and in preserving in it only the diverse definitions that were required of necessity in order to construct the whole. The whole then proved to be a criterion for the selection of par. 56 Johann Gottlieb Fichte's Leben und literarischer Briefwechsel von seinem Sohn Emanuel Hermann Fichte, BD2 Leipzig, 1862, page 161. See also R. Adamson, Fichte, London 1881, pages 50, 51, 57 Ibid, page 162, 58 Fichte, Sonnenklärer Bericht, pages 217, 1859 Ibid, pages 112, 13. History of Dialectics. 41. Particulars. It was now necessary to develop the whole system of particulars systematically, step by step, starting from that one, single principle. Then we would get science, a system. In other words, the logic of analyzing Kant's philosophy had immediately concentrated Fichte's attention on the problems that had been brought together in the section of the Critique of Pure Reason on Transcendental Dialectic. On the problems of the absolute synthesis of concepts and judgments into a theory understood as a single system. There also was to be found the growing point of logical science. Fichte proposed calling the new field of investigation of thought the science of knowledge, i.e. the science of the universal forms and laws of development of a system of scientific determinations. These determinations would, of course, be invariant for any particular science, be it mathematics or physiology, celestial mechanics or anthropology. They must define any object, and that meant they must represent a system of universal determinations of every possible object of scientific study, its logical parameters. Science, consequently, must give itself a clear account of its own activities, achieve self-consciousness, and express its self-consciousness through the same categories through which it comprehended everything else, any other object given in experience. The science of science was in fact a system of determinations outlining any possible object, and at the same time the structure of the subject constructing that object, and the logical forms in turn were the forms realized, abstractly expressed, and built up into a system of rational consciousness in general, i.e. not the empirical consciousness of this or that individual, but only the necessary and universal forms of the activity of any possible being possessing thought. What used to be called logic was only an abstract schema of this universal activity of constructing any possible object in consciousness. Fichte specially investigated and explained his understanding of the relation between his Wissenschaftslehre and logic. The latter proved to be only an abstract schema of the same activity as was outlined in the former. Therefore, as he put it, the Wissenschaftslehre could not be demonstrated logically, and it was impossible to premise any logical proposition on it, even the law of contradiction. On the contrary, any logical thesis in all logic must be deduced from the Wissenschaftslehre. Thus logic received its significance from the science of knowledge and not the science of knowledge from logic. The fact was that theoretical schematizing by no means lacked necessary and natural premises. Their analysis became vitally important precisely when thinking came up against certain changes, which in essence were a uniting of contradictory, opposing determinations. Here Fichte did not differ with Kant, who well understood that change presupposes one and the same subject as existing with two opposite determinations, and that one and the same thing could at different moments of time have a certain predicate A, and then lose it and be not A. If, however, a thing could lose predicate A without ceasing to be itself, and be transformed into something else, that meant, according to Kant, that the disappearing predicate did not belong to the concept of the given thing. Was not one of its universal and necessary determinations. The concept expressed only the absolutely unaltered characteristics of the thing. Theory was not interested in change. That old prejudice also trapped Kant. All change was a matter of empirical views and not of theory. Theory, constructed according to the rules of logic, must give a picture of the object withdrawn, as it were, from the power of time. Theory had no right to include in the definitions of a concept those determinations that the passage of time had washed off a thing. A concept therefore always came under the protective cover of the principle of contradiction. But how did matters stand if the object represented in theory began to be understood not as something absolutely unchanging but as something coming into being, if only in consciousness, as with Fichte? How did it stand? 60 Kant, Critique of Pure Reason, page 218. History of Dialectics. 42. With the principle of contradiction, if the logical schema had in fact to picture a process of change, the beginning or the becoming of a thing in consciousness and by virtue of consciousness? What was to be done if logic itself was understood as an abstract schema of the construction of an object in the eyes of a reader, i.e. as a schema of the consistent enriching of the initial concept with newer and newer predicates, a process whereby there was initially only A, but later B necessarily arose, and then C, D, E, right down to Z, for even the simple combination of A and B was a combination of A and not A, or was B nevertheless A? Fichte's conclusion was, choose between these two, either the principle of contradiction was absolute or there was development and a synthesis of the determinations of concepts. Fichte followed another, third path. He started from the point that what was impossible to represent in a concept, that is to say the combination or synthesis of mutually exclusive determinations, constantly occurred in contemplation or intuition. Thus, by analyzing Zeno's famous paradox and showing that we divide any finite length into infinity, Fichte concluded, from this you see that what is impossible and contradictory in the concept actually happens in the intuition of space. If, therefore, you came up against a contradiction in a logical expression, the thing was not to hasten to declare that it could not be, but to return to the intuition, the rights of which were higher than those of formal logic. And if analysis of the act of intuition showed you that you were forced of necessity to pass from one determination to another, opposing one in order to unite it with the first, if you saw that A was necessarily transformed into not A, You would then be obliged to sacrifice the requirement of the principle of contradiction, or rather, that principle could not then be regarded as the indisputable measure of truth. Fichte also demonstrated this dialectic from the example of the origin of consciousness, of the positing of the non-ego by the activity of the ego, the differentiation of the person himself as the thinking being from himself as thought of, as the object of thought. Could a person become aware of himself, of the acts of his own consciousness, of his own constructive activity? Obviously he could. He not only thought, but also thought about his thinking, and converted the very act of thinking into an object, and that exercise was always called logic. The starting point in this case, as was shown above, could only be I, the ego understood as the subject of an activity producing something different from itself, that is to say the product, the recorded result. The ego was initially equal to itself and, considered as something active, creative, creating, already contained in itself the necessity of its own transformation into a non-ego. We saw and knew this directly, from self-observation, for consciousness in general was realized only insofar as a representation of something else arose in it, a representation of a non-ego, a thing, an object. There could not be empty consciousness not filled by anything. The transformation of the I into the not I occurred, of course, quite independently of study of the rules of logic, and before their study. It was a matter of natural primary thought. It was a prototype of logical, reflective thinking that discovered a certain law-governed necessity in itself, in its activity in constructing images of things, and then expressed it in the form of a number of rules, in the form of logic. In order henceforth to follow them consciously and to submit to them, all logical rules must therefore be deduced, derived by analysis of actual thinking. In other words, they had a certain prototype with which they could be compared and contrasted. This approach differed radically from Kant's position, according to which all fundamental logical principles and categories had only to be consistent in themselves so that their predicates did not include contradictions. Kant. 61 Fichte, Thaddeusischen des Bewusstseins, Stuttgart and Tübingen 1817, page 9. History of Dialectics. 43. Therefore postulated the laws and categories of logic, while Fichte required them to be deduced, and their universality and necessity demonstrated. True, Fichte, like Kant, did not encroach on the actual content of logical forms and laws. On the contrary, he wanted to demonstrate the correctness of all the logical schemas known in pre-Kantian and Kantian logic, by indicating more rigorous conditions for their application. But he thereby also limited them, establishing that the principle of contradiction was only fully authoritative in relation to one determination, and that within a developing system it was constantly being set aside or discarded. Since each succeeding determination negated the preceding one both individually and absolutely. Fichte tried in that way to deduce the whole system of logical axioms and categories, in order to understand them as the universal schemas, consistently taken into practice, for uniting of empirical data, as degrees or phases of the production of concepts, for concretizing the initial, still undivided concept into a number of its universal and necessary predicate definitions. There is no need here to explain why Fichte did not succeed in his program of deducing the whole system of logical categories, why he did not succeed in turning logic into an exact science, into a system. In this case it was important to have posed the problem. Let us merely note that the ensuing criticism of his conception was directed precisely at explaining the reasons for his failure, and at analyzing the premises that hindered his idea of reforming logic, of deducing its whole content from an investigation of actual thinking. And in that way of uniting within one and the same system categories that stood in a relation of direct negation of one another, and that had seemed to Kant to be antinomically uncombinable, and not includable within one non-contradictory system. Schelling, too, occupied himself primarily, from the very start, with the problem of a system of knowledge, or rather, with the problem of the antinomies that inevitably arose in attempts to create such a system. The difficulty lay exclusively in representing in a logically systematic way the fact to every thinking being, that the world is one, and that thought, striving for its own systematic presentation, was also one in itself. But the rules of logic and laws of the activity of the intellect were such that the single world, refracted through them, was split into two in the eyes of reason. And each of the halves so formed claimed the role of the sole true absolute and unconditional, logically systematic representation of the whole world. Like Kant, Schelling saw the way out not on the plane of logically consistent constructing of determinations but in the practical realization of the system that presented itself to the human mind as most worthy of it, most acceptable to it, most in accord with its innate strivings. It was impossible to demonstrate anything by formal logic, i.e. to work out a system of uncontradictory proofs that could not be counterposed by its opposite. Such a system simply had to be taken on direct trust and followed unconditionally. The system that Schelling himself chose was expressed in the following principle: my vocation in criticism is to strive for unchangeable selfness, unconditional freedom, unlimited activity. This system could never be completed, it must always be open-ended in the future, such was the concept of activity. Activity when completed, embodied, fixed in its product, was already not activity. It is easy to discern Schelling's proud principle in these arguments. It was activity that was the absolute and unconditional that could never and must never be completed by the creation of a system crystallized once and for all, the absolutely universal in which new differences, differentiations, peculiarities, and particulars would ever be arising and accordingly be merged with what had previously been established, and on ad infinitum. This form of criticism, according to Schelling, embraced dogmatism as its own moment, because it confirmed the thesis that the whole edifice of man's spiritual culture must henceforth be built on a clear and categorically established foundation. Namely on the understanding that the sole subject of all possible predicates was the ego, i.e., the infinite creative principle existing in every human being and freely presuming both itself and the whole world of objects that it saw, contemplated, and thought. And on the understanding that no one result already achieved had the force of an absolute, objective authority for the ego, i.e. the force of dogma. 62 F. W. J. Schelling, Fruchtschriften, Erster Band, Berlin 1971, page 152. History of Dialectics. 44. And if there were an opposing system that looked upon man as the passive point of application of previously given, externally objective forces, as a speck of dust in the vortex of elemental world forces, or a toy in the hands of God and his representatives on earth, that dogmatic system, though it had been rigorously proved formally and was not self-contradictory, would have to be combated by the supporter of true criticism until final victory. Like Fichte, Schelling stood for a new, critical, enlightened dogmatism. Dogmatism, such as the result of our common inquiry, is irrefutable in theory because it itself has quit the theoretical field to complete its system in practice. It is thereby refutable in practice for us to realize a system in ourselves absolutely opposed to it. Practical activity was the third thing on which all mutually contradictory systems came together as on common soil. It was there, and not in the abstractions of pure reason, that the real battle raged that could and must be won. That was where the proof lay that one party, unswervingly following its principle, defended not only its own, egoistic private interest, but also an interest coinciding with the universal tendencies of the universe, i.e. with absolute and unconditional objectivity. Criticism cannot follow dogmatism into the sphere of the absolute, nor can the latter follow it, because for both there can be only one assertion as an absolute assertion that takes no notice of the opposing system. And that determines nothing for the opposing system. Only now, after both have encountered one another, one of them can no longer ignore the other, and whereas before they were without any resistance to the position won, now the position must be won by victory. That is the point that divided Fichte and Schelling from Kant. The intellectual culture of humanity cannot lie eternally like Buridan's ass between two equally logical systems of ideas about the most important things in life. Mankind has, in practice, to act, to live, but it is impossible to act simultaneously in accordance with two opposing systems of recommendations. We are forced to choose one of them and then to act strictly in the spirit of its principles. Kant himself, it is true, demonstrated in his last works that the arguments of practical reason must all the same tip the scales in favor of one system or the other, although on a purely theoretical plane they are absolutely equal. But with him this theme only broke through as one of the trends of his thinking, while Fichte and Schelling transformed it into the starting point of all their meditations. Hence the slogan about victory, too, in the theoretical sphere. One of the clashing logical conceptions must still prevail over the other, its opposite, and for that it must be reinforced by arguments no longer of a purely logical, rather purely scholastic quality, but armed with practical advantages as well. Then it was assured of victory, and not simply of the right and the chance of waging an eternal academic dispute. Like Fichte, Schelling saw the main problem of the theoretical system in synthetic statements and in uniting them. It is these riddles that oppress the critical philosopher. His chief question is not how there can be analytical statements, but how there can be synthetic ones. The most comprehensible thing is how we define everything according to the law of identity, and the most enigmatic how we can define anything still outside this law. That is aptly formulated. Any elementary act of synthesizing determinations in a judgment, be it that A is B, in fact already requires us to go beyond the law of identity, i.e. to infringe the boundaries established by the principle of contradiction in determinations. For, whatever the adjoined statement be, it is in any case not A, is not A. It is clearly the logical expression of the fact that any new knowledge infringes the strictly acknowledged limits of the old knowledge, refutes it, and revises it. 63 Evald, page 156, 64 Evald, pages 131-32 65 Schelling, Frostschriften, pages 129-30. History of Dialectics. 45. Any dogmatism that obstinately insisted on the knowledge already attained and mastered would therefore always reject any new knowledge from the outset on the sole grounds that it contradicted the old. And it did in fact formally contradict it because it was not analytically included in the old and could not be derived from it by logical contrivances of any kind. It must be united with the old knowledge in spite of the fact that it formally contradicted it. That meant, according to Schelling, that a genuine synthesis was not realized by purely theoretical ability that strictly adhered to the rules of logic, but by quite another capacity, which was not bound by the strict limitations of the fundamentals of logic, and even had the right to transgress them when it experienced a powerful need to do so. A system of knowledge is necessarily either a trick, a game of ideas, or it must embrace reality not through a theoretical ability, but through a practical one, not through a perceptive ability but through a productive, realizing one, not through knowledge but through action. With Kant this productive ability was called power of imagination. Following him Schelling also plunged into analysis of it, which took him along a rather different road than Fichte's, onto the rails of an objective idealism that was not only reconciled to the thesis of the real existence of the external world but also built a theory of understanding it. Although with Schelling himself this theory proved to be something quite different from logic and tended rather to a kind of aesthetics, to a theory of the artistic, aesthetic comprehension of the mysteries of the universe. For the men of science Schelling retained, as a working tool, the same old logic that he himself, following Fichte, declared to be a completely unsatisfactory instrument for understanding and to be justified solely as a canon of the outward systematization and classification of material obtained by quite other, illogical and even illogical, means. Whereas Fichte had provided a classical model of criticism of Kant and his logic from the right, from the standpoint of a consistently constructed subjective idealism, another motif began to be clearly seen in the reformatory strivings of the young Schelling. In tendencies leading him to materialism, in the circles in which he moved, and where his thinking matured, quite other moods prevailed than those induced by Fichte's philosophy. All Fichte's thought had been concentrated on the social and psychic revolution stimulated in minds by the events of 1789 to 1793. The flight of his imagination was also linked with the events and problems of those years. As the revolutionary wave subsided his philosophy folded its wings, and he could not find a new source of inspiration. For Schelling the fervor born of the revolution was only a certain stage that he reached as a sympathizer and even a disciple of Fichte, but, just as the forces of rude reality forced the most zealous Jacobins to reckon with them, so too it became clear to Schelling that to insist on one infinite creative power, the ego, and on the strength of its moral fervor, in face of the persistent external world meant to bang one's head against the wall of incomprehension, as had actually happened in the end to Fichte. Being closely linked with the circle of Goethe and the Romantic writers, Schelling was much more interested than Fichte in nature on the one hand, and in the inherited, traditional forms of social life on the other hand. From the very beginning natural science and art constituted the medium that shaped his mind and his aspirations as an inquirer. Schelling, it is true, began in the same way as Fichte. He too treated the opposition between subject and object as an opposition within human consciousness, as an opposition between the images of the external world that a person produced freely, and the images of the same world that he produced not freely but unconsciously, in obedience to a compelling force of necessity unknown to him. Like Fichte, Schelling warred with dogmatism. For Schelling criticism was a synonym for the standpoint that the 66 Evald, pages 126-27. History of Dialectics. 46. Objective determinations of the human psyche were initially innate in the psyche itself and discovered in it in the course of its active self-discovery. In that way Schelling, following Fichte, tried to overcome the dualism of Kant's conception, but with Fichte the dualism had still been preserved and even reproduced in ever sharper form within his conception. All the Kantian antinomies had in fact been merged by him in a single antinomy, in the contradiction between two halves of one and the same ego. One of them unconsciously created the objective world of images by the laws of causality, space, and time, while the other reconstructed it in the spirit of the requirements of the transcendental ideal, in accordance with the requirements of morality. It was presupposed, as before, that there were two different egos in every person, but it was not known how and why they were connected together, and although Fichte united them in the concept of activity, the opposition was reproduced again within the ego in the form of two different principles of activity, and as before it remained an open question what was the inner necessary relation between the two halves of the human ego. Did they have a common root, a common source, a common substance, through the splitting of which the two halves of necessity arose? Fichte did not find the solution, in spite of his concept of activity. The world of necessary ideas was formed within all egos quite independently of the activity of the better I, before it awoke in man. The better I already, during its awakening, found the existing world in itself. In turn it came into the world of necessarily produced ideas, as it were, from outside, like a judge who emerged from somewhere unknown and who brought with him the criteria for evaluating and re-evaluating what existed, i.e. the fruits of the ego's past labor. The human ego was again converted into a field of endless battle between two originally heterogeneous principles. The absolute ego must take the world of existing ideas, incomplete and unconnected, even mutually contradictory, in accordance with itself and one another, but that again was only attainable in infinity. Full agreement of man with himself, and, so that he can agree with himself, agreement of all things outside him with his necessary practical concepts of them, concepts that determine how they must be. Proved unattainable in the existing world, fit to free himself from the Kantian form of antinomies but reproduced them all intact in the form of contradictions within the very concept of activity. The problem was simply transferred to the sphere of the individual psyche and so made completely insoluble. Schelling reached the same conclusion and began to seek a way out along a new path with the young Hegel. Gradually, in the course of criticizing Fichte, the main outlines of a new conception began to appear. Schelling and Hegel were more and more dissatisfied with the following points in the position of Kant and Fichte. 1. The posing of all the concrete burning issues of the day in a subjective, psychological form. 2. The feeble appealing to conscience and duty that stemmed from that, which put the philosopher into the pose of a preacher of fine and noble but impracticable phrases and slogans. 3. The interpretation of the whole sensuous empirical world, if not as hostile, at least as a passive obstacle to the dictates of duty and the ideal. 4. The absolute indifference to everything except pure morality, and to natural science. 5. The powerlessness of the categorical imperative in the struggle against the egoistic, immoral, irrational motives of man's behavior in society, the indifference of real earthly men to the preachers of the higher morality how light were all the means of paradise. 67 Fichte, Hubert den Gellerten, Berlin 1956, page 45. History of Dialectics. 47. Developed by the Church and supported by the fullest scholastic explanations in the scales when the passions and forces of circumstance, upbringing, example, and government were thrown into the other pan. The whole history of religion from the beginning of the Christian era went to prove that Christianity could only make people good when they were already good, the young Hegel said, having in mind by the scholastic explanations any philosophy oriented on morality, including that of Kant and Fichte. 6. The difference, insuperable in principle, between the real and the proper, between necessary and free activity, between the world of phenomena and the active essence of man, etc., etc. All that led to one thing, namely, to comprehending that it was ultimately necessary to find the common root itself of the two halves of human being from which they both stemmed and could be understood. Only then would the human personality appear before us not as the passive point of application of external forces, i.e. not as an object, but as something acting independently, as subject. From that was born the idea of the philosophy of identity. Like any idea it existed originally only in the form of an hypothesis, in the form of a principle not yet realized in detail, in the spirit of which the whole mass of existing theoretical material, and in particular the conception of Kant and Fichte, had to be critically revised. Originally the young Schelling only affirmed that the two halves of the human being, which had been depicted by Kant and Fichte as originally heterogeneous in essence and origin, had something in common after all, i.e. that somewhere in the depths, in the initial essence of matter, they had been merged in one image before being torn apart and separated in dispute, discussion, and antinomy. Schelling's thesis stated that both forms of the ego's activity had really to be understood as two branches growing from one and the same trunk, and that it was necessary to discover that trunk first and then trace its growth before it forked. Schelling had not yet affirmed anything more concrete and definite besides that such identity must be and was. He had said nothing about where exactly this initial identity was to be seen. His description was, in essence, negative. It was not consciousness, but it was also not matter. It was not spirit, but it was also not substance. It was not ideal, but it was also not real. What then was it? Here, in Heine's witty comment, philosophy ends with Herr Schelling in poetry, I mean folly, begins. But Herr Schelling has now left the philosophical path and is seeking through an act of mystical intuition to achieve contemplation of the absolute itself. He is seeking to intuit it at its center, in its essence, where there is nothing ideal and nothing real, neither idea nor extension, neither subject nor object, neither mind nor matter, but there was who knows what. Why did Schelling nevertheless turn from the path of philosophy here, from the path of thinking in rigorously defined determinations, to the path of poetry, to the path of metaphors and a kind of aesthetic intuition? Only because the logic that he knew and recognized did not permit the uniting of opposing contradictory predicates and concepts of one and the same subject. He, like Kant, held it sacred that the law of identity and the principle of contradiction were absolutely unbreakable laws for conceptual thinking, and that breaking them was tantamount to breaking the laws of thought in general, the forms of scientism. Here, he thought, in agreement with Fichte, that everything that was impossible in a concept became possible in contemplation or intuition. Schelling supposed that all the acts performed consciously by man in accordance with the rules of logic had been quite fully and exactly described in the transcendental philosophy of Kant and Fichte. That part of philosophy seemed to him to have been created once and for all. He did not intend to. 68 Heinrich Heine, Zur Geschichte der Religion und Philosophie in Deutschland, in Werke und Brief, BD 5, Berlin 1961, page 299. History of Dialectics. 48. Reform it at all, he only wanted to broaden the scope, the sphere of action, of its principles, wanted them to embrace the fields that had fallen outside Fichte's field of vision, in particular natural science. The turn to natural science here was not fortuitous. The fact was that the attempt to investigate the sphere of unconscious activity in more detail led directly to it. That is to say, the attempt to investigate the mode of vital activity that man had followed before and irrespective of how he began a special reflection, converted himself into an object of special investigation, and began to reflect specifically on what originated within himself, and how it did so. In all his activity at this stage being subordinated to the conditions of space, time, and causality, came within the competence of the natural sciences. In other words, the forms and modes of unconscious activity were scientifically described precisely through the concepts of physics, chemistry, physiology, psychology, and so on. For unconscious activity was nothing else than life, the mode of existence of organic nature, of the organism. But in the life of the organism mechanical, chemical, and electrical motions were joined together, and the organism could therefore be studied by mechanics, chemistry, physics, and optics. In the living organism, nature had concentrated all her secrets and determinations, and had synthesized them. After the organism had been broken down into its constituents, however, the chief thing of all remained uncomprehended, namely, why were they linked together that way and not in some other way? Why in fact was a living organism obtained and not a pile of its components? With a purely mechanical approach the organism proved to be something quite incomprehensible, because the principle of a mechanism was the uniting of ready-made, previously given parts. The living organism, however, did not originate through the building up of parts into a whole but, on the contrary through the beginning or origin, the generation of parts from an originally undifferentiated whole. Here the whole preceded its own parts, and functioned in relation to them as the purpose they all served. Here each part could only be understood through its role and function in the whole, outside of which it simply did not exist, or not, in any case, as such. The problem of understanding organic life was analyzed by Kant in his critique of the power of judgment as the problem of the purposefulness of the structure and function of the living organism. But the standpoint of transcendental idealism forced him to affirm that, although we in our reason could not cognize the organism other than by means of the concept of a goal, nevertheless it was impossible to attribute any goal to the organism in itself. Because a goal presupposed consciousness and the animal and vegetable did not possess such. The problems of life also proved to be the stumbling block that forced Schelling to stop and critically re-examine certain concepts of the philosophy of transcendental idealism. Like Kant, he categorically objected to introducing supernatural causes into the framework of the thinking of the natural science. On those grounds he resolutely rejected vitalism, the idea that, in an organic nature, a certain higher principle descended from somewhere outside and organized the physical, chemical particles in the living body. There was no such principle outside consciousness, Schelling affirmed, following Kant. The naturalist must seek in nature itself the causes of the origin of the organism from inorganic nature. Life must be fully explained by way of natural science, without implicating any kind of extranatural or supernatural force in it. There is an older delusion, which is that organization and life are inexplicable by the principles of nature. With it only so much can be said. The first source of organic nature is physically inscrutable, so this unproved statement serves no purpose other than to sap the courage of the investigator. It would be at least one step toward that explanation if one could show that the succession of all organic beings had come about through the gradual evolution of one and the same organization. 69 F. W. J. Schelling, von der Weltziel, Hamburg 1809, ppv 7. History of Dialectics. 49. Man and his peculiar organization stood at the logic apex of the pyramid of living creatures. And in that case we had every grounds and right to ascribe to nature itself, if not purpose in the transcendental sense, at least that objective characteristic which is reproduced in our reason as a purpose, in the form of a goal. What that characteristic was, Schelling did not consider it possible to say. In any case it was a matter of the capacity involved in nature itself to engender a succession of more and more complex and highly organized living creatures, up to and including man, in whom a soul, consciousness, was awakened and transcendental mechanisms arose. I.e. a capacity consciously to reproduce everything that occurred in nature unconsciously, without a goal or purpose. But then it was necessary to think of nature not as naturalists had so far done. It must be considered as some kind of primordial whole in which the subject matter of the special sciences was differentiated. We must therefore not build up the picture of the whole like a mosaic, from the special sciences, but must endeavor, on the contrary, to understand them as consecutive stages in the development of one and the same whole, initially undivided. The idea of nature as a whole, quite characteristic of the classical Greeks and of Spinoza, Schelling also advanced as the main principle by which alone the antinomy between mechanism and organism could be scientifically resolved. As soon as our investigation ascends to the idea of nature as an entity, the opposition between mechanism and organism disappears immediately. An opposition that has long hampered the progress of natural science and that will long continue to block our enterprise's success in the eyes of quite a few. Schelling sought the way out by developing the concepts of mechanics and organic life from one and the same truly universal principle, which led him to the idea of representing nature as a whole. As a dynamic process in the course of which each successive stage or phase negated the preceding one, i.e. included a new characteristic. The purely formal determination of a higher phase of the process could therefore not be deduced from the determination of a lower one, that was done simply by making a synthesis, by adding on a new determination. It was not surprising that, when the higher phase of a dynamic process was put directly alongside a lower phase of the same process, they were thought to be two simultaneously coexisting objects. And proved to be mutually directly contradictory. The basic task of the philosophy of nature, consequently, consisted just in tracing and showing how, in the course of a dynamic process, determinations arose that were directly opposed to the initial one. In other words, we thought of a dynamic process only as one of the gradual engendering of oppositions, of determinations of one and the same thing, i.e. of nature as a whole, that mutually negated one another. Schelling saw in that the universal law of the natural whole, operating identically in the field of mechanics, and of chemistry, and of electromagnetism, and of organic life. Such was the truly universal law of bifurcation, of the polarization of the initial state. The attraction and repulsion of masses in mechanics, the north and south poles in magnetism, positive and negative electricity, acids and alkalis in chemical reactions, such were the examples flooding in on Schelling from all sides. And supplied again and again by the discoveries of Volta and Faraday, Lavoisier and Kielmeyer, the most diverse scientific discoveries were seen as fulfillment of Schelling's predictions, and his fame grew. His disciples were to be found among doctors, geologists, physicists, and biologists, and that not by chance. Schelling's philosophy proposed a form of thinking, the need for which was already imminent in the womb of theoretical natural science. Exhilarated by success, Schelling continued to work the load he had discovered for all it was worth. But the transition of mutual opposites described appeared most marked and unsullied precisely on the boundary where natural and transcendental philosophy met, which was where the ego arose from. 70 Schelling, opposite, pages 7-8. History of Dialectics. 50. The sphere of the unconscious dynamic process, i.e. the transcendental, spiritual organization of man, or, on the contrary, where objective knowledge of the not I was born from the conscious activity of the I. This mutual reciprocal passage of the determination of the ego into a determination of the non-ego demonstrated the action of the universal law of the dynamic process in its purest and most general form, i.e. the act of the transformation of A into not A, of the bifurcation or splitting into two, of the dualization of the initial, originally undifferentiated state. But how was the initial absolute state, identical in itself, to be thought of, from the polarization of which there arose the main dualism of the natural whole, i.e. the ego and the non-ego, the I and the not I? The freely conscious creativity of the subject and the whole vast sphere of the dead, congealed, fossilized creative activity, the world of objects, that was where the specifically Schelling philosophizing began. It turned out that it was impossible to think of the initial identity, i.e. to express it in the form of a rigorously delimited concept. On being expressed in a concept it immediately came forward as an antinomic bifurcation. Identity was realized in the concept precisely through its absence, through contrasts that had nothing formally in common between them. We have reached a very important point. That Schelling called his system the philosophy of identity was not at all because it represented a system of determinations or definitions common to the I and the not I, rather the contrary. Schelling denied the possibility of such a system of concepts in principle. His philosophy was put forward in the form of two formally unjoined systems of concepts, formally opposed in all their determinations yet nevertheless mutually presupposing each other. One was the system of determinations of the ego as such, the other was the system of assembled universal determinations of the object, of the non-ego. The first disclosed and described in the shape of formally non-contradictory constructions the specifically subjective forms of man's activity that it was impossible to ascribe to nature existing outside of and before human consciousness. The second, on the contrary, strove to disclose pure objectivity, carefully purged of everything introduced into it by man's conscious, volitional activity, and to depict the object as it existed before it entered consciousness. Within the confines of natural philosophy, the theoretical scientist fears nothing more than interference of the subjective in this kind of knowledge. Within the limits of transcendental philosophy, on the contrary, he was most of all afraid that something objective has been implicated in the purely subjective principle of knowledge. To sum up, if transcendental philosophy were constructed just as correctly as natural philosophy, there would be nothing of the other in the structure of each, and there could not be a single concept or theoretical determination between them. For such a determination would directly infringe the two supreme principles of logic, the law of identity and the principle of contradiction. It would simultaneously express both the objective and the subjective, and would contain directly identified opposites. The two given sciences could not therefore be formally united into one. It was impossible to develop two series of scientific determinations from one and the same concept, because it would be formally incorrect and inadmissible from the standpoint of the rules of logic. Therefore philosophy on the whole was impossible as one science. From that, Schelling concluded that the whole system of philosophy would find consummation in two fundamental sciences, which, mutually opposed in principle and direction, seek each other out and complement each other. There was not, and could not be, some third science in which would be discovered whatever there was in common between the world in consciousness and the world outside consciousness, and which would be a system of laws and rules obligatory in the same way for the one world and the other. It was impossible in principle to present such laws and rules in the form of a science, because it would then be built from the outset on an infringement of the law of identity. 71 Schelling, System des Transcendentalen Idealismus, Hamburg 1957, page 11. History of Dialectics. 51. But there were, all the same, laws common to the world and knowledge, otherwise it would be senseless in general to speak of knowledge, of agreement of the objective and the subjective, and the very concept of truth as the coincidence of knowledge with its object would be nonsense. General laws consequently did operate, but not as rigidly binding rules, but rather as reasons not strictly formulated, related to the aspirations of the poet, artist who directly experienced his blood relationship and unity with the cognized object and with nature. The artist of genius and nature operated by the same laws. The identity of the laws of the subjective and objective worlds could only be realized in the act of creation. But creativity did not submit to formal schematizing, dying and becoming fossilized in it. Thus it came about that an absolute simple, identical, cannot be comprehended or communicated through description, and not at all through conception. It can only be intuited. Here intuition was all-powerful, the inspired intuition of creative insight, intellectual and aesthetic intuition. Thus it was, therefore, that Schelling's system culminated in and was completed by a philosophy of art. Thus the primary identity was a fact but was not expressible in a concept, was the initial premise of any concept, but was not determined through a concept. Identity was, as it were, made up of two always diverging trends of investigation, namely demonstration of how the objective was transformed into the subjective, which was the competence of theoretical natural science, spinning its thread from mechanics through chemistry to biology and anthropology, i.e. to man, and demonstration of how the subjective was transformed into the objective, which was the competence of transcendental philosophy, starting from knowledge and its forms as from fact, and demonstrating the objectivity, i.e. the universality and necessity, of knowledge. The problem consequently began to appear as follows. Two diametrically opposite spheres stood facing one another, contrasted in all their characteristics. Their identity was realized precisely through the transition that transformed the one into the other. But the transition, the moment of the transition itself, was irrational and could not be expressed by a non-contradictory concept, because it was at that very moment that the transition from A into not A took place, i.e. their coincidence, their identity. To express it in a concept meant to smash the form of the concept. Here Schelling came directly up against the narrowness of the Kantian logic, which attributed to the law of identity and the principle of contradiction the character of the absolute premises of the very possibility of thinking in concepts. For there was no room within these rules for the moment of the transition of opposites into one another, and it broke them. Schelling, while agreeing that there was self-destruction of the form of thinking here, was forced in fact to conclude that real truth could not be caught and expressed through a concept. In his eyes therefore art and not science represented the highest form of mental activity. If the rules of general logic were absolute, then the passage of consciousness into nature and vice versa, by which the time-honored identity of the subjective and the objective was realized, remained inexpressible in concepts. And the act of knowing was forced again and again to make a leap, a jump, an act of irrational intuition, of poetic seizing of the absolute idea, of truth. In other words, Schelling, beginning with a quite justified statement of the fact that logic in its Kantian conception actually put an insurmountable barrier in the way of attempts to understand, that is to express, the fact of the transformation of opposites into one another in concepts, i.e. in rigorously defined determinations, took the step toward rejection of logic in general. It did not even occur to him to reform logic itself in order to make it a means of expressing what appeared in intuition as a self-evident fact. Instead he began to make up for and compensate the limitedness and insufficiency of the existing logic, by the force of intellectual and aesthetic intuition. An absolutely irrational capacity that it was impossible either to study or to teach. This magic force also had to unite everything that reason was not in a position to join together but was only capable of ripping to bits, separating, and choking to death. 72 Schelling, opposite, page 294. History of Dialectics. 52. In his own constructions, in spite of a mass of bold guesses and ideas, some even of genius, that influenced the development of 19th century science, and which in essence had a clearly marked dialectical character, Schelling kept adopting the pose of a God-inspired prophet and genius, uniting without fear or doubt concepts that seemed to contemporary scientists to be fundamentally ununitable. And whereas he himself, in his youth, had sufficient tact and competence in the field of the natural sciences, and had often hit the nail on the head by intuition, his pupils and successors, who adopted the empty schema from him but did not possess his erudition in science or his talent, reduced his method and manner of philosophizing to the caricature that Hegel later jeered at so caustically. Schelling, however, exposed the rigidity of Kant's logic, and though he did not set himself the task of reforming it radically, he prepared the ground very thoroughly for Hegel. Logic as such remained only an episode in Schelling's system of ideas, an insignificant section of the transcendental philosophy, a scholastic description of rules of a purely formal order in accordance with which it was necessary only to formalize, i.e. to classify and schematize. Knowledge obtained in quite another way and by quite other abilities. For Schelling logic, consequently, was by no means a schema for producing knowledge, but served as a means of describing it verbally, terminologically for others, of expressing it through a system of rigorously defined and non-contradictorily determined terms. Ultimately its recommendations seemed only external, verbally explicated forms of knowledge, and nothing more. The process of producing knowledge was itself, in fact, done by the power of imagination, which Schelling analyzed very closely and circumstantially in the form of various intuitions. And here, in the field of intuition and imagination, he also discovered dialectics as the true schema of the productive, actively subjective capacity of man to understand and alter the world of the images and concepts of science. So Schelling confirmed dialectics as the genuine theory of scientific knowledge, but then broke all its links with logic. His position returned logic once more to the pitiable condition in which it had been before the attempts of Kant and Fichte to reform it in accordance with the needs of the times. After Schelling, the problem consisted in uniting dialectics as the true schema of developing knowledge and logic as the system of rules of thinking in general. What was the relation of the rules of logic to the real schemas of the development of understanding? Were they different, mutually unconnected things, or was logic simply the conscious and deliberately applied schema of the real development of science? If it was all the more inadmissible to leave it in its old, so primitive form. At this point the torch was taken up by Hegel. 5. Hegel, dialectics as logic. Hegel's solution of the problem of the subject matter of logic has played a special role in the history of the science. In order to understand the Hegelian logic, it is not enough just to clarify the direct sense of its propositions. It is more important and difficult to consider the real subject matter through the fanciful turns of Hegel's style. It is about this that we shall now speak, which will also give us a chance to understand Hegel critically, and to restore for ourselves an image of the original from its distorted presentation. Learning to read Hegel in a materialist way, as Lenin read him and advised reading him, means learning to compare his representation of the object critically with the object itself, at every step tracing the divergence between the copy and the original. It would be an easy task if the reader had the two objects of this comparison, the copy and the original, ready-made before him. The copy exists, but where is the original? We cannot take the existing logical consciousness of the scientist as the original, for this consciousness itself must be tested for its logicality. And itself presupposes a critical analysis of existing logical forms from the standpoint of their correspondence with the real requirements of the development of science. And for an understanding of the real forms and laws of theoretical cognition, Hegel's science of logic, despite all its faults associated with idealism, can offer more than the logic of science. History of dialectics. 53. The true logic of science is not given to us directly, it still has to be dug out and understood, and then converted into a consciously applied instrument for working with concepts, into a logical method of resolving problems that do not admit of solution by traditional logical methods. That being so, critical study of the science of logic cannot be reduced to a simple comparison of its propositions with those of the logic by which scientists are consciously guided, accepting it as irreproachable and admitting of no doubts. So comparing the copy with the original proves to be quite a difficult matter. The difficulty is that Hegel's presentation of the subject matter has to be compared critically not with a ready-made, previously known prototype of it, but with an object whose outlines are only beginning to be traced out for the first time in the course of a critical surmounting of the idealist constructions. This reconstruction is feasible if the structure of the optics through which Hegel examined the object of his investigation is clearly understood. This distorting lens, while a magnifying one, enabled him to see exactly, although in an idealistically distorted form, the dialectic of thought, which is the logic that remains invisible to the eye not philosophically equipped. And to simple common sense, it is important, first of all, to understand clearly what the real object was that Hegel investigated and described in his science of logic, so as to find the critical range immediately in regard to his presentation. That the subject matter of logic is thought, with that everyone agrees, Hegel stressed in his shorter Logic. Later, quite naturally, logic as a science received the definition of thinking about thought or thought thinking about itself. In that definition and the conceptions expressed by it there is still nothing either of the specifically Hegelian or of the specifically idealist. It is simply the traditional ideas of the subject matter of logic as a science, quite clearly and succinctly expressed. In logic the object of scientific comprehension proves to be thought itself, while any other science is thinking about something else. In defining logic as thinking about thought, Hegel quite accurately indicated its sole difference from any other science. The next question, however, arises from that and requires a no less clear answer. But what is thought? It goes without saying, Hegel replied, that the sole satisfactory answer can only be an exposition of the heart of the matter, i.e. a concretely developed theory, a science of thought, a science of logic, and not an ordinary definition. Compare Engel's view in Anti-Daring, our definition of life is naturally very inadequate. All definitions are of little value. In order to gain an exhaustive knowledge of what life is, we should have to go through all the forms in which it appears, from the lowest to the highest and later, to science definitions are worthless because always inadequate. The only real definition is the development of the thing itself, but this is no longer a definition. In any science, however, and therefore in logic too, one has to mark everything out in advance and outline its contours, if only the most general boundaries of the object of investigation, i.e. to indicate the field of the facts to which the given science must devote its attention. Otherwise the criterion for their selection will be unclear and its role will be tyrannous and arbitrary, taking only those facts into consideration that confirm its generalizations, and ignoring everything else as allegedly having no relation to the matter or to the competence of the science concerned. Hegel gave such a preliminary explanation, not concealing from the reader exactly what he understood by the word thought. This is a very important point, and everything else hangs on proper understanding of it. It is no accident that the main objections to Hegel, both justified and unjustified, have hitherto been directed precisely at it. Neopositivists, for example, unanimously reproach Hegel with having inadmissibly 73 GWF Hegel, System der Philosophie, Erster Teil, Dialogic, also known as Enzyklopädie der Philosophischen Wissenschaften im Grundriss, 74 Engels, Anti-Daring, MECW Vol 25 page 77, 75 Ibid, page 77. History of Dialectics. 54. Broadened the subject matter of logic by his conception of thought, including in the sphere of examination a mass of things that one cannot call thought in the usual and strict sense, above all the concepts traditionally referred to metaphysics, and to ontology, i.e. to the science of things themselves, the system of categories. If thinking were to be so understood, the neopositivist reproach must really be considered reasonable. Hegel actually understood as thought something at first glance enigmatic, even mystical, when he spoke of it as taking place outside man and apart from man, independently of his head, and of thought as such, of pure thought. And when he considered the object of logic to be precisely that absolute superhuman thought. Logic in his definition must be understood even as having a content that shows forth God as he is in his eternal essence before the creation of nature and of a finite spirit. Such definitions are capable of confusing and disorienting at the very start. But of course there is no such thought as some superhuman force creating nature, and history, and man himself and his consciousness from itself somewhere in the universe. But is Hegel's logic then the presentation of a non-existent subject? Of an invented, purely fantastic object? In that case, how are we to rethink his constructions critically? With what real object, must we compare and contrast his strings of theoretical determinations in order to distinguish the truth in them from the fallacy? With the real thinking of man? But Hegel would reply that in his science of logic it is a matter of quite another object, and that if empirically observed human thought is not like it, that is no argument against his logic. For criticism of a theory only makes sense when the theory is compared with the same object as it represents, and not with another one. And it is impossible to compare logic with the acts of thinking actually taking place in people's heads because people think very illogically at every step, even elementarily illogically, let alone according to a logic of a much higher order, of the kind that Hegel had in mind. When you point out to a logician, therefore, that men's real thinking does not occur as it is depicted in his theory, he could reasonably reply that it was so much the worse for this thinking and that the theory did not need to be adapted to the empirical but that real thought must be made logical and brought into harmony with logical principles. For logic as a science, however, a fundamental difficulty arises here. If it were only permissible to compare logical principles with logical thought, did that then not wipe out any possibility whatsoever of checking whether or not they were correct? It is quite understandable that these principles would always be in agreement with thoughts that had previously been made to agree with them. After all, it only meant that logical principles agreed with themselves, with their own embodiment in empirical acts of thought. In that case, a very ticklish situation was created for theory. Logic had in mind only logically immaculate thinking, and logically incorrect thinking was not an argument against its schemas. But it consented to consider only such thinking as logically immaculate as exactly confirmed its own ideas about thought, and evaluated any deviation from its rules as a fact falling outside its subject matter and therefore to be considered solely as a mistake needing to be corrected. In any other science such a claim would evoke consternation. What kind of a theory was it that consented to take into account only such facts as confirmed it, and did not wish to consider contradictory facts, although there must be millions and billions such? But surely that was exactly the traditional position of logic, which was presented by its devotees as standing to reason, and which made logic absolutely unself-critical on the one hand and incapable of development on the other. That, incidentally, was where Kant's illusion originated, the illusion that logic as a theory had long ago acquired a fully closed, completed character and not only was not in need of development of its propositions but could not be by its very nature. Schelling also understood Kant's logic as an absolutely precise presentation of the principles and rules of thinking and concepts. 76 Hegel, Science of Logic, T.R.A.V. Miller, page 50. History of Dialectics. 55. Hegel had doubts about the claim that it was the rules of logic that prevented understanding of the process of the passage of the concept into the object and vice versa, of the subjective into the objective. He saw in it not evidence of the organic deficiency of thought but only the limitations of Kant's ideas about it. Kantian logic was only a limitedly true theory of thought. Real thought, the real subject matter of logic as a science, as a matter of fact was something else, therefore it was necessary to bring the theory of thought into agreement with its real subject matter. Hegel saw the need for a critical reconsideration of traditional logic primarily in the extreme. Glaring discrepancy between the principles and rules that Kant considered absolutely universal forms of thought and the real results that had been achieved by human civilization in the course of its development. A comparison of the forms to which spirit has risen in the worlds of practice and religion, and of science in every department of knowledge positive and speculative, a comparison of these with the form which logic, that is, spirit's knowledge of its own pure essence, has attained, shows such a glaring discrepancy that it cannot fail to strike the most superficial observer that the latter is inadequate to the lofty development of the former, and unworthy of it. Thus the existing logical theories did not correspond to the real practice of thought, and thinking about thought, i.e. logic, consequently lagged behind thinking about everything else, behind the thinking that was realized as the science of the external world, as consciousness fixed in the form of knowledge and things created by the power of knowledge, in the form of the whole organism of civilization. In functioning as thinking about the world, thought had achieved such success that beside it thinking about thought proved to be something quite incommensurable, wretched, deficient, and poor. To take it on faith that human thought had really been and was guided by the rules, laws, and principles that in the aggregate constituted traditional logic was to make all the progress of science and practice simply inexplicable. Hence there arose the paradox that the human intellect, which had created modern culture, had come to a standstill in amazement before its own creation. Schelling had also expressed this amazement of the spirit, and it was just at this point that Hegel began to differ with him. Hegel considered that the rules by which the spirit was actually guided, contrary to the illusions that it had created on its own account and had set out in the form of textbooks of logic, could and must be brought out and set forth in the form of a concept, quite rationally, without shifting everything hitherto not comprehended onto intuition, i.e. onto an ability that was from the very outset something quite different from thought. Hegel's posing of the matter played a special role because it, for the first time, subjected all the main concepts of logical science, above all the concept of thought, to careful analysis. At first glance, thought represented one of men's subjective psychic abilities along with others like intuition, sensation, memory, will, and so on and so forth. By thinking was also understood a special kind of activity directed, unlike practice, at altering ideas, at reorganizing the images that were in the individual's consciousness, and directly at the verbal shaping of these ideas in speech. Ideas, when expressed in speech, words, terms, were called concepts. When man altered real things outside his head, and not ideas, that was no longer considered thinking, but at best only activities in accordance with thought, according to the laws and rules dictated by it. Thought was thus identified with reflection, i.e. with psychic activity in the course of which a person gave himself an account of what he was doing, and how, and became aware of all the schemas and rules by which he acted. The sole job of logic then proved, quite understandably, to be simply the ordering and classifying of the corresponding schemas and rules. Every individual could discover them for himself in his own consciousness because, even without any study of logic, he was guided by them. As Hegel justly put it, such logic had no other business than could be. 77 Hegel, Ibid, page 51. History of Dialectics. 56. Done through the activity of simple formal thought, and so it certainly produced nothing that one could not otherwise have done just as well. Everything we have said also applied fully to Kant, which is why Hegel said that the Kantian philosophy could not have any effect on the treatment of the sciences. It left the categories and methods of ordinary knowledge quite undisturbed. It only introduced order into the schemas of existing consciousness, only built them into a system. So the Kantian logic appeared as a kind of honest confession of existing consciousness, of its systematically expounded self-consciousness, and nothing more, or rather, of its conceits, an exposition of what existing thought thought of itself. But just as it was a blunder to judge a person according to what and how he thought of himself, so it was impossible to judge thinking by its self-opinion. It was much more useful to examine what it was really doing, and how, possibly even without giving itself a proper evaluation of it. Having thus posed the problem, Hegel proved to be the first professional logician who resolutely and consciously threw aside the old prejudice that thought was presented to the investigator only in the form of speech. The prejudice was not accidental. Thought could only look at itself from the side, as it were, as an object different from itself, only insofar as it had expressed itself, embodied itself in some external form. And the completely conscious thought that all the old logic had in view really assumed language, speech, the word, as its outward form of expression. In other words, thought achieved awareness of the schemas of its own activity precisely through and in language. This circumstance had in fact been recorded in the very name of logic, which is derived from the Greek logos, word. Not only Hegel and the Hegelians, incidentally, spoke of this, but also some of their opponents in principle, like Trendelenburg, who noted that traditional logic becomes conscious of itself in speech and so in many respects is a grammar absorbed with itself. Let us note in passing that all schools of logic, without exception, having ignored Hegel's criticism of the old logic, have shared this old prejudice to this day as though nothing had happened. It is most outspokenly professed by neopositivists, who directly identify thought with linguistic activity and logic with the analysis of language. The most striking thing about this is the self-conceit with which they project this archaic prejudice as the latest discovery of 20th century logical thinking, as the manifestation to the world at long last of the principle of the scientific development of logic. As an axiom of the logic of science, language is, nevertheless, not the sole empirically observed form in which human thought manifests itself. Does man really not discover himself as a thinking being in his actions, in the course of actually shaping the world around him, in the making of things? Does he really only function as a thinking being when talking? The question is surely purely rhetorical. The thought of which Hegel spoke discloses itself in human affairs every bit as obviously as in words, in chains of terms, in the lacework of word combinations. Furthermore, in real affairs man demonstrates the real modes of his thinking more adequately than in his narrations of them. But, that being so, man's actions, and so too the results of his actions, the things created by them, not only could, but must, be considered manifestations of his thought, as acts of the objectifying of his ideas, thoughts, plans, and conscious intentions. Hegel demanded from the very start that thought should be investigated in all the forms in which it was realized, and above all in human affairs, in the creation of things and events. Thought revealed its force and real power not solely in talking but also in the whole grandiose process of creating culture and the whole objective body of civilization, the whole inorganic body of man, including in that tools and statues, workshops and temples, factories and chancelleries, political organizations and systems of legislation. 78 Hegel, Science of Logic, page 37, 79 Hegel, Shorter Logic, section 60, 88 Alf Trendelenburg, Logische Untersuchungen, Berlin 1840, page 16. History of Dialectics. 57. It was on that basis that Hegel also acquired the right to consider in logic the objective determinations of things outside consciousness, outside the psyche of the human individual, in all their independence. Moreover, from that psyche, there was nothing mystical nor idealist in that. It meant the forms of things created by the activity of the thinking individual. In other words, the forms of his thought embodied in natural materials, invested in it by human activity. Thus a house appeared as the architect's conception embodied in stone, a machine as the embodiment of the engineer's ideas in metal, and so on, and the whole immense objective body of civilization as thought in its otherness. In its sensual objective embodiment, the whole history of humanity was correspondingly also to be considered a process of the outward revelation of the power of thought, as a process of the realization of man's ideas, concepts, notions, plans, intentions, and purposes, as a process of the embodying of logic, i.e. of the schemas to which men's purposive activity was subordinated. The understanding and careful analysis of thought in this aspect was still not idealism. Logic, furthermore, by following such a path, thus took the decisive step toward genuine materialism, toward understanding of the fact that all logical forms without exception were universal forms of the development of reality outside thought, reflected in human consciousness and tested in the course of millennia of practice. In considering thought in the course of its materialization as well as in its verbal revelation, Hegel did not go beyond the bounds of the analysis of thought at all, beyond the limits of the subject matter of logic as a special science. He simply brought into the field of view of logic that real phase of the process of development of thought without understanding which logic could not and never would be able to become a real science. From Hegel's standpoint, the real basis for the forms and laws of thought proved to be only the aggregate historical process of the intellectual development of humanity understood in its universal and necessary aspects. The subject matter of logic was no longer the abstract identical schemas that could be found in each individual consciousness, and common to each of them, but the history of science and technique collectively created by people. A process quite independent of the will and consciousness of the separate individuals, although realized at each of its stages precisely in the conscious activity of individuals. This process, according to Hegel, also included, as a phase, the act of realizing thought in object activity, and through activity in the forms of things and events outside consciousness. In that, in Lenin's words, he came very close to materialism. In considering thought as a real productive process expressing itself not only in the movement of words but also in the changing of things, Hegel was able, for the first time in the history of logic, to pose the problem of a special analysis of thought forms, or the analysis of thought from the aspect of form. Before him such a name had not arisen in logic, and even could not have. It is hardly surprising that economists, wholly under the influence of material interests, have overlooked the formal side of the relative expression of value, when professional logicians, before Hegel, even overlooked the formal aspect of the propositions and conclusions they used as examples. Logicians before Hegel had recorded only the external schemas in which logical actions, judgments and inferences functioned in speech, i.e. as schemas of the joining together of terms signifying general ideas, but the logical form expressed in these figures, i.e. the category, remained outside their sphere of investigation, and the conception of it was simply borrowed from metaphysics and ontology. So it had been even with Kant, despite the fact that he had nevertheless seen categories precisely as the principles of judgments. And since logical form, about which Marx spoke in the first edition of Das Kapital, was understood as a form of activity realized equally well in the movement of verbal terms and in the movement of the things involved in the work of the thinking being, there then for the first time only arose the possibility of analyzing it specially as such, of abstracting it from the special features of its expression in some. 81 Lenin, Philosophical Notebooks, LCW Vol 38 page 278, 82 Marx, Das Kapital, Volume 1, Hamburg 1867 page 21. History of Dialectics. 58. Partial material or other. In logos, in reason, sage and sash, i.e. myth and fact, or rather legend and true story, were equally expressed in the logical aspect. Incidentally, play on words, for example, was very characteristic of Hegel, puns however that threw light on the genetic relationship of the ideas expressed by the words. Sage is legend, myth, hence saga, a legend of high deeds, cf. Bylina, the form of Russian epic, sash is a broad capacious word signifying not so much a single, sensuously perceived thing, as the essence of the matter, situation, the point, the actual state of affairs, i.e. everything that is or was in the matter itself, cf. Russian bile, meaning a true story, fact, what really happened. This etymology is used in the science of logic to express very important shades of meaning, which sound as follows in Lenin's translation and materialist interpretation. With this introduction of content into logical consideration, the subject becomes not dinge but die sash. Der Begriff der Dinge, not things but the laws of their movement, materialistically. Considered as the activity of the thinking being in its universal form, thought was also fixed in those of its schemas and moments as remained invariant in whatever special material the relevant activity was performed and whatever product it put out at any one instant. In the Hegelian view it was quite irrelevant how, precisely, the action of thinking took place or takes place, whether in articulated vibrations of the ambient air and their identifying signs or in some other natural, physical substance. In all human contemplation there is thought, just as thought is the general in all conceptions, recollections, and on the whole any mental activity, in all wishes, desires, etc. All these are only further specifications of thought. While we so conceive thought, it itself appears in another aspect than when we only speak. We have intellectual power over and above any other abilities, like contemplation, imagination, will and the like. All the universal scheme is being depicted in the activity of the thinking being, including that directed toward immediately intuited or represented material, must therefore be considered not less as logical parameters of thought than the schemas of its expression in language, or in the form of the figures known in the old logic. Thought in the broadest sense of the word, as activity-altering images of the external world in general expressed in words, the thought that really affects everything human and makes humanity human, as a capacity that creates knowledge in any forms, including that of the contemplated images, and penetrates into them, and hence not simply the subjective, psychic act of using or treating words, was the subject matter of logic, the science of thought. Thought, in fact, included the human determination of sensation, intuition, images, ideas, aims, obligations, etc., and also thoughts and concepts. Thought in general thus appears at first not in the form of thought but as feeling, intuition, imagination, forms that are to be distinguished from thought as form. The thought form as such appears to us only in the course of thinking about thought itself, i.e. only in logic. But before man began to think about thought, he had already to think, though still not realizing the logical schemas and categories within which this thinking took place, but already embodying them in the form of the concrete statements and concepts of science, engineering, morals, and so on. Thought was thus realized at first as activity in all the diversity of its outward manifestations, the thought form. 83 C. Hegel, Gene or Real Philosophy, Berlin 1969, page 183, 84 Lenin, Opposite, page 94, 85 Hegel, Shorter Logic, section 24, 86 Ibid, section 2, 87 Ibid, section 3, 88 Ibid, section 2. History of Dialectics. 59. Here was sunk into the material of concrete thoughts, sense images, and ideas, was sublated in them, and was therefore counterposed to conscious thinking as the form of external reality. In other words, thought and the thought form did not appear at first to the thinking being as forms of his own activity at all, creating a certain product, but as forms of the product itself, i.e. of concrete knowledge, images and concepts. Intuition and representation, as the forms of tools, machines, states, etc., and as the forms of realized aims, wishes, desires, and so on. Thought could not see itself otherwise than in the mirror of its own creations, in the mirror of the external world, which we knew through thought activity. Thought, as it appeared in logic, was thus the same thought as had been realized in the form of knowledge of the world, in the form of science, engineering, art, and morality. But it was far from the same thing in form, because there is a difference between having sensations and ideas, determined and penetrated by thought, and having thoughts about them. Neglect of this very important distinction led the old logic into a dual error. On the one hand it only defined thought as a subjective, psychic capability of the individual and therefore counterposed to thought, so understood the whole sphere of intuition, ideas, and will as something existing outside thought and having nothing in common with it, as the object of reflection existing outside thought. On the other hand, in not distinguishing in form between the relative strength of the two revelations of thought mentioned above, it could also not say how the thought form as such was differentiated from the form of intuition and representation, in the shape of which it had originally appeared and was hidden, and consequently confused the one with the other, taking the form of the concept for the form of intuition, and vice versa. Hence, too, it came about that, under the form of concept, the old logic considered every kind of idea or notion whatsoever, insofar as it was expressed in speech or in a term, that is to say, the image of intuition or contemplation held in consciousness by means of speech, which recorded it. As a result, too, the old logic embraced the concept itself only from the aspect from which it was really not distinguished in any way from any notion or intuitive image expressed in speech, from the aspect of the abstract and general, which was really just as common to the concept as to the notion. Thus it came about that it took the form of abstract identity or abstract universality for the specific form of the concept, and could therefore only raise the law of identity and the principle of contradiction and determinations to the rank of absolute fundamental criteria of the thought form in general. Kant also took that stand, understanding by concept any general notion insofar as it was fixed by a term. Hence his definition, the concept is a general image or representation of that which is common to many objects, consequently a general idea, provided that it can be included in several objects. Hegel himself required a more profound solution of the problem of the concept and of thinking in concepts from logic. For him a concept was primarily a synonym for real understanding of the essence of the matter and not simply an expression of something general, of some identity of the objects of intuition. A concept disclosed the real nature of a thing and not its similarity with other things, and not only should it express the abstract generality of its object, but also the special nature or peculiarity of the object. That was why the form of the concept proved to be a dialectical unity of universality and particularity, a unity that was also revealed through manifold forms of judgment and inference, and came out into the open in judgments. It was not surprising that any judgment destroyed the form of abstract identity and represented its self-evident negation. Its form was, A is B. Hegel distinguished clearly between universality, which dialectically contained the whole richness of the particular and the singular within itself and in its determinations, and the simple abstract generality, identicalness, of all the single objects of a given kind. The universal concept expressed itself the actual law of the origin, development, and fading or disappearance of single things, and that was already quite. 89 Hegel, Shorter Logic, section 2, 90 Kant, Logic, Leipzig, page 98. History of Dialectics. 60. Another angle on the concept, much truer and deeper, because, as Hegel demonstrated with a mass of examples, the real law did not always appear on the surface of phenomena in the form of a simple identicalness, of a common sign or attribute, or in the form of identity. If that were so there would be no need for any theoretical science. The job of thought was not limited to empirically registering common attributes. The central concept of Hegel's logic was therefore the concrete universal. He brilliantly illustrated its distinction from the simple, abstract universality of the sphere of notions in his famous pamphlet Wer denkt abstract. To think abstractly meant to be enslaved by the force of current catchphrases and clichés, of one-sided, empty definitions, meant to see in real, sensuously intuited things only an insignificant part of their real content. Only such determinations of them as were already gelled in consciousness and functioned there as ready-made stereotypes. Hence the magic force of current catchphrases and expressions, which fence reality off from the thinking person instead of serving as the form of its expression. In this last interpretation, logic finally became a real logic of understanding of unity and variety, and not a scheme for manipulating reanimate ideas and notions, a logic of critical and self-critical thought and not a means of the uncritical classification and pedantic schematic presentation of existing ideas. From premises of that kind, Hegel concluded that real thought in fact took other forms and was governed by other laws than those that current logic considered the sole determinations of thinking. Thought had obviously to be investigated as collective, cooperative activity in the course of which the individual, with his schemas of conscious thinking, performed only partial functions. In fulfilling them, however, he was constantly forced at the same time to perform actions that would not fit in any way, with the schemas of ordinary logic. In really taking part in common work, he was all the time subordinating himself to the laws and forms of universal thought, though not conscious of them as such. Hence the topsy-turvy situation arose in which the real forms and laws of thought were expressed and understood as some kind of external necessity, as an extra logical determination of the action, and on the sole ground that they were still not revealed and realized by logic. Not acknowledged as logical interpretations. As can easily be seen, Hegel criticized traditional logic, and the thinking appropriate to it, by the same imminent procedure that was one of his main conquests, namely, he counterposed to the assertions, rules, and basic propositions of logic not some kind of opposing assertions, rules and basic propositions but the process of the practical realization of its own principles in real thought. He showed it its own image, pointing out those of its features that it preferred not to notice and not to recognize. Hegel required only one thing of thinking in accordance with logic, namely uncompromising consistency in applying the principles adduced. And he showed that it was the consistent application of these principles that in fact led inevitably, with inexorable force, to negation of the principles themselves as one-sided, incomplete, and abstract. That was the very critique of reason, from the standpoint of reason itself, that Kant had begun, and this critique of reason and its circumscribing logic led to the conclusion that the nature of thought is itself dialectics. That is, understanding it must fall into the negative of itself, into contradiction. Kant had actually reached a similar conclusion, and whereas before him logic could be unself-critical out of ignorance, now it could maintain its precarious position only if it quite consciously rejected facts unacceptable to it, only by becoming consciously unself-critical. The historically unavoidable defect of Kantian logic was that it pedantically schematized and described the mode of thought that led to a bringing out and sharp formulation of the contradictions contained in any concept but did not show how they could, and should be resolved logically. Without shifting this difficult task onto practical reason, onto moral postulates, and other factors and abilities lying outside logic. Hegel, however, saw the main job facing logic after the work of Kant, Fichte, and Schelling, as precisely in finding, bringing out, and indicating to thought the means of intelligently and concretely resolving the contradictions into which it inevitably fell when consciously guided by the 91 Hegel, Shorter Logic, Section 11. History of Dialectics. 61. Traditional, purely formal logic. That, too, was the real distinction between Hegel's conception of thought and logic and all preceding ones. The old logic, coming up against the logical contradiction that it itself brought to light just because it rigorously followed its own principles, always balked at it, retreated to analysis of the preceding movement of thought, and always strove to find an error or mistake in it leading to the contradiction. For formal logical thinking, contradictions thus became an insurmountable barrier to the forward movement of thought, an obstacle in the way of concrete analysis of the essence of the matter. It therefore also came about that thought, despairing of managing by itself to resolve the contradiction into which it had got itself, turns back to the solutions and reliefs that were the spirit's lot in its other modes and forms. It could not be otherwise, since the contradiction did not develop through a mistake. No mistake, it ultimately proved, had been made in the preceding thinking. It was necessary to go even further back, to uncomprehended contemplation, sense perception, aesthetic intuition, i.e. to the realm of lower forms of consciousness, where there was really no contradiction for the simple reason that it had still not been disclosed and clearly expressed. It never hurts, of course, to go back and analyze the preceding course of argument and check whether there has not been a formal mistake, for that also happens not infrequently, and here the recommendations of formal logic have a quite rational sense and value. It may turn out, as a result of checking, that a given logical contradiction is really nothing but the result of committing an error or mistake somewhere. Hegel, of course, never dreamed of denying such a case. He, like Kant, had in mind only those antinomies that developed in thought as a result of the most formally correct and faultless argumentation. Hegel also suggested that a contradiction should be resolved as well as disclosed, and resolved by the same logical thinking as had brought it out when a definite concept was being developed. He treated both the origin and the mode of resolution of logical contradictions differently. Like Kant, he understood that they did not arise at all through the negligence or carelessness of individual thinking persons, but unlike Kant, he understood that they could and must be resolved and must not always be preserved as antinomies. But so that it could resolve them, thought must fix them sharply and clearly in advance, precisely as antinomies, as logical contradictions, as real, and not imaginary, contradictions and determinations. Dialectics, according to Hegel, was the form of thought that included the process both of elucidating contradictions and of concretely resolving them in the corpus of a higher and more profound stage of rational understanding of the same object. On the way toward further investigation of the essence of the matter, i.e. in the course of developing science, engineering, and morality, and all the spheres he called the objective spirit. This conception immediately brought about constructive shifts in the whole system of logic. Whereas Kant's dialectic was only the final, third part of logic, where it was a matter actually of the statement of the logically unresolvable antinomies of theoretical cognition, with Hegel it appeared quite another matter. With him the sphere of the logical was divided into three main sections or aspects, i.e. three main directions were distinguished in it, as follows. 1. The abstract or rational. 2. The dialectical or negatively reasonable. 3. The speculative or positively reasonable. Hegel specially stressed that these three aspects in no case constitute three parts of logic, but are only moments of any logically real nature, that is of any concept or of any truth in general. 92 Hegel, Ibid, Section 11, 93 Hegel, Shorter Logic, Section 79. History of Dialectics. 62. In the empirical history of thought, these three aspects appeared either as three consecutive formations or as three different but closely related systems of logic. Hence we got the illusion that they could be depicted as three different sections of logic, following one after the other. Logic as a whole, however, could not be obtained by a simple uniting of these three aspects, each of which was taken in the form in which it had been developed in the history of thought. That called for critical treatment of all three aspects from the standpoint of higher principles, those historically last achieved. Hegel characterized the three moments of logical thought that should constitute logic as follows. 1. Thought as understanding remains stuck in firm determination and does not get beyond differentiation of the latter. Such a limited abstraction applies to it as existing and being for itself. The separate historical embodiment of this moment in thought appeared as dogmatism, and its logical, theoretical self-awareness as general, i.e. purely formal logic. 2. The dialectic comment is the own self-abolition of such ultimate determinations and their transition into their opposites. Historically, this moment appears as skepticism, i.e., as the state in which thought, feeling bewildered among opposing, equally logical and mutually provoking dogmatic systems, is powerless to choose and prefer one of them. Logical self-awareness, corresponding to the stage of skepticism, was distinguished in the Kantian conception of dialectics as a state of the insolubility of the antinomies between dogmatic systems. Skepticism was higher than dogmatism both historically and in content because the dialectic included in reason or understanding was already realized, and existed not only in itself but for itself. 3. The speculative or positively reasonable conceives the unity of determinations in their opposition, the affirmation that is contained in their resolution and their transition. Hegel also saw systematic treatment of this last moment as the historically pressing task in logic, and therefore his own mission and the aim of his work. When critically rethought in the light of the principles only now elicited, the moments considered ceased to be independent parts of logic and were transformed into three abstract aspects of one and the same logical system. Then a logic was created such that, when thinking was guided by it, thought became fully self-critical and was in no danger of falling into either the dullness of dogmatism or into the sterility of skeptical neutrality. Hence, too, there followed the external, formal division of logic into the doctrine of being, the doctrine of essence, and the doctrine of the notion. The division of logic into the objective and the subjective coincided at first glance with the old division of philosophy into ontology and logic proper, but Hegel stressed that such a division would be very inexact and arbitrary because, in logic, the opposition between the subjective and the objective disappeared. His position on this question calls besides for a thorough commentary, since superficial criticism of his conception of logic and its subject matter has so far been primarily that his position ignored the opposition between the subjective and the objective, and therefore casuistically produced specifically logical schemas of thought for the ontological determination of things outside thought and, on the contrary, universal definitions of the reality outside thought for 94 Ibid, Section 80, 95 Hegel, Shorter Logic, Section 81, 96 Ibid, Section 82, 97 Hegel, Shorter Logic, Section 82. History of Dialectics. 63. Schemas of the logical process, thus committing two sins, hypostatizing logical forms, and logicalizing reality. If the original sin of Hegelianism had really been a simple, naive blindness in relation to the contrast between thought and reality, between the concept and its object, then Kant's dualism would have been the apex of philosophical wisdom. In fact, however, Hegel's error was not so simple, and was not in the least characterized by the evaluation cited above. Hegel saw the difference and, what is more important, the contradiction between the world of things outside consciousness and the world of thought, and was much more acutely aware of it than his naive critics among the Kantians. And in any case he ascribed much greater significance for logic to this opposition than, say, positivists do. The point is quite another one, and another understanding of it follows from the specifically Hegelian conception of thought, and thus also from Hegel's solution of the problem of the relation of thought and the world of things. That is why, when Hegel formulated a program for the critical transformation of logic as a science, he posed the task of bringing it into correspondence with its real object, i.e. with real thought, with its real universal forms and laws. The last named do not exist in thought simply or even so much as schemas and rules of conscious thinking, but rather as universal schemas of objective thinking that are realized not so much as a subjective psychic act as the productive process that created science, technique and morality. In defending the objectivity of logical forms so understood, Hegel of course was right in many respects, and his critique of the subjective idealist interpretation of the logical is topical in the struggle against many of their present-day successors. In particular neopositivists, as social formation science and technique exist and develop of course outside the individual's consciousness. But, according to Hegel, there was no other consciousness than that of the individual, never had been, and never would be. And the logical forms of development of science and technique really stood in opposition to the consciousness and will of the individual as quite objective limits to his individually performed actions, even as limits dictated to him from outside. According to these determinations, thoughts can be called objective, and they can also be taken to include the forms that are considered for the present in ordinary logic and are looked upon only as forms of conscious thought. Logic here coincides with metaphysics, with the science of things conceived in thought. In this conception of the objectivity of thought forms there was as yet, of course, no facet of the specifically Hegelian, i.e. objective, idealism. One cannot reproach Hegel with having allegedly extended the boundaries of the subject matter of logic impermissibly so that it began to embrace not only thought but things. Hegel did not in general speak just about things as such, he had in mind exclusively things comprehended in thoughts. It was in that sense that he asserted that in logic thoughts are so conceived that they have no other content than that belonging to the thought itself and produced through it. In other words, logic had in mind not things but those of their determinations as were posited by the action of thought, i.e. scientific determinations. Thus, what Hegel affirmed within the limits of consideration of pure thought was much more rigorous and consistent than the logic before him, and he justly reproached it precisely for not having been able to confine itself rigorously within the bounds of its own subject matter, and for having imported into it material not assimilated by thought and not reproduced by thought activity. 98 Hegel, Shorter Logic, Section 24, 99 Ibid, Section 6. History of Dialectics. 64. His requirement of including all the categories in logic in no way meant going beyond the limits of thought. It was equivalent to a demand for a critical analysis to be made of the thought activity that had engendered the determinations of the old metaphysics, and for those thought forms to be brought out that both logic and metaphysics had applied quite uncritically and unconsciously. Without clearly realizing what they consisted of, Hegel had no doubt that thought forms must not be used without having been subjected to investigation and that we must make the thought forms themselves the object of cognition. But such an investigation was already thought, and the activity taking place in those very forms was the act of applying them. If we looked on logic as investigation of thought forms, he wrote, this investigation must also unite the activity of thought forms and their critique and cognition. The thought forms must be taken in and for themselves, they are the object and the activity of the object itself, they themselves inquire into themselves, must determine their limits and demonstrate their defects themselves. That will then be that activity of thought that will soon be given separate consideration as dialectics. The subject matter of logic then proved to be those really universal forms and patterns within which the collective consciousness of humanity was realized. The course of its development, empirically realized as the history of science and technique, was also seen as that whole to the interests of which all the individual's separate logical acts were subordinated. And inasmuch as the individual was involved in the common cause, in the work of universal thought, he was continually forced to perform actions dictated by the interests of the whole and not confined to the schemas of general logic. He would naturally not realize his actions in logical concepts, although these acts were performed by his own thinking. The schemas of universal thought would be realized unconsciously through his psyche. In this connection Hegel introduced one of his most important distinctions between thought in itself, which also constituted the subject matter, the object of investigation, in logic, and thought for itself. i.e. thought that had already become aware of the schemas, principles, forms, and laws of its own work and had already worked quite consciously in accordance with them, fully and clearly realizing what it was doing, and how it was doing it. Logic was also consciousness, the expression through concepts and categories of those laws and forms in accordance with which the process of thinking in itself took place. In logic it also became the object for itself. In logic thought had consequently to become the same for itself as it had earlier been only in itself. Hegel therefore also formulated the task of bringing logic into line with its real subject matter, with real thought, with the really universal forms and laws of development of science, technique, and morality. In other words, he wanted to make the subjective consciousness of thought about itself identical with its object, with the real universal and necessary forms and laws of universal thought. That also meant that the principle of the identity of the subjective and the objective must be introduced into logic as the highest principle, i.e. the principle that the real forms and laws of thought must be delineated in logic exactly, adequately, and correctly. The principle of the identity of subject and object signified nothing more, and did not signify any hypostatization of the forms of subjective thought, because one and the same thought was both object and subject in logic, and it was a matter of the agreement, coincidence. An identity of this thought with itself as unconsciously performed productive activity, or as activity hitherto taking place with a false consciousness of its own actions. In defending the objectivity of logical forms, Hegel of course stood head and shoulders above than all those who up to the present have reproached him with having hyposta. 100 Hegel, Shorter Logic, Section 41, 101 Ibid. History of Dialectics. 65. Ties logical forms in order to defend their version of the identity of thought and object as a purely conventional principle, as the principle of the identity of sign and thing designated, of the concept and that which is thought in it. Hegel was 100% right in his critique of the subjective idealist version of the logical and of its objectivity. His critique not only hit at Kant, Fichte, and Schelling, but also strikes all today's neopositivists. Thus the statement that there was no difference for logic between the subjective and the objective did not mean anything else on Hegel's lips than an affirmation that logic must consider, within itself, within its own theory, and linked together in one system, literally all the logical schemas of thought activity, beginning with the categories and finishing up with the figures of judgments and conclusions. And within it there must be room both for those schemas that prior to Kant were considered simply determinations of things outside consciousness and for those that were usually considered to be specific to consciousness and had allegedly no relation to things outside the mind. Hegel did not dream of repudiating the differences between the categorical schemas given in the determinations of categories and the figures of formal logic, of course, but he did require them to be explained and disclosed within logic itself and not to be presumed in advance. Uncritically borrowed from the old metaphysic and its corresponding logic, he required the one and the other to be included in logic in critically rethought form. The relation of such forms as concept, judgment, and conclusion to other forms like causality, etc., can only be discovered within logic itself. Hegel thus did not include the determinations of things as they existed outside the mind or in everyday consciousness in logic at all, but solely those determinations that appeared to the mind in science, and in theoretical consciousness, that were posited or formulated by thought itself. And since science was the realized force of thought, materialized mental, theoretical labor, he also saw primarily objectified determinations of thought in the determinations of things. The requirement of including all categories in logic was therefore equivalent to requiring a critical analysis to be made of those activities of thought that were materialized or objectified in the concepts of the old metaphysic, and to requiring disclosure of the logic of thought that was earlier realized in the form of various schemas of the universe, and so to requiring a critical understanding of all the categories that the old logic had taken over quite uncritically from ontological systems. Hegel thus did not go outside the framework of the subject matter of logic at all but only beyond the limits of the notions of earlier logicians about these limits. While remaining within the boundaries of the investigation of thought, and only of thought, he nevertheless saw more within those boundaries than previous logicians, and saw those logical schemas of developing thought that the old logic had not considered universal at all and had therefore not included in the theory. Logic thus proved to be pinned to discovery and investigation of the objective laws governing the subjective activity of individuals, and those forms in which, whether or not the individuals so wished it, or whether or not they realized it, they were forced, in so far in general as they thought, to express the results of their subjective efforts. That is in what Hegel saw the true difference between the real laws of thought and the rules that the old logic had promoted to the rank of laws. Man can break rules, unlike laws, and does so at every step, thus demonstrating that they are not laws. Because laws cannot be broken, they constitute the determinateness of the object, which cannot be omitted without the object itself, in this case thought, ceasing to exist. 102 Marx, Capital, Vol 1, MECW Vol 35 page 537, 103 Hegel, Opposite, Section 50. History of Dialectics. 66. And if man thinks, then his activities are subordinated to law and cannot overstep its bounds, although he may at the same time break the rules in the most flagrant way. A law can be broken in one way only, by ceasing to think, i.e. by escaping from the realm that is governed by the laws of thought and where they operate as inexorably as the law of gravitation in the world of spatially determined bodies. But for man such a way out is equivalent to overstepping the bounds of human existence in general. Hegel also showed that the real development of determinations, i.e. the real forward movement of thought, even in the simplest cases, not to mention the process of development of science, technique, and morality, took place precisely through breach of all the rules that had been established for thought by the old logic, through their dialectical negation. But the constant negation of the rules established by conscious thought for itself got out of control, was not aware of itself, and proved to be a fact outside thought, although it took place within the latter. Thought had this fact in itself but not for itself. But as soon as this fact was recognized as a universal and necessary logical thought form, it was also transformed into a fact of consciousness, a fact of conscious thought, and the latter became consciously dialectical. Previously it had only been so in itself, i.e. despite its own consciousness of itself, but now it became for itself precisely what it had previously been only in itself. The subject matter of logic consequently could not merely be the forms that had already been realized or apprehended, and had already been included in existing consciousness. It was impossible to grasp them ready-made, or to classify them. They had to be brought out in the very course of reasoning about them, in the course of actual thinking about thought. And when Kant considered the forms of thought as some ready-made object, already depicted, his logic represented only an uncritical classification of existing notions about thought. But if logic was to be a science, it must be a critical, systematic investigation that did not accept a single determination on faith, and unproved by thought, i.e. without being reproduced by it quite consciously. In this investigation, criticism of the thought forms known to cultivated thinking was only possible and thinkable as self-criticism. The schemas, rules, forms, principles, and laws of this thought were here subjected to criticism not by comparing them with some object lying outside them, but solely by bringing out the dialectic they included in themselves and which was discovered immediately as soon as we began in general to think, rigorously and fully realizing what we were doing and how we were doing it. In that way, too, the very identity of the forms of cultivated thought with the forms of the unconsciously performed actions of the intellect must be carried out, actions to which thought had to submit during the historical process of its realization in the form of science. Technique, art and morality. Logic was nothing else than the proper apprehension of those forms and laws within which the real thinking of people took place. The identity of thought and the conceivable, as the principle of the logical development and construction of logic, signified nothing more. It was merely a matter of this, that the schemas of cultivated thought should coincide with those of the structure of the science and the movement of which the individual was involved, i.e. with the logic dictated by its content. If the schema of the activity of a theoretician coincided with that of the development of his science, and the science was thus developed through his activity, Hegel would attest the logicality of his activity, i.e. the identity of his thinking with that impersonal, universal process which we also call the development of science. Logic recognized the activities of such a theoretician as logical also when they were even formally not quite irreproachable from the standpoint of the canons of the old logic. Hegel therefore began to consider all the categories in quite a new way. For him they were not at all the most general determinations of the things given in intuition or contemplation or in direct experience to each individual, not transcendental schemas of synthesis directly inherent, i.e. History of dialectics. 67. Inborn in each individual consciousness, it was impossible to discover these thought forms in the separate consciousness taken in isolation, within the individual ego. They were there at best only in themselves, only in the form of unrealized tendencies and so not brought to awareness. Categories were only discovered and demonstrated their determinations through the historically developing scientific, technical, and moral perfecting of the human race, because only in it, and not in the experience of the isolated individual, did thought become for itself what it had been in itself. Categories themselves, in the individual's own experience, not in the whole fullness and dialectical complexity of their composition and connections but only in abstract, one-sided aspects. It was therefore impossible to derive them from analysis of the experience of the isolated individual. They were only discovered through the very complex process of the interaction of a mass of single minds mutually correcting each other in discussion, debate, and confrontations, i.e. through a frankly dialectical process that, like a huge centrifuge, ultimately separated the purely objective schemas of thought from the purely subjective schemas of activity, and as a result crystallized out logic, a system of determinations of purely universal, impersonal, and featureless thought in general. Categories were therefore also universal forms of the origin of any object in thought, gradually depicted in the aggregate scientific consciousness of humanity. They were universal determinations of the object as and how it appeared in the eyes of science, in the ether of universal thought. Hegel consented to call determinations of things only those determinations that had been developed by science, by active thought. They were, therefore, none other than thought forms realized in concrete material, determinations of thought embodied in the object, i.e. in the scientific concept of the external thing. Hegel, therefore, and only therefore, also spoke of the identity of thought and object and defined the object as a concept realized in sensuous, physical material. The determinations of categories, naturally, could also function as determinations of things in the contemplation of the individual, not of every individual, however, but only of those who in the course of their education had mastered the historical experience of humanity, and reproduced in their individual consciousness the path taken by human thought. Categories were the forms of organization of this experience. Categories were thus universal forms of the reconstruction, reproduction, in the consciousness of the individual of those objects that had been created before him by the collective efforts of past generations of thinking beings, by the power of their collective, impersonal thought. In individually repeating the experience of humanity, which had created the world of spiritual and material culture surrounding him from the cradle, this individual also repeated that which had been done before him and for him by the universal spirit, and so acted according to the same laws and in the same forms as the impersonal universal spirit of humanity. That means that categories appeared at once as universal schemas of the scientific formation of the individual consciousness, rising gradually from the zero level of its erudition to the highest stages of spiritual culture at the given moment, and as schemas of the individual mastery of the whole world of images created by the thought of preceding generations and standing opposed to the individual as a quite objective world of spiritual and material culture, the world of the concepts of science, technique and morality. This world was the materialized thought of humanity, realized in the product, was alienated thought in general, and the individual had to de-objectify and arrogate to himself the modes of activity that were realized in it, and it was in that the process of his education properly consisted. In the trained mind, categories actually functioned as active forms of a concept. When the individual had them in his experience, and made them forms of his own activity, he also possessed them, and knew and realized them, as thought forms. Otherwise they remained only general forms of the things given in contemplation and representation, and counterposed to thought as a reality existing outside it and independently of it. History of dialectics. 68. With this was linked the naive fetishism that directly accepted the available concepts and notions of science about things, the norms of morals and justice, the forms of the state and political system and the similar products of the thinking of people who had objectified their own conscious activity in them, for purely objective determinations of things in themselves. It accepted them as such only because it did not know that they had not been created without the involvement of thought, and did not know how, moreover, they were produced by thought. It could not reproduce or repeat the process of thought that had brought them into being and therefore, naturally, considered them eternal and unalterable determinations of things in themselves, and the expression of their essence. It believed quite uncritically, on trust, everything that it was told about these things in the name of science, the state and God. It believed not only that these things appeared so today in the eyes of the thinking person but also that they were really so. Hegel's conception of thought thus of necessity also included the process of the objectification of thought, i.e. its sense object, practical realization through action, in sensuous physical material. In the world of sensuously contemplated things. Practice, the process of activity on sense objects that altered things in accordance with the concept, in accordance with plans matured in the womb of subjective thought, began to be considered here as just as important a level in the development of thought and understanding as the subjective mental act of reasoning expressed in speech. Hegel thus directly introduced practice into logic, and made a fundamental advance in the understanding of thought and in the science of thought. Since thought outwardly expressed itself not only in the form of speech but also in real actions and in people's deeds, it could be judged much better by its fruits than by the notions that it created about itself. Thought, therefore, that was realized in people's actual actions also proved to be the true criterion of the correctness of those subjective mental acts that were outwardly expressed only in words, in speeches, and in books. 6. Feuerbach, once more about the principle of constructing a logic, idealism or materialism. So far we have spoken almost exclusively about Hegel's positive gains, which constituted an epoch in logic as a science. Let us now touch on the historically inevitable costs of production connected with the idealism of Hegel's conception of thought, and on the defects in his logic that do not permit us to adopt his conception in toto, and that can only be surmounted by developing materialist philosophy. Historically, things developed in such a way that Feuerbach was the first person in Germany to speak about the costs of production of Hegelian idealism. Like every materialist, Feuerbach thought the dualist opposing of thought to being as the initial principle of philosophy. In the course of his reasoning, therefore, he naturally reproduced Spinoza's decisive arguments against Cartesian dualism. This line of polemic, it is true, has to be deduced by analysis, since Feuerbach had in mind not only dualism in the pure form in which it was expressed by Kant, but also the philosophy of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, i.e. the attempt systematically made to overcome dualism from the right, in the form of idealistic monism. Feuerbach strove, however, to show that the surmounting of dualism in this case inevitably remained fictitious, formal, and verbal, and that idealism in general did not, and could not, encroach on the fundamental premises of the Kantian system. In Schelling and Hegel, therefore, he primarily considered the unsurmounted Kant, the Hegelian phi. History of dialectics. 69. Philosophy is the abolition of the contradiction of thought and being as Kant in particular expressed it, but, mark you, only its abolition, with a known element, within thought. As a matter of fact, the so-called philosophy of absolute identity was a philosophy of the identity of thinking in itself, as before there was an unfilled gap between thought and being outside thought. The problem seemed to be resolved only because conceivable being, i.e. being in the form in which it had already been expressed in thought, had been put everywhere in the place of real being. Under the grandiose, profoundly thought-out construction of the Hegelian philosophy, therefore, there was hidden as a matter of fact an empty tautology. We thought the surrounding world as in how we thought it. So the philosophy of Schelling and Hegel had not, in fact, established any identity of thought and being and not just an absolute one, because being as such, free independent self-sufficient being existing outside and independently of thought, had simply not been taken into account in it. And remained something wholly immaterial and undetermined. The fundamental principle of Kantian dualism thus remained untouched. The thinking mind was considered from the very outset as something absolutely opposed to everything sensuous, corporeal, and material, as a special immaterial being, organized in itself and formed by immanent logical laws and schemas as something independent and self-sufficient. Hegel's logic also represented thought as the activity of such a supernatural and extra-physical subject, which was then forced to enter into special relations of mediation from outside with nature and man so as to shape them in its own image and likeness. Such a presentation of the thinking mind of necessity presupposed, in addition, that nature and man, as the opposites of the mind, or spirit, as the object and material of its molding activity, were represented as something passive and amorphous in themselves. Only as a result of the molding activity of the thinking spirit did nature and man become what they were and acquire all their well-known, concrete forms. Moreover, nothing other was represented in fact, as the product of the activity of the spirit, than the empirically obvious state of affairs in the real world, and the whole complicated magic of mediation once more merely served, in the guise of a gift of God, to return the same determinations to man and nature that had been previously taken from them by the act of abstraction. Without this preliminary robbery of man and nature, the spiritualistic philosophy could not have attributed a single one of its very impoverished determinations to the thinking spirit. In this interpretation of the problem of the relation of thought and being, Feuerbach above all saw a scholastically refurbished, rationalized theology. The absolute thinking spirit of spiritualism, like the biblical God, was a fantastic creature, constructed out of determinations alienated from man by an act of abstraction. The thinking about which Hegelian logic was concerned was, in fact, human thought, but abstracted from man and counterposed to him as the activity of a special being existing outside him. Proceeding from that quite correct understanding of the root errors of Hegelian idealism, Feuerbach rethought the very posing of the problem of the relation of thought to being. It was impossible, he showed, to ask how thought in general was related to being in general, since that already presupposed that thought was looked upon as something independent contrasted with being from outside. But being, however, understood not in Hegel's way, i.e. not as an abstract, logical category, not as being in thought, but as the real, sensuously objective world of nature and man, already included thought. Being included not only stones, trees, and stars, but also the thinking body of man. 104 Ludwig Feuerbach, Vorlaufige Pheasants zur Reform der Philosophie, in Kleine Schriften 2, Berlin 1970, page 257. History of dialectics. 70. Thus, to represent being as something deprived of thought meant to represent it incorrectly, to exclude man, capable of thinking, from it in advance, and that meant to deprive being of one of its most important predicates, to think of it imperfectly. The argument given here repeated the course of Spinoza's thought, was its developed interpretation, its translation into the language of a more modern philosophical terminology. The whole problem thus boiled down to resolving whether thought could, in general, be distinguished from man as a material, sensuously objective creature, and to fixing it and considering it from the very beginning as something independent, in contrast to everything corporeal, sensuous, and material, or whether thought should be understood as a property inseparable from man. Feuerbach considered the decisive argument in favor of materialism to be the arguments of natural science, medicine, and physiology. Materialism, relying on medicine, was also Archimedes' fulcrum in the dispute between materialism and spiritualism, for it was a matter here, in the final count, not of the divisibility or non-divisibility of matter, but of the divisibility or non-divisibility of man. Not of the being or not being of God, but of the being or not being of man, not of the eternity or temporality of matter, but of the eternity or temporality of man, not of matter scattered and extended outside man and heaven and earth, but of matter concentrated in the human skull. In short, it is a matter, in this dispute, so long as it is not conducted in mad confusion, only of the head of man. It alone is both the source and the goal and end of this dispute. Feuerbach considered that the basic problem of philosophy was thus, and only thus, put on a firm footing of fact, and so, naturally, resolved in favor of materialism. Thought was the real function of the living brain, and was inseparable from the matter of the brain. If we had brain matter in mind, then it was quite ridiculous in general to ask how thought was linked with it, how the one was connected with the other and mediated it, because there simply was no one and the other here, but only one and the same thing. The real being of the living brain was also thought, and real thought was the being of the living brain. That fact, expressed in philosophical categories, revealed the immediate unity of soul and body, which admits of nothing in the middle between them, and leaves no room for distinction or even contrast between material and immaterial being. Is consequently the point where matter thinks and the body is mind, and conversely the mind is body and thought is matter. The identity of thought and being, so understood, must also constitute an axiom of true philosophy, i.e. a fact not requiring scholastic proof and mediation. Feuerbach did not reproach Schelling and Hegel at all for having recognized in general the unity of thought and being in the thinking man, but only for having tried to depict it as the final unity of opposites, as the product of the joining together of an insubstantial thinking spirit and unthinking flesh. He reproached them with thus having tried to stick together a picture of the real fact from two equally false abstractions, of proceeding from illusion to fact and from abstraction to reality. The materialist, Feuerbach affirmed, must proceed in the opposite way, taking as his starting point the directly given fact, in order to explain the origin of those false abstractions that idealists uncritically accepted as facts. Schelling and Hegel started from the thesis of the initial opposition of incorporeal thought and of flesh without thought in order ultimately to reach the unity of the opposites. That was the false path of spiritualism. The materialist must proceed from the factual direct unity of the human individual in order to understand and show how and why the illusion of an imaginary opposition of thinking and corporeal being arose in the head of this individual. The illusion of the opposition of the thinking spirit and the flesh in general was consequently a purely subjective fact, i.e. a fact existing only in the head of the human individual, a purely psychology. 105 Feuerbach, On Spiritualism and Materialism Kleine Schriften IV, Berlin 1972, page 125, 106 Ibid, pages 152-53. History of Dialectics. 71. Cal fact. It arose for a quite natural reason, precisely because the thinking brain was the same sort of material, sensuous organ as all of man's other organs. The position was the same as with the eye, the organ of vision. If I saw stars by means of the eye, then quite understandably I could not at the same time see the eye itself, and conversely, if I wanted to examine the eye, even in a mirror, I would have to turn my gaze away from the stars. Vision would be impossible in general if I were to see all the detail of the structure of the eye itself at the same time as the object, i.e. all the inner material conditions by means of which this vision was effected. In the same way, too, the brain could not think if, in thinking, the organic foundation and conditions of thought became objects of its consciousness, i.e. the material structures and processes themselves by means of which thinking took place in the body of the brain. As structures they became objects only for physiology and anatomy. As the organ of thought the brain was structurally and functionally adapted exactly so as to perform activity directed toward external objects, so as to think not about itself but about the other, about the objective. And it was quite natural that the organ gets lost, and forgets and disavows itself in the opus fervid of its own activity, the activity in its objects. Hence, too, arose the illusion of the complete independence of everything corporeal, material, and sensuous, including the brain, from thought. But the illusion is understandably no argument in favor of idealism. Of itself, in spite of the inevitable illusions, thought always remained the material activity of a material organ, a material process. What for me, or subjectively, is a purely mental, immaterial, unsensuous act, in itself or objectively is a material, sensuous act. In the brain act, as the highest act, arbitrary, subjective, mental activity, and involuntary, objective material activity are identical and indistinguishable. Thus the logic of the struggle against dualism and spiritualism directly forced Feuerbach, in essence, to express a dialectical proposition to recognize that the living, thinking brain was an object in which there proved to be directly identical oppositions, namely, thought and sensuously objective being, thinking and what was thought, the ideal and the real, the spiritual and the material, the subjective and the objective. The thinking brain was the special object that could be properly expressed in philosophical categories only through directly identifying mutually exclusive determinations, through a thesis that embraced a direct unity, i.e. identity, of opposing categories. Not having mastered dialectics in its general form, Feuerbach, it is true, often wavered, constantly admitting determinations that he was then forced to correct, supplement, and make specific. As a result his exposition was made rather nebulous and ambiguous, but the essence remained the same. It was just because thinking was a material process, the material activity of a material organ directed to material objects, that the products of that activity could be correlated, compared, and collated with things in themselves, with things outside thought. Which everybody did at every step without the aid of the mediating activity of God or an absolute spirit. Concepts and images existed in the same space and in the same time as real things, and one and the same subject thought about and sensuously perceived the surrounding world, and that subject was precisely the human individual. The same individual who really lived and existed as a sensuously objective creature. The unity of the object, of the surrounding, sensuously objective world, corresponded to the unity of the subject. Just as a thinking and sensuously contemplating person was one and the same person and not two different beings coordinating their interrelations with the help of God or the absolute spirit, so the world thought of, on the one hand, and sensuously contemplated, on the other hand, were again one and. 107 Feuerbach Ibid, page 123, 108 Feuerbach, Opposite, page 124, 109 Feuerbach, Weiter den Dualismus von Liebe und Seele, Fleisch und Geist, Kleine Schriften 3, Berlin 1971, page 125, 110 Ibid. History of Dialectics. 72. The same world, and not two different worlds between which one had to look for a special passage or bridge, or mediation, resorting to the aid of a divine principle. That was why determinations of the world in thought were directly and spontaneously determinations of the sensuously contemplated or intuited world. And it was absurd to ask what was the special relation of the system of logical determinations to the sensuously given world, to the world in intuition and representation. A logical system was nothing else than the expression of the determinateness of the sensuously contemplated or intuited world. The question of the relation of logical and metaphysics was also an illusory and sham question. There was no such relation, because logic and metaphysics were spontaneously and directly one and the same. The universal determinations of the world in thought were nothing else than the expression of the abstract, universal determinateness of things given in intuition. Because both thought and intuition had to do with one and the same real world. And if by logic was understood not a collection of rules for the expression of thought and speech, but the science of the laws of development of real thinking, then, similarly, biological forms must be understood not the abstract forms of sentences and expressions, but the abstract, universal forms of the real content of thought, i.e. of the real world sensuously given to man. The so-called logical forms of judgments and conclusions are therefore not active thought forms, not causal conditions of reason. They presuppose the metaphysical concepts of universality, singularity, and particularity, the whole and the parts, necessity, foundation and consequence. They are given only through these concepts. They are consequently arbitrary, derived, not original thought forms. Only metaphysical conditions or relations are logical ones. Only metaphysics as the science of categories is the true esoteric logic. That was Hegel's profound thought. The so-called logical forms are only abstract, elementary speech forms, but speech is not thought, otherwise the greatest chatterbox would be the greatest thinker. Thus Feuerbach agreed completely with Hegel on logical forms and laws being absolutely identical with metaphysical ones, although he understood the reason and the grounds for that circumstance quite differently from the idealist Hegel. Here we have a clearly expressed materialist interpretation of the principle of the identity of the laws and forms of thought and being. From the materialist point of view it states that logical forms and patterns are nothing else than realized universal forms and patterns of being, of the real world sensuously given to man. That is the reason why neo-Kantians like Bernstein called consistent materialism spiritualism inside out. Nevertheless Feuerbach's interpretation of the identity of thought and being remains true and indisputable for any materialist, including the Marxist, but only, of course, in the most general form, so long as we are concerned with the fundamentals of logic and the theory of knowledge. And not with the details of the knowledge built up on that foundation. Since Feuerbach later began a specifically anthropological concretization of general materialist truths, arguments developed in his exposition that were obviously weak not only in comparison with the Marxist-Leninist solution of the problem, but even in comparison with Spinoza's conception, and they subsequently gave vulgar materialists, positivists, and even neo-Kantians occasion to consider him their predecessor in their, though not completely consistent, alley. A rather more detailed analysis of the features of Feuerbach's treatment of the identity of thinking and being is not without interest for two reasons, because it was materialism, and because it was materialism without dialectics. The materialism consisted in this case in an unqualified recognition of the fact that thought was the mode of the real existence of the material body, the activity of the thinking body in real space and time. The materialism appeared, furthermore, in recognition of the identity of the mentally comprehended and sensuously perceived world. Feuerbach's materialism, finally, was expressed in man's being recognized as the subject of thought, that same man who lived in the real world, and not a special being. 111 Feuerbach, zur Kritik der Hegelischen Philosophie, Berlin 1955, page 35. History of Dialectics. 73. Hovering outside the world, contemplating and comprehending it from outside. All those are fundamental tenets of materialism in general, and consequently also of dialectical materialism. What then were the weaknesses of Feuerbach's position? In general, and on the whole, they were the same as those of all pre-Marxian materialism, and primarily in comprehension of the role of practical activity as activity-altering nature. For even Spinoza had in mind only the movement of the thinking body along the given contours of natural bodies and lost sight of this moment, a point that fit to mate against him. Namely that man did not move along ready-made forms and contours presented by nature but actively created new forms, not inherent in nature, and moved along them, overcoming the resistance of the external world. The chief defect of all materialism up to now is that the object, reality, what we apprehend through our senses, is understood only in the form of the subject or contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity, as practice, not subjectively. Hence in opposition to materialism the active side was developed abstractly by idealism which of course does not know real sensuous activity as such. Feuerbach wants sensuous objects, really distinguished from the objects of thought, but he does not understand human activity itself as objective activity. Hence it followed that man was considered the passive side of the object-subject relation, as the determined member of this interrelation. Furthermore, man was abstracted here from the combinations of social relations and transformed into an isolated individual. The man-environment relations were therefore interpreted as the relations of the individual to all the rest, to everything that lay outside the individual brain and existed independently of it. But outside the individual, and independently of his will and consciousness, there existed not only nature but also the social historical environment, the world of things created by man's labor, and the system of relations between man and man, developed in the labor process. In other words, not only did nature by itself lie outside the individual but also humanized nature, altered by labor. For Feuerbach the surrounding world or environment given an intuition or contemplation was taken as the starting point, and its premises were not investigated. When, therefore, he faced the problem of where and how man was in immediate union with the environment, he answered, in intuition, in the individual's contemplation, since it was the individual that he always had in mind. That was the root of all his weaknesses, because in contemplation there was given the individual the product of the activity of other individuals interacting among themselves in the process of producing material life. And those properties and forms of nature that had already been transformed into the properties and forms of the activity of man, its object and its product. The nature as such that Feuerbach wished to contemplate did not, as a matter of fact, lie within his field of view, because this nature, the nature that preceded human activity, is not by any means the nature in which Feuerbach lives. Nor the nature which today no longer exists anywhere and which, therefore, does not exist for Feuerbach. Feuerbach's attention was also diverted from the real complexities of the social relations between theory and practice. From the division of labor that alienated thought from the majority of individuals and converted it into a force existing independently of them and outside them. He therefore saw nothing in the thought idolized by Hegel than a certain modification of religious illusions. 112 Note by the translator, Roy Pascal, Anschauung. I have used contemplation, for this term. This the normal translation is somewhat ambiguous, and should be understood as sense perception in strong contrast to its meaning of meditation. 113 Marx, Theses on Feuerbach, translator R. Pascal notes, Activity through Objects, 114 Marx, The German Ideology MECW Vol 5, page 40. Certain problems of the Marxist-Leninist theory of dialectics. 7.